The gates of a beautiful city called Soren are opened, and many people are entering the city through them. And among them is a young man with golden hair, who seems to be very happy to have entered the city. He has transmitted into his current body after the real host of his body was beaten to death for being a thief. He walks towards the gatekeeper of the city and hands him a precious object that puts a smile on his face. He could have never imagined that the owner of his body would be an illegitimate son of the Orlando family. He thinks that this is the start of a new chapter of his life, because he has the supreme overlord system. He then goes on to meet the governor of Soren, who tells him that he has got some bad news for him. The governor tells him that his father Calvin Orlando passed last week, and that his half-brother Winger Orlando is the successor of the Orlando family, and sees him as a thorn in his side. Richard Orlando, the golden-haired boy, asks the governor what he thinks, and he tells him that he must give up his status as an Orlando. He tells Richard that Winger is willing to give him 500 gold coins and help him expand his realms if he agrees to give up his status, and a servant shows him a wooden chest filled with gold coins. Richard takes some coins into his hand, and the governor asks him if they have a deal. Richard says that being in Orlando, he is destined to be glorious, and that it's the most precious thing that his father has left him. The governor asks him if he doesn't want to accept the deal, and he tells him that 500 gold coins for his status are not enough, even though he knows that they are enough for his lifetime. The governor becomes surprised to hear his answer, and tells him that he can lend him 1,000 gold coins, with no interest on the condition that he buys everything from his city only. Richard flips the gold coins and says that he agrees with the offer, and asks the servant about the Highland barbarian slaves at the arena. The governor asks him if he wants to make troops using the barbarian slaves, and if he's sure that he wants to buy those barbarians as slaves for 1,000 gold coins. He warns him against those barbarians, as they are not only famous for being brave, but also for being furious, and not so obedient, and says that he would sell him the slaves at the rate of 20 gold coins per slave. Richard says that this is the very reason why he's going there, and the governor tells his servant to take Richard to the arena, as he says that he will give him the 50 slaves for 20 gold coins each. Richard becomes happy that the first step of his plan has been executed perfectly, and the servant tells him that he will take him to the Colosseum with him, while the governor says to himself that Richard seems to be quite a special person. Later, Richard and the servant are sitting in a cart. Richard says that he has been drifting around the world for 10 years, and that he misses his home quite often. The servant asks him about the tune he's humming, and he says that it's nothing but customary ditty from his hometown. The host of Richard's current body was beaten to death for being a thief, and he entered his body. He also got an overlord system that helps him combat style day after day. Richard would have liked to get the position of a knight, but he never expected his father Calvin to pass on the mighty status of the Orlando family to an illegitimate son like him. He's fortunate that he got the license to expand his realms, otherwise he would have been torn into pieces by the Orlando family. After a few moments, the servant tells him that they have reached the arena, and they enter it. The servant asks the owner of the arena about the batch of barbarian slaves, and she replies positively. Richard tells her that the governor of the city, Count William, is willing to sell those barbarians as slaves to him to help him form troops to be able to expand his realms, and the owner says that she thought that he had come to watch the gladiatorial combat. She tells Richard that those Tartars have knocked out a lot of other players with just one punch and caused her a lot of medical expenses. She tells Richard that he's too weak, and that if he were to take the slaves they would end up beating him and running away. Richard keeps walking across the cages in which different monsters are kept. They look at Richard and say that he is their feast, but Richard chooses not to pay any attention to them. The owner tells him that the barbarians are so powerful that they slaughter and eat a whole crocodile, and he becomes impressed. He starts to look at a crocodile nearby him in a cage, and says that the barbarians are quite good if they can both defend themselves and feed themselves. He says that they would behave themselves too if he beats them up, and the owner becomes surprised to hear his words. She tells him not to be ridiculous, as the barbarians can kill a wild boar in just 2 punches, and starts wondering if Richard is out of his mind. Richard tells her not to worry about him, as he thinks that the barbarians would meet his expectations the stronger they are, and reminds himself that he has the trump card. He opens the system's window over his palm and goes through his statistics after he has been training himself for 3 years straight. Richard walks to a high place, and as he looks down, he finds several barbarians standing in the arena beneath him. He tells them that he has bought all of them from the governor of the city, and says that he knows that none of them wants to be his slave. He tells them that they would have to wrestle him if they want to acquire freedom. He jumps and lands in front of them and tells them that they would have to fight for him if they lose to him. One of the barbarians steps forward and confidently says that his community is skilled in wrestling. The owner and the servant become shocked to see the situation, and the barbarian introduces himself as Roselle. Richard also introduces himself as a formality, and the owner says that she can't believe that a lord is fighting a barbarian. She says that Roselle is so strong that he has already killed so many slaves, and tells the servant to convince Richard not to fight Roselle, as she thinks that the odds are against him, and that he's destined to die. The servant says that he has no right to interfere in the matter of Richard, as he's supposed to be following his orders only. The owner starts worrying about her position, as she would lose it if Richard died in her arena, while the barbarians start laughing at Richard for picking Roselle for a fight. They are sure that Roselle would put Richard in his place just with a little bit of effort. They tell Roselle to be easy, as he shouldn't kill a lord. But he replies that he won't show any mercy to anyone. Roselle takes position, quickly gets closer to Richard, giving him no chance to react, grabs him by the collar, and lifts him, roars and slams Richard into the ground, and Richard becomes silent and shocked. Roselle says that he expected Richard to have something special, but he has failed to even catch any of his moves. Roselle starts to walk back towards his people, and they tell him that he has cracked the ground by slamming the Lord into it. They think that Richard is not alive as he's not moving, and the owner of the arena also becomes surprised to see Richard in such a state. She thinks that she's going to lose her arena when all of a sudden, a hand reaches and grabs Roselle by his ankles, back and finds Richard smiling at him, and the owner becomes happy to see him alive. Richard tells Roselle that he has given him in the group because he doesn't want him to think that he's taking advantage of him, and throws a punch at him. Richard falls to the ground and becomes shocked. He starts wondering why is Richard not hurt, while Richard activates his force attachment ability. He tells himself that he can't get taken down by a barbarian's childish technique, as he has used the Overlord system to build his body for many years. He tells Roselle to continue fighting, and Roselle says that he won't be going easy this time. He becomes frustrated and charges at Richard with full force, but Richard dismantles his attack by grabbing his forearm and throwing him to the ground. He then sets his feet on the back of Roselle's neck and says that he has won. Roselle becomes surprised and asks him what have he done. He immediately gets up and tells Richard that he wants to fight him again, and Richard agrees with him, saying that he hasn't conceded yet. Other barbarians start wondering what's happening, and how Richard is managing to beat Roselle with so much ease as he throws him into the ground once more, right in front of their eyes. Richard keeps defeating Roselle repeatedly, without any difficulty. He asks him if he's not ready to admit his defeat, but Roselle stands up with a tired body and a swollen face and says that he can compete again. His mates tell him to give up already, as Richard has beaten him 10 times already, and he is shocked to listen to them. Suddenly, another barbarian walks through them and tells everyone to stop, as it's enough. It's a female barbarian with heavy chains around her wrist. She tells Richard that she is willing to fight him, and all the barbarians become glad to see their chief step forward. The chief of the barbarians steps up, and they become happy to see her. They become assured that the Lord will be finished in no time, while Richard asks their chief if she even has decision-making power. The chief asks Richard if she just has to knock him out, and if they will be free if he loses to her in a while. She tells him that a lord is supposed to be a man of his word, and Richard says that nobles always mean what they speak. Suddenly, the chief moves towards Richard, and he realizes that she's too fast. She throws a punch at him, but he blocks it and gets pushed a few steps back. Richard's system tells him that the chief of the barbarians is identified as a hero, and her name is Gunther. He realizes that she is the first hero that his system has shown him, so he wants her to show her true strength to him. Gunther jumps up high in the air and tells Richard not to be distracted. She hits the ground with both of her hands, but Richard immediately steps back and the ground gets broken. The owner becomes worried about her arena breaking down, and all the barbarians start cheering for Gunther. The servant realizes that Gunther is too strong, and the situation is turning against Richard, as Gunther picks up a huge rock, lifts it over her head, and the barbarians tell her to kill Richard, as no one is a match for her. Gunther takes aim and launches the rock towards Richard, and he gets pushed into the wall behind him. The owner becomes surprised to see it, and Gunther steps forward as she steps on the rock to assert her dominance, while the owner keeps worrying for her arena as a slave has stoned the Lord to death. All the barbarians start cheering for their chief as they think that they are getting their freedom back, while Roselle says to himself that the Lord is not as strong as he thought. Suddenly, the rock beneath Gunther's foot starts to shake, and she becomes surprised. Richard pushes the rock upward with just one hand, and tells Gunther that he needs people like him who are fast and strong. All the barbarians become surprised, and start wondering why the Lord is not dead yet. Gunther tells him that he's injured neck and throws him onto the ground. She tells him that he's done already, and that he has lost, but he tells her that she's brilliant for distracting him with a hook. He smiles at her and then proceeds to break the chain around his neck with his bare hands. All the barbarians, including Roselle, become shocked to see Richard do so, as the chains are built by top craftsmen of the dwarves to hold the trolls. Gunther looks at the chain and starts wondering how Richard broke it, as it's the same one that has been able to hold her for several years. Richard tells her that she is suitable to be his subordinate, as she's fast and strong and works by strategy. Gunther realizes that Richard hasn't even used his full power. All the barbarians realize that Richard is much faster and stronger than their chief, as he grabs Gunther by her neck and slams her into the ground. He tightens his grip around her neck, and she loses her ability to move. She grabs his hand and tells him that he can take revenge for what she did to him earlier, but Richard punches the iron handcuffs on her wrist and sets her free by breaking them. Richard then tells all the barbarians that they have two options left. The first one is to fight him until all of them lose, and the second one is to follow him. He says that under his command, they would become greater, and he gives his hand to Gunther. Gunther stands up and tells all the barbarians to follow her order. She bows in front of Richard and says that Richard is their chief from now on. Richard says that he will now become the Supreme Lord and lead them to become stronger together, and all the barbarians start cheering for him. They start calling him boss and say that they will follow him, while the owner of the arena watches them in shock. The servant realizes why Richard was made in Orlando by Calvin, when all of a sudden a system window opens in front of Richard. He looks at it and finds out that he has received multiple joining requests from the barbarians, including their chief Gunther. He smiles slightly, and then decides to accept all of their requests immediately. It was a barbaric and chaotic world full of bloodshed. Countless aspirants who wanted to establish merit dreamed of becoming a lord and opening up a world of their own, but most of them lost their lives and left the field in disgrace. Richard is with his troops. He tells them that the expansion journey is very exciting because he has taken the group of barbarians as the first step in his expansion. They walk through the city and reach a store as Richard wants his troops to suit up. The barbarians become excited to see the shop and start to wonder if their master is going to buy them clothes. Gunther tells one of the barbarians that the clothes won't suit him, and the owner of the shop appears. The name of owner is Negan the dwarf. He welcomes Richard and his men and asks him how can he help him. Richard tells him that he has come to buy some handy equipment for his men, and says that he has heard about his shop having some great weapons. Negan becomes impressed and tells Richard that he seems to know stuff. He presses a brick on the wall behind him, and the barbarians become shocked to see the wall turn sideways and the sign of the shop changing its label. All of them enter the secret room, and Negan asks them what would they like to have, as he has the finest quality weapons. Richard and his troops start to check out the exciting weapons, as he tells Negan to give each of his troops a spear and 3 throwing spears. Negan calculates the bill, and tells Richard that it would cost him a total of 750 gold coins. But Richard puts 28 gold coins on the table and says that this is all that he has got. Negan becomes a little frustrated and immediately shuts the entrance to the secret chamber. He tells Richard that he doesn't do business with poor people, nor does he keep credit, and Richard pulls out his sword. He shows his sword to Negan and asks him if he can give this sword to him as a form of payment, and Negan becomes surprised to see the sword as it is not some ordinary sword, but a Dragon Slayer weapon. He says that it's the first time that he has seen the legendary weapon, and starts thinking that he can't offend someone like Richard, as he seems to be a big person for wielding a legendary weapon. Negan tells Richard that it is a waste to put such a unique item in his store, so he asks Richard to have some credit, and gives back the sword to Richard. Richard takes the sword and tells his troops to take a spear and 3 throwing spears along with leather armor, and Negan becomes surprised to hear him mention the leather armor. Richard asks Negan if his sword is not worth the extra leather armor, and Negan tells his employee to get the weapons for everyone. All the barbarians start to cheer for Richard, but Gunther asks him what is their next step, and Richard smiles and tells her that they will now conquer his land. Later, Richard is moving with his troops as a caravan, while a group of goblins is watching over him. The goblins are happy to see an expansion team after a long time, as Richard's caravan is full of supplies. The chief of the goblins is Harson. He is watching over Richard and his troops along with the Knoll chief. The Knoll chief says that he wants to keep at least half of the weapons of the caravan, and Harson assures him that he won't get any less than he demands. Knoll says that their army is at least 5 times greater than the caravan, and asks what are they waiting for. Harson knows that the Neurals are brainless, so he asks the chief why is he in such a rush. Harson says that he wants the caravan to enter the hinterland, so that they won't have the option to go back, and the Knoll chief agrees with him, saying that he just wants the loot. On the other hand, Gunther notices that they are being watched, so she tells Richard about it. Richard tells her that he knows about it, and she asks him if he already has a plan. Richard tells his troops to halt the wagons in a circle and enclose the livestock and other goods. He orders them to get ready to defend against the attack, and Gunther asks him for his instructions. Richard calls her closer, and as she walks towards him, he gives her a bag containing small balls and tells her to give each person a ball, and asks all. Richard tells her that it's an oriental elixir that makes the consumer strong instantly. He tells them to swallow it and prepare for battle, and Roselle asks him if he's telling the truth. Richard asks him if he's not trustworthy, even though he knows that he's lying to his troops as the balls are made up of flour that he's using to hide his overlord system. He opens the system window and goes through the barbarian's manual. He comes to know that most of his troops are level 3 spearmen, while there is only one hero in his army, which is Gunther, the former chief of the barbarians. Richard knows that the barbarians can level up by fighting and gaining experience due to the overlord system. He thinks that the power of the system is unbelievable and fears that the barbarians would become suspicious if they become stronger in such a short time, which is why he is using the flower balls as a disguise for his overlord system. Richard confidently tells the barbarians that they would feel the power of the elixir, and Harson realizes that the caravan has stopped. Knoll Chief says that it's time for the caravan to die, and Harson cuts him off, asking him why is he so excited. Knoll Chief questions if the caravan is scared of them, and Harson says that the caravan might be considering surrendering voluntarily, as he thinks that they have been overwhelmed by his force. Knoll Chief says that he doesn't care if the caravan is scared or not. He orders all the troops to move forward, as he says that they should rob the caravan together. Richard realizes that the enemy is approaching, so he commands his troops to prepare for battle, and all of them take position. The Knoll Chief tells the troops to attack if they want to acquire some new weapons, and he orders his army to kill all the members of the caravan. All the enemies start to charge at the caravan with full force, and Richard picks up a throwing spear and launches it toward the enemy, approaching him and his troops. Richard launches a spear with his full force at Harson, but he reflects it with a metal piece on his wrist, and it pierces through the head of a goblin standing near him. He tells Richard that he's not strong enough to scare him, and tells his soldiers that they are big in number, so all the members of the caravan should die. All of Harson's soldiers start roaring and moving forward. The barbarians become anxious to see such a huge force moving towards them, and Roselle says that they can't fight off so many enemies despite their strength. The battle begins, and a gnoll attacks Roselle. Roselle punches him in the face and stabs him in the belly with the spear, while another gnoll kills some other barbarian in the field. The battle becomes intense as the close combat begins, and Roselle realizes that they are being surrounded. The enemies start to overcome the barbarian force, and Gunther asks Richard, what are they supposed to do? Richard is sitting on the top of a wagon and he asks Gunther to pass him a throwing spear. Gunther gives him the spear and says that they can't kill all of the enemies, and Richard says that he's also aware of that. He tells her that he just needs to find the target, and rubs the head of the spear against the roof of the wagon. The head of the spear lights up and catches fire, and Gunther becomes shocked to see the spearhead on fire, while Richard launches the spear into the air. The flaming spear strikes a goblin giant in its head, and its head explodes. All the goblins become scared to see the troll explode, and the gnolls start to run away as they can't believe that a troll has been killed by a mere throwing spear. Richard becomes happy to see that one of the giants has been taken down by himself, and the barbarians become confident, saying that the enemies are not to be afraid of as their boss has already killed the troll. Roselle kicks a gnoll in the belly and tells all the barbarians to strike back with full force. All of a sudden, Roselle gets approached by the gnoll chief from behind, and he realizes that he has no time to defend himself as he has been caught by surprise. The gnoll chief tries to strike Roselle with an axe, but surprisingly, a spear pierces, throwing his chest, and Roselle finds Richard standing on a wagon and realizes that he has been saved by his boss. Richard immediately orders his troops to attack with full force, as the leader of the enemy has been killed, and the enemy starts to flee the battleground to escape the wrath of the barbarians. Gunther becomes impressed and asks Richard if he was standing on the top of the wagon to observe the leader of the enemies, and he says that there is a saying according to which the gang will collapse if the leader is killed. He says that there is one more leader from the enemy's side that is left, and Harson steps forward. Harson seems to be quite frustrated. He calls Richard a human with a wimpy face, and Richard asks him if he is the one who planned the attack. Richard asks him if he's not afraid of other powerful races taking advantage while he's trying to ambush him and his caravan, and Harson says that the nearest realm is called the Gaoshan Fortress, which is a few miles to the east and is easy to defend but difficult to attack. Harson says that the kobolds don't have the guts to take away his loot, and Richard thanks him for giving him so much information. He pulls out his legendary sword and tells Harson that he has done him a big favor. He apologizes to Harson for not letting him take his supplies, and says that he would be the first opponent that his legendary weapon would face. Both of them look each other in the eye, and Richard attacks first. He beheads Harson in just a single blow, and the goblins become shocked to see their chief dead. The goblins start calling Richard a monster, and Gunther orders the barbarians to finish off the remaining enemies. The barbarians fulfill Gunther's order immediately, and after a few moments, the Overlord system tells Richard that the level 3 barbarians who were the spearmen have been updated to level 4 and become experienced warriors. One of the barbarians says that he feels quite stronger, and the other one tells him that it must be the effect of the Oriental elixir, while another one becomes excited to see the weapons of the enemies, saying that they can be sold for a lot of money. Another barbarian informs Richard about the captured trolls, and asks if they should behead them, but Richard refuses and says that they would be using the trolls to pull the loads as their horses have died because of the fierce battle. Gunther comes and informs Richard about a map that she found in Harson's clothes. She gives the map to Richard, and he immediately opens it. Richard starts smiling to look at the map and praises Gunther's efforts as he tells his troops that their next destination would be the Gaoshan Fortress. Richard is sitting in a wooden cart, looking at the map, while a troll is pulling the cart. He thinks that it wouldn't take them long to reach the Gaoshan Fortresses, as the troll is moving quite fast. Richard opens the system window and finds some unassigned attribute points on the system panel. He also finds out that the shop option is not available in his system, so he decides to improve his throwing and strength. He knows that weapon mystery can be improved in actual combat, in addition to the points. However, the attribute points are constrained by talent, and Richard doesn't have even the slightest magical talent, so he can go for physical combat only. Richard has the strength of at least 10 humans, and he might become a beefcake if this continues. The caravan keeps moving, and after a few miles, Gunther tells Richard that they have reached the foot of the Gaoshan Fortress mountain. Richard stands up to have a look at the place and finds a lake in front of him along with a mountain range. The caravan stops for a break, and the barbarian troops jump into the lake to take a shower. One of them asks Gunther if she doesn't want to take a shower, and she becomes frustrated to hear him. She angrily tells him to enjoy himself, and a couple of barbarians arrive holding a few animals in their hands. They tell Richard that they have caught a few wild animals from the nearby areas and are going to prepare them for meals. Richard becomes impressed by the survival skills of his troops and asks Gunther if she doesn't want to take a shower, as they have been in several battles over the past few days. Gunther becomes surprised, and Richard tells her about a separate pond and says that he can keep an eye on the troops for her. Gunther becomes happy to hear Richard's words and starts showing gratitude as she leaves the place and goes on to enjoy a relaxing bath while maintaining her privacy. At night, Richard moves towards the fortress of Gaoshan and tells his troops to be prepared as he wants to use the fortress as his base camp for future missions. Richard takes a closer look at the door of the fortress and finds 2 dogs standing there as guards. Richard realizes that those dogs are kobolds who are currently occupying the fortress. Rosa looks at the kobolds and says that they can kill them easily. Richard's kobold leader becomes surprised and asks him who he is and realizes that his fortress has been invaded by the enemy. Suddenly, one of Richard's troops enters the room and informs him that all of the kobold soldiers have been handled perfectly. The kobold leader becomes even more surprised to listen to such news and asks Richard how dare he sneak up on his troops. He tries to threaten Richard by saying that he has friendly relations with over a dozen powerful races and that they won't let him go if anything happens to him. He arrogantly tells Richard to wait for his tragic end, and just after a few moments he finds himself tied upside down from his ankles. He tries to apologize to Richard for his arrogance, but Richard says that he can't hear him. He apologizes to Richard once again, and Richard tells Gunther to untie the kobold leader. Gunther asks Richard if he's going to release the enemy, and he tells her to let the kobold leader go. Gunther cuts off the rope and tells the kobold to leave, and he runs away thinking that he has never been insulted this way. Roselle says that he never expected that taking the Goshan fortress would be so much easier, and Gunther says that the kobolds are losers. Richard says that he has checked the layout of the fortress. He says that the place is spacious enough to be used as their base camp. He decides to prove his dominance at the Goshan fortress, and comes up with a plan. He tells Gunther to prepare a team and follow him while he orders the rest of the barbarians to protect the base along with the trolls. Richard seems to be very dedicated to this attack, as he tells Gunther to hurry up with the team and she agrees to him. Later, a goblin troop is relaxing in its camp when all of a sudden Gunther appears with a sword and finishes him off. The barbarians launch a full-scale invasion of the goblin camp, while Richard realizes that the barbarians are good at possessing individual strength but not at cooperation. He thinks that it's because the barbarians haven't received any professional training, and that it doesn't mean that the barbarians would make up an efficient army, even if they are powerful individually. Gunther orders all the barbarians to form up and take down all of the enemies, and Richard says to himself that his barbarians have become elite troops that can form up on their own, as the overload system has given them something else greater than power. Roselle stands confidently on the battlefield, and calls the goblins a bunch of imbeciles. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet starts shaking, and all of a sudden, a giant dragon goblin appears with an axe in its left arm. All the goblins become shocked to see a dragon goblin with horns, and they get scared. The goblin dragon starts to make weird sounds, and a huge number of small goblins start to emerge from the ground. The huge number of goblins and Gunther surround the barbarians tells Richard to look out for the dragon goblin as she thinks he's a literal beast. The dragon goblin then orders its beast to appear, and the ground starts to crack and a huge monster appears from under the ground. All the barbarians become even scared to see the huge monster, and the dragon goblin climbs on its back. He calls the barbarians a bunch of lowly invaders, and says that they will be punished by the noble bloodline of the dragon. Gunther tells him to shut his mouth and throws a spear at its beast, but the skin of the beast fails the spear miserably and reflects it. The dragon goblin asks her if she thinks that her spear can penetrate through such strong armor, and tells the barbarians that they are out of depth. He tells Gunther to taste the noble power of the noble bloodline and starts approaching her. Gunther starts thinking that she's going to be killed, but all of a sudden Richard appears and grabs the huge monster by its foot. Richard starts shouting on top of his lungs and exerts immense force as he tosses the huge beast into the air, leaving all of the goblins surprised and the barbarians impressed as Roselle starts thinking that his boss is incredible. The dragon goblin gets hurt and struggles to pick himself up. He asks Richard how could he do that, and he replies that he's also from a noble family just like him. Richard asks the dragon goblin if he is ready to concede, but he refuses in an angry tone and picks up his axe to attack Richard. Richard acts quickly and punches him in the face and tells him that he has got some guts. The dragon goblin becomes unconscious and Richard marks another victory as he tells his troops to take care of the place quickly. Richard opens the window system and starts wondering if there is any update. He looks at it and finds out that some of the barbarians that were at level 3 have been upgraded to level 4, while Gunther is also now a level 2 hero. Richard decides to keep improving his troops, and he gets joined by Gunther holding some heavy chains. Gunther tells Richard that she has gathered the loot from the enemies, and one of the barbarians finds a wooden chest filled with silver coins and just 2 gold coins. He immediately tells Richard about it and says that the goblins are poor, and Richard agrees with him, saying that their enemies must had a hard time. Gunther brings the dragon goblin's beast to Richard and asks him what are they supposed to do with it. Richard looks at the beast and says that it looks delicious, and the beast becomes nervous to hear him. Richard tells the beast that it would be his mount, and that he would be calling him Wind. He also tells it that he would make a meal out of him if he ever disobeys his order, and Gunther tells him that they can head back to the base as the dinner has been prepared. Later, Richard is riding the back of his beast. He opens the system and goes into the shop. He finds a knight's lance for sale for 800 dinars, and decides to buy something cheap, as he is currently out of money. He presses the buy button on the window, and all of a sudden, the knight's lance appears in his hand out of nowhere. Richard becomes shocked to see the weapon, and realizes that this is how he can buy more stuff with the same method. Gunther finds him holding the lance and asks him if he can use magic too. Richard doesn't reply to her as he notices something strange in the distance, and Roselle tells him that a group of gnolls are trying to rob a caravan at some distance from them. Richard takes a look at the caravan and realizes that the caravan being looted is full of supplies. He tells his troops that the caravan doesn't look normal, and Gunther asks him if they should step in the fight. Richard says that trading is crucial for expanding territories and thinks that the caravan might be able to help him with the business in the future. On the other hand, a knoll tells an old man of the caravan to give all of their money to them, but the old man threatens him about the imperial family, as he is from the Voya merchant. The gnolls become happy to hear that they are going to loot an imperial caravan, and ask the old man if he thinks that they are scared of the imperial family. The knights launch the attack and start slaughtering the members of the caravan mercilessly. The old man runs for his life but falls on his face and starts begging for mercy from the gnoll troop running after him. The gnoll tells the old man that no one is coming to save him, and says that it's already too late for mercy. All of a sudden, Richard's lance pierces through the chest of the gnoll, and he gets killed. The old man becomes shocked to see the gnoll die, while all the gnolls become anxious to see the death of their partner. Richard looks at the gnoll taking its last breath, and realizes that his new weapon is quite handy, while Gunther orders all the barbarians to attack the robbers with full force. She orders them to kill all the enemies, and the gnoll becomes surprised to see the barbarians. Richard stands at a distance from the battlefield, and says to himself that the gnolls are just a bunch of bandits, so he would leave them to his elite troops while his troops keep eliminating the gnolls one by one. Richard looks at his troops fighting the gnolls and realizes that his army has become way more disciplined, which is essential to conquer vast lands in the wilderness. One of the gnolls starts to flee the battlefield, but another gnoll asks him where is he going. He asks his mate if he can't see who are they fighting, and tells him that the lord who broke the alliance of the goblins, trolls, and the gnolls and took over the Geishan fortress without any scratch is the leader of the barbarians attacking them. The other gnoll becomes surprised and asks him if the leader of their enemies is the legendary lord of the wilderness that has risen recently, and both of them start to run. But all of a sudden, Richard's beast emerges from the ground and swallows one of them. Richard realizes that his army has become extremely disciplined, as they have taken care of the gnolls by themselves with so much ease, and that he didn't have to do anything either. Roselle slays another gnoll, and tells Richard that the last of the enemy's group has been killed, so Richard comes closer to the caravan. Richard gets welcomed by a well-dressed man who thanks him for his help and says that he would like to praise his virtue. Richard tells him that he can give him money if he wants to repay him, and he becomes shocked. A lady elf appears from inside the cart and calls Richard a greedy lord, and tells him that he's quite interesting. The female elf introduces herself as Annie and asks her assistant Rudo if he's fine. Rudo replies positively, and Annie bends over to show gratitude to Richard and his troops. Richard tells her that his troops are heroic and that the gnolls are nothing in front of them. Roselle says to himself that the boss never praises them, but he's doing it now, and Annie asks Richard if he can help them, and he asks her what help she wants. Annie tells him that most of her soldiers are either dead or injured, and that her remaining caravan is not able to complete the trade. She asks Richard if she can rest in his territory with her caravan until her reinforcement arrives, and Richard tells her that it will be quite expensive for her as staying in his territory is like staying in a luxury inn, and Annie says that she would like to pay with money and weapons. She tells Ruto to take out the special item, and he immediately obeys her by giving her a crystal ball, and Richard becomes shocked to see it. He asks Annie about it, and she tells him to watch her. She tosses the crystal ball into the air, and tells Richard that it is a communication crystal that she uses to send distress messages to Voya the merchant. Richard asks Annie how long is it going to take her reinforcement to arrive, and she says that it might be 3 days, as her city is quite far from their location. Richard realizes that he would be able to make a lot of money if he establishes business with Annie and her caravan, as he thinks that they are something big. Richard tells Annie to follow him, as he being the lord of the Geishan fortress won't refuse friendly guests. Annie smiles and thanks Richard for his humbleness, and both the caravans start moving. Later, everyone returns to the base camp, and Richard notices Annie pouring some kind of special potion into a bucket of water and telling Ruto to distribute it to the wounded soldiers. Richard becomes surprised to see the potion, and his system tells him that it's a legendary potion that is used for healing purposes. The system tells Richard that the price of the potion is around 50,000 dinars, and he starts thinking that the caravan of Voya must be something big for having such an expensive item. Later at night, Annie asks Rudo if all the casualties have been checked, and he tells her that all the money and the goods are fine, but more than half of her soldiers have been killed. Annie becomes upset for losing innocent people, and Rudo says that they were saved thanks to Richard's help, or else the consequences would have been extremely disastrous. Annie asks him what he thinks about Richard, and he says that Richard is a significant lord. He says that even though they were in a desperate situation while being under attack by the gnolls, Richard's troops appeared out of nowhere and immediately turned the table into the favor of their caravan. He remembers the barbarians taking down the gnolls and says that they are very brave and that he's disappointed to say that his mercenaries are no match for those barbarians. On the other hand, Richard is sitting under the open sky, thinking that the soldiers of Annie's caravan are neatly and uniformly equipped. He thinks that this is what an army must look like, while his soldiers are fighting over a weapon just beside him. Richard looks at his soldiers and realizes that he has gotten some armor for his troops from Annie's caravan, as well as an axe as a reward from the overload system. He says to himself that his team has developed a lot, when all of a sudden, Gunther arrives and tells him that there is something wrong. Richard calmly asks Gunther what has happened and why she looks so tense, and she informs him that she has seen a large number of half-human and half-horse monsters with weapons at some distance from the fortress. Richard becomes surprised and asks her if she's talking about Centaurus while a group of Centaurus arrives at the gate of his base camp. The Centaurus are standing outside the gates of the Geishan fortress under the lead of their leader, who belongs to the Gale tribe, and her name is Heder. All of a sudden, a spear comes and lands in front of her. And right after a few moments, a bunch of more spears come in her direction, and all of them land close to her. Heidfor gets alert as she realizes that the lord of the Gaoshan fortress is quite strong. She tells his troops to keep moving, and Richard asks her if she is trying to ignore his warnings. Richard orders his troops to shoot and launch another batch of spears toward the Centaurus. Heder and her troops reflect the incoming spears with their weapons, and she tells her troops to stop moving as it could be dangerous to move any further. All of the Centaurus troops follow Heder's orders, and Heder pulls out a piece of white cloth and ties it onto a spear. Gunther tells Richard about the Centaurus raising the white flag, and he decides to go out of the gates and meet them along with his troops. Richard tells his troops not to let their guard down, as they are not aware of the true intentions of the Centaurus troops, and all of them obey Richard's order. He goes to Heder and asks her about what businesses have come for. She greets Richard with utmost respect, and tells him that her name is Heder. And being the chief of the Gale tribe, she has arrived in peace. Richard becomes relaxed to know her intentions, so he proceeds to introduce himself to as Richard, the lord of Gaelshan fortress, and that they gave her. She also tells Richard that the kobold aborigines are trying to form up an army as they used to own the Gaelshan fortress. Gunther steps into the conversation and tells Richard that she thinks he's aware of the situation as the aborigines hate Pompel so much, and Richard says that the kobolds want to take back the Gaoshan fortress. Heder tells Richard that he's right and says that they cannot underestimate the kobolds as they have the help of the shamans. Richard asks Hedda for the reason for her arrival, and she tells him that the Gale tribe wants to help him as he's going to face a catastrophe. Richard asks Hedda why she wants to help him rather than the aborigines, and she says that once upon a time the Gale tribe was a part of the Orc Empire and that her tribe will never merge with the aborigines and become bandits. She tells Richard that her tribe used to lead a peaceful life and had their own culture, poetry, as well as calendar, so she wants to restore the former glory of her tribe by relying on a powerful lord like Richard. The system shows Richard several joining requests from the Centaurus, and Richard realizes that Heder and her tribe are sincere with him. He looks at the status of the Heder and finds out that she is a hero too. He starts thinking that he can use the Centaurus race as the ranged weapon, so he accepts her request and takes her inside the fortress. Later, Richard introduces Heder to the female elf Annie and tells her that Heder has brought some bad news for them. Annie becomes worried to hear Richard's words, and he informs her that the kobold and the Krumels aborigines will declare war on him pretty soon. Annie asks Richard how soon he thinks will it happen, and he says that he thinks it would take around 10 days. Annie looks at Rumto and asks him what are they supposed to do while Gunther and Roselle are happy to hear about the war, as they would get to kill some more enemies. Heder tells Richard that even though the aborigines have formed an army, the army has a lot of fractions. She adds that it would take a brief period of at least 10 days for the army to reach the Gaoshan fortress, prepare ration for the soldiers, and delegate assignments to each part of the army. Richard seems quite calm and confident. He gets up from his seat and says that despite the enemy being so aggressive, he thinks that the period of 10 days is already a lot of time to prepare for the war. He pulls out a map and spreads it on the table in front of him, saying that he already has a plan. Gunther becomes excited. He says to himself that the skills of the Centaurus can enhance the ranged attack on the Gaoshan fortress, and Heder thanks him for his compliment, saying that she hasn't used such a handy bow and an arrow in a long time. Richard tells her that each member of her tribe will be equipped with the same bow and arrows by the next day so that they can start their training. Suddenly, Riddle comes running toward Richard and tells him that something is going on. He tells Richard that the reinforcement caravan that was coming for his help has been attacked on its way, and Richard leaves to take a look. Richard goes to the scene and finds Annie cursing the gnolls for attacking her caravan, so he immediately asks her about the update, and she tells him that all of the reinforcements sent by the merchant has been wiped out by the bandits. Richard tells Annie that the Gaoshan fortress is not safe for her anymore, so she should leave, and a soldier struggling for his life sitting beside Richard coughs and says that the gnolls can only be defeated with the help of healthy soldiers and horses. Annie becomes angry and immediately says that she can't leave behind those soldiers who have fought for her by risking their lives. Richard pulls out a spear from one of the corpses and tells Annie that he would have to charge her double for her stay, as the situation has gotten worse in terms of security. He asks Annie what she thinks about offsetting the 2,000 gold coins that he owes her, and she agrees with him after thinking for a moment. Herder also joins them and tells Richard that the head of the spear that he's holding is very crude and smells like pines. She says that the head of the spear is made up of handmade iron ore, and Richard becomes surprised as he thinks that it's impossible to even imagine that aborigines can smelt their own iron ore in the wilderness. Annie tells Richard that the wilderness is much bigger than he thinks and says that there are many large tribes in the vast expanse of the wilderness to the further north. Annie says that those tribes are no less than any small independent nation, and that the large tribes with thousands of adults often go to war against each other to fight for territories, which is why it is normal for them to produce weapons for strengthening their armies. Hero asks Annie if she means to say that the troops that attacked the caravan were Icefield aborigines, and she replies positively. Annie also says that the Cobalt Aborigines are forming an army at the moment, so she thinks that the appearance of the Icefield Aborigines is not a coincidence. Richard says that he's sure that the Icefield Aborigines must have joined the war too. Gunther says that she wants all of the enemies to come together so that she can punch them together, and Hader agrees with her, saying that she's right, and that they can slaughter all the enemies together. 10 days later, 2 Centaurus troops enter the base camp in a rush, and after a few moments, a barbarian soldier informs Richard that the enemy has been spotted. Richard stays calm and inquires about the current location of the enemy, and the soldier tells him that the enemies are stationed at the foot of the mountains, which is around 50 miles away from the fortress. The soldier also tells Richard that the enemy might arrive outside the fortress by the next day, and Richard says that he has been waiting for such a moment for a long time. Richard has gathered all of his armies on the battlefield. He draws his sword and tells his soldiers to make the enemy experience hell and to wipe out all of them from existence. Richard commands his soldiers to launch an attack, and all of them charge at once. He puts on his armor and realizes that it's quite heavy. Annie asks him about his battle plan, and he says that he will launch 2 arrow attacks followed by a final grand attack. Richard tells Rudo to kill 100 soldiers of the enemy so that their formation would collapse, but Rudo and Annie are shocked to hear him. Annie tells him that she's afraid, as the enemy has an army of 500 or 600 soldiers, which is almost 5 or 6 times larger than their army. And Richard tells her to just obey his orders, as he is also aware of the situation. Meanwhile, the enemies have also formed up their soldiers, and their leader is standing beside Cobalt's leader, keeping an eye on Richard's lions, thinking that he and his soldiers are easily going to crush the enemies. Cobalt's leader tells the other chief not to underestimate Richard and his troops, and he becomes surprised. The leader says that he would tear Richard and his troops to pieces as his army has been assembled, and that the enemy has already squandered their chance of living. Richard mounts his beast called Wind and orders his troops to attack. The enemy also launches an attack, and Heder orders the Centaurus troops to kill all of the enemies. She tells all of them to shoot a round of arrows, and they rain down arrows on the enemies marching toward them. Both armies run into each other, and the enemies shoot a round of spears at Richard's soldiers. Richard's beast stops most of the spears using its armor, and Gunther launches a round of spears too. After a few moments, both forces collapse and close combat begins. The ground cracks and the dragon goblin appear. So Richard tells Wind to show everyone what is it capable of. Wind goes in between the enemies, jumps high in the air, and lands on the enemies with its legs spread outwards. So many enemy soldiers get crushed under Wind's heavy body, and blood splashes everywhere while Richard stabs the dragon goblin to death. Roselle and Gunther are also dominating the battleground, as they keep cutting the enemies in half to kill them all. A soldier from the enemy's side jumps and attacks Richard with a warhammer, and he falls from the back of his beast to the ground while trying to defend against the attack. Richard falls on his back but gets up immediately and realizes that the enemy troops are quite strong. 3 enemies charge at him together, but he gathers strength and slays all of them at once. He stabs them to death, and his troops become surprised to see him fight so bravely. On the other hand, the enemy leader is watching his soldiers die on the battlefield. He becomes surprised and immediately tells the shaman to cast a spell, and the kobold leader becomes nervous. The shaman lights a flame and starts casting a spell, and after a moment, a huge fireball appears in the air. The enemy leader and the kobold leader become happy to see the fireball, and Richard becomes surprised to see it. He starts wondering if the fireball has been created by the shaman's spell, and the shaman launches the fireball at Richard's army. Richard tells his soldiers to immediately step aside and watch out for the fireball, and as the fireball comes closer, he realizes how strong the fireball is. The shaman launches the fireball at Richard's troops, and they get hurt, but Richard manages to protect most of them. The shaman realizes that she must find a way to defeat Richard as he's manipulating the fireball with his stuff, while Richard gets joined by Heder. Then Heder asks Richard if he's fine, and he replies positively. He demands her attention and asks her if she and her troops can shoot the shaman from their positions. Heder says that it won't be a problem for her, and she pulls the bow along with her troops. She orders the Centaurus troops to release the arrows without any pause, and the leader of the enemy realizes that the Centaurus troops are raining down arrows over them. The wolf leader orders his soldiers to protect the shaman. Most of the soldiers get busy in protecting the shaman, while their leader becomes open to Richard's attack. Richard knows that surprise is an important element of attack, so he quickly launches a spear towards the enemy leader while he's thinking that he will be able to turn the tables by protecting the shaman. By the time the enemy leader notices the spear flying towards him, he becomes surprised, and the spear penetrates through his belly, making him fall on his soldiers and breaking the guard of the shaman. As soon as the guard of the shaman breaks, she loses control of the huge fireball floating in the air, and it starts to explode on the heads of Richard's enemies. Most of the soldiers from the enemy's line start burning to death, and Richard becomes happy to see them taste their own medicine. On the other hand, the kobold leader becomes anxious to see his partner the wolf leader die, so he asks the shaman what are they going to do now. The shaman says nothing, and starts casting another spell while Richard tells his soldiers that they can start clearing the battlefield now. Suddenly, Richard notices the dead soldiers rising once again, and gets shaken to his core. He starts wondering if it's the effect of the bloodthirst, and his enemies start roaring at him and his soldiers. Richard draws his sword and attacks a wolf troop charging towards him. Richard slices the enemy into pieces in a matter of few seconds, and goes on to face other enemies. He kills some more enemies one by one, and cuts them into pieces. He activates his rage mood as he makes his way through the enemy's lines and passes through them with the speed of lightning at which he keeps slaying his enemies mercilessly. Gunther also jumps into the battle with her boss and starts slaying the enemies one by one. Richard makes his way through the enemy's last line and goes on to face the shaman. He appears in front of the shaman and the kobold leader, and both of them become scared to see him. The kobold leader and the shaman start to flee, but Richard takes off his helmet and throws it at them. Both the running enemies get hit and fall on their faces, and Richard steps toward the shaman. The shaman turns her face to look at Richard and becomes frightened to see him, while he says that he never expected her to be a witch. Richard picks up kobold leader like a toy and asks Gunther about the injured soldier. Gunther immediately tells him that one of their soldiers called Nutter is extremely injured and needs a doctor as soon as possible. Richard throws the shaman on the ground and orders her to save the people that she has injured. The shaman introduces herself as Motor and says that she was coerced. Richard asks her if she wants him to teach her some manners for speaking back to him, and she gets scared. Motor agrees to obey Richard's order and casts a spell to heal Nutter. All the barbarians become surprised to see Nutter's wound disappearing, and he starts to heal instantly. Nutter stands up and says that he is healed completely, and Richard realizes that Nutter can not only perform sorcery, but also cast healing magic. He thinks of keeping Nutter to himself, and Gunther asks him what should they do with the captured goblins and the gnolls. Richard tells Gunther to take some troops with her to clean the battlefield and enslave the remaining troops from the enemy's side. Richard's troops tell him that they have gained a lot of loot this time, and he agrees with all of them as his system windows are flooding with notifications as he has made countless achievements in the battle. Gunther asks Richard what are they supposed to do with the witch, and he tells her to take Motor with the kobold leader to the base camp and find out about the enemy's lair. Later at night, Richard is sitting in his room with his system window opened as he's trying to add some attribute points to Heder and her troops to improve their strength and agility. He gets joined by Hedgset, who tells him that they are not able to do anything with Motor, and he asks her if she's that difficult to deal with. Hedgset tells him that she has tried to threaten that witch, and even scare her, but nothing has worked so far, and Richard tells her that she must have used the wrong method. On the other hand, the kobold leader is hanging upside down, while Motor is threatening to turn the barbarian troops into bugs if they dare to touch her. Suddenly, Motor finds Richard entering the prison and immediately complains to him about the bad behavior of his subordinates. Richard smiles and humbly asks her about her lair, and she screams at him for not addressing her by her name. Motor says that she's not an ordinary person as she belongs to a noble family of the dragon bloodline, and Richard loses his cool. He punches her and sends her flying away, leaving Heder completely surprised. Richard then picks up Motor by her collar and asks her about her lair once again, and she tells him that they are stationed 200 miles away from his fortress. Richard asks her how many soldiers are left, and she tells him that there are no soldiers left at the lair, as he has already defeated all of them. Richard scares Mortar, saying that he will knock her teeth out if she doesn't tell him the truth, and she says that only the warlike fighters were sent against him, while the lair is full of weak women and children. Richard then asks her about the spells known by shamans, and she says that there are many kinds of spells in the wilderness. She says that she's a member of the dragon bloodline, so she can master the fire element and cast flame spells. Motor speaks further and tells Richard that the Tauren shamans control the earth element, which enables them to crack the ground and turn mountains into rocks, while the troll shamans are the master of the wood element, enabling them to trap any living beings using wood. Richard becomes surprised and says that the universe is more treacherous than he thought. He immediately turns back and tells Heder to find Gunther so that they can make a plan and attack the lair. Richard turns back to leave, but his soldiers ask him what are they supposed to do with the kobold leader and Motor. Richard tells them that both the hostages are of no use, so he orders his men to drag them to the back of the mountain and bury them alive. Motor becomes scared to hear Richard's words, and she immediately tells him to take back his order, as she can be very useful to him. Richard asks how can she be useful to him, and she says that she has seen 2 trolls on her way to the Gaetian fortress. She tells Richard that even though the trolls look silly, they can be trained into wizards while being in the wilderness. She also says that the trolls that she saw are extremely talented, and that she can turn them into Shura shamans with great power if she gets a chance to train them. 2 days later, Richard's troops are using the slaves to demolish the fortress and rebuild it into a stronger one. Richard asks Heder about the update on the construction, and she tells him that everything is going as their plan. She tells Richard that they will be able to demolish the fortress and then rebuild it, as having a strong fortress is a necessity to defend against the enemy. Richard tells Heder to use the slaves to get more granite and strengthen the walls of his fortress, as he wants to have the strongest castle in the wilderness. He tells her that he wants her to investigate the lair of the enemy, about which he was told by Motor that it was 200 miles away from Goshan. Nighther asks him if he wants her to eliminate the remaining people, and he refuses, saying that he just wants her to be his scout. Richard tells Heder that they must be alert for any kind of surprise attack, even though Motor said that the lair had only women and children. He also tells her to be agile, and she tells him that she felt quite light and strong all of a sudden. About 2 days later, Hatester tells Richard that she's leaving now, and he tells her to return immediately if she feels some kind of danger. Hagster leaves with another troop, and Richard decides to check out Motor's training session. On the other hand, in the woods, the trolls are punching and destroying some trees while Motor is thinking of them as dumb creatures. Richard comes and tells her that he can't see any progress in the training of the trolls even though she has been training them over the past 2 days, and she reminds him to call her by her name. Motor thinks that Richard is stupid, so she decides to show him her true strength. She casts a powerful spell and one of the trolls turns into stone from head to toe. Richard becomes extremely shocked, and Motor tells him that the troll has awakened an ability called the Stone Skin. Richard asks about the ability, and Motor tells him not to underestimate it. She casts another spell, and the troll becomes invisible, and Richard becomes even more shocked to witness something like that. He immediately asks Motor about the other troll, and she tells him that the other one hasn't awakened any kind of ability, as it depends on timing, talent, and location. Richard becomes a bit disappointed, and starts thinking that even though the ability to become invisible is a bit useless, it can help him a little too. All of a sudden he gets joined by Annie, who greets him from some distance. She asks him what is he doing, and he replies that he's training the trolls. Richard asks Annie if she's back from her work, and she tells him that she's on her way to conduct business with the dwarf tribe. Richard walks closer and takes a look at Annie's luggage and finds a huge load of coal on the cart, so he asks Annie what is it used for. Annie tells Richard that the coal is used for exchanging gold and turf with the dwarves, and he becomes confused as he knows that the dwarves hunt and sell turf, but he can't understand why would they need so much coal, so he asks Annie about it, who tells him that the dwarves require coal to smelt iron ore. Richard asks her how much ore is in the wilderness that makes her keep traveling with coal here and there, and she tells Richard that the dwarf tribe is located 150 miles to the west of the Gaoshen fortress. She also says that the dwarves discovered veins last year in a lake called Bay Lake, so they asked her to deliver more coal as per their requirements. Richard notices an eagle flying over his head, so he stretches his arm out, and the eagle lands on it. He starts wondering if the eagle has some message, and takes out a note from the foot of the eagle. He reads the message and realizes that the governor of Colin wants all of the nobles to return to the city, as he's warning them about a wave of something dangerous that is emerging from the woods. Suddenly, Heather also comes, and Richard is surprised to see her, as he had sent her on a 400-mile trip. He finds her struggling to breathe and immediately asks her if she's hurt or has faced any kind of resistance from the lair. Heather tells Richard that there is no threat at the lair. However, there indeed is a threat that is bigger than the lair. She says that she saw a pile of dead bodies of the dwarves, and that she was surprised to see that all of the battlefield was covered with the corpses of the dwarves only. Parrot says that she saw something that shook her to her core, and Richard asks her if she's talking about the bear men. Parrot becomes surprised, and asks Richard how he knows about it. And he tells her that he has received a warning letter from the governor of the city in which he has warned him against the huge wave of bear men headed towards the south. Annie asks Richard if he's going to return to the city with her, and he refuses, saying that he's not going to escape the enemy. He orders Hedda to return to the fortress and take some rest, and so she does. Annie asks Richard about his plan, and he tells her to give all of the coal to him, as he thinks the prize to see a Centaurus troop forging a weapon. She asks Richard if he's now forging his weapons, and he tells her that the Gaoshen fortress must be well armed to protect against any unknown enemy. Richard then arrives at a place and asks Gunther if the task he gave her has been completed, and she tells him that she has done it according to his instructions. Richard then goes towards a huge thing hidden under a red cloth and tells Annie that he would like to show her a treasure. Annie and Motor become shocked to see Richard remove the cloth as a brand new cannon appears, and Richard tells them that this is something that exists in his hometown. Hagar takes Richard to the place where she encountered the bear men, and he finds a bunch of crows devouring the corpses of the dwarves. Annie finds a footprint of a bear man, and is surprised by its size, as it is bigger than her torso. Hagar says that the bear men were in a huge hunger when she encountered them, and that she had to fight tooth and nail to escape them. Richard realizes that it's good that he had upgraded the agility of Hedder and other Centaurus troops, otherwise they would have been in danger too. He tells one of his soldiers to check the tents of the dwarves to see if anything is left, and the soldier gets inside the tent. Annie tells Richard that the bear men are violent and greedy creatures, hence they would not have left anything valuable, but he says that one man's trash is another man's treasure. Richard enters the tent and finds a strange clay pot on the ground. He goes towards it, wondering what is it, and dips his finger in the substance inside the clay pot. Annie tells him that the black substance is soy sauce, and he immediately says that the bear men have left something without realizing its value. Annie asks Richard why is he so happy to find the soy sauce, as the dwarves are good at making pickles and soy sauce, and he replies that it's the first time that he has seen the soy sauce from the colon in the wilderness. Richard says that soy sauce can be used to make some of the most delicious food, and he tells Gunther to order his men to open a restaurant in Collins, so that he can have a stable income once the noblemen get addicted to his restaurant's delicious food. Annie becomes surprised and impressed to hear Richard's words, and he tells everyone that they will be staying at the tents of the dwarves for the night. Rudo becomes curious and asks Richard why is he telling them to stay at the dwarf tents, as he thought that they had come just for some inspection, so Richard tells him that he can't return without seeing the bear men. After a moment, Richard is sitting by the fire, and Annie asks him if he doesn't think that they should avoid the situation, as the bear men are already at war with the dwarf tribe and are headed to the south. She also asks Richard why is he throwing himself into danger, even after knowing the whole situation, and he tells her that she must know the reason why the bearmen have started the war, if she's also aware of the situation too. Annie understands the situation and asks Richard if he's aiming for the iron ore, and he replies positively saying that it is a precious resource. Richard says that in such an era of war and blood, the person who holds the most resources is the one in power. He asks Annie why can't he have a piece of iron ore as it's not owned by any race on the planet, and Annie asks him if he's crazy as his army consists of a few dozen soldiers. Richard asks Annie if she thinks it's that dangerous, and says that his strength has grown quite a lot recently. Suddenly Gunther and Hedda join Richard and tell him that they are ready. Richard looks at his side and finds some wolf slaves pulling the cannons and motor coming with 2 trolls having their abilities awakened. Annie becomes surprised, and Richard asks her if she doesn't think that his army is way stronger than before, but Annie asks him if he's sure about jumping into the war against the Bearman. Richard realizes that he will be able to hook up with the dwarves if Annie joins his forces, so he tells Annie to join him and promises to give her half of iron or if he manages to succeed, so she immediately shakes his hand and closes the deal. Later, a huge number of soldiers have gathered at a single place. They are ordered to form up, and Richard climbs a tall tower to address all of them. Richard tells his soldiers that they are going to fight a war for themselves in the Gaussian fortress. He draws his sword and says that they are going to stir up the chaos in the war between the dwarves and the Bearman. Richard's soldiers become excited to hear his words, and they start praising him. Richard also becomes confident, so he raises his sword and commands his soldiers to keep their morale high. Richard and his soldiers are outside the dwarf castle. He notices another party near him, so he immediately tells everyone to stay low. Richard hides under the bushes and finds some bunny men sneaking into the castle, and realizes that those are bunny men who have come to fight the dwarves. Richard starts wondering why the bunny men are trying to fight the dwarves when the battle is against the Bearman, and Annie tells him that the bunny men are affiliated with the Bearman. Hero says that strong races like the Bearman use other races to enter just because she's short. On the other hand, the bunny men have climbed the walls of the castle. They launch a surprise attack on the soldiers guarding the walls, and the dwarves realize that they have fallen into a trap. One of the guards informs everyone that the enemy is coming from the Bayou Lake, and they become shocked, so the dwarves start preparing for the battle and start drawing their bows. The dwarves then launch a batch of arrows at the bunnymen and kill some of them. The bunnymen keep charging toward the castle, and the dwarves step into the battlefield to defend against them. The leader of the bunnymen orders his soldiers to crush the enemies, but gets shaken to the core as a huge explosion occurs and kills a lot of his soldiers. The bunny leader looks back and finds Richard and his men with the cannon, so he immediately orders his troops to kill the reinforcements of the dwarfs. Richard draws his sword and steps into the battle along with his soldiers. He manages to kill several bunnymen by himself, while his barbarian troops keep fighting by his side. Richard realizes that the bunnymen are quite easy to defeat despite their huge number, and all of a sudden, the ground starts shaking and he starts wondering if it's an earthquake. Richard looks back and his soul leaves his body out of surprise as he finds a bear man with a huge weapon standing behind him, roaring at the top of his lungs, leaving him completely speechless and frozen for a moment. The bear man roars at Richard, and he is surprised to see such a huge creature in front of him. The bear man attacks him with its weapon, but Richard successfully blocks it. However, he gets thrown away. Richard immediately picks himself up and realizes that the battle is going to be terrifying as he finds more bearmen appearing and joining the battlefield. The bearmen and the bunnymen launch a powerful joint attack at the dwarves and Richard's forces, so Richard orders his Centaurus troops to launch the arrows, and so they do. The arrows kill several enemies, but the bunny leader commands his reserve team to move forward, and some bunnymen appear from under the water to join the battle. The battle gets intense and Mortar realizes that it's her turn to do something, so she stands at a higher place and starts forming a huge fireball in the air, using her magical powers. She then launches the fireball on the enemies, and they start to burn to death. After a moment, Mortar sends the stone-skinned troll into the battle, and the bear man becomes curious and surprised to see it. One of the bear men tries to attack the stone troll, but fails miserably as his sword breaks into pieces after striking the skin of the troll. The stone troll roars at its enemies while the dwarves become fascinated with Richard's forces. One of the dwarves asks his leader Lobby, the dwarf chief, about Richard, and he says that he might be the leader of the army from heaven that has been sent by the blacksmith god for their help. Sendak, the other dwarf, demands a team from Lobby to help Richard's forces, but he immediately refuses, saying that they must rescue their people first. Lobby tells Sendak to leave the battlefield to Richard and his troops, while Richard and his troops are fighting with utmost dedication. Richard looks at the enemies in front of him and thinks of them as a bunch of rubble. He decides to show them his true strength and forms a tornado using his sword. The enemies become scared to see the tornado as Richard launches it toward them. The tornado then sweeps away most of them, and Richard moves forward to attack a bear man in front of him. He tries to attack the bear man, but it stops Richard's attack with a chain. The chain gets broken, and the overload system reminds Richard to enable his celestial power. Richard immediately uses his celestial power as per the system's suggestion, and quickly moves forward to kill the bear man. The bear man becomes shocked by Richard's speed, but before he can do something to defend himself, he gets a taste of Richard's sword and gets cut in half. The system rewards Richard with 300 experience points, while the fire-breathing troll also joins the battle. On the other hand, Gunther is also fighting a bear man. She tries to hit him, but he throws a punch at her and sends her flying away. Roselle becomes frustrated to see Gunther get hurt, so he immediately throws his axe at the bearman that punched Gunther. The axe fails to do any damage to the bearman, and he starts making fun of Roselle, but all of a sudden, his head gets separated from his body by Richard, as he's riding on the shoulder of his troll possessing the ability to become invisible. Meanwhile, Roselle and Heder immediately go to Gunther and her if she's fine. Gunther opens her eyes and smiles at them because she's perfectly fine thanks to her lord. Richard looks at her and says that it looks like the stone skin and the invisibility can be cast within the team, and Gunther tells him that they have secured another decisive victory. All of a sudden, Richard finds the enemy soldiers returning to life after being killed, and he is shocked to see such a phenomenon. Motor also becomes concerned to see such a thing, and says that it's the effect of the Primal Fury spell that makes her wonder if the Minotaurs are in the Crescent tribe. In the southwest of Pompel, there are Tauren who are unruly and warlike by nature. They rely on the Primal Fury spell cast by the shaman Minotaurs, which makes them invincible in battle. The ferocious and tyrannical Taurens are known as the Blahoof tribe. Richard is surprised to see his dead enemies return to life. He asks Motor about the Minotaurs, but she tells him that their enemies are in a light state of fury at the moment, which is why she thinks that the Primal Fury spell is being cast by someone remotely. Richard smiles and says that there is nothing to fear in that case, as he watches Gunther slaying the enemies and says to himself that the enemies are no match for Gunther and her squads. Other barbarian troops are also killing and pushing back the enemy successfully. Richard tells them not to chase the enemies as their main goal is to acquire their share of iron, or from the Bay Lake, by helping the dwarves defend against the Bearman. He says that he wants to meet his new dwarf friends, so he walks toward the dwarf castle, but gets stopped by Lobby, the dwarf chief. Lobby asks Richard about the purpose of his arrival, and he introduces himself as Richard Orlando, the lord of Gaoshan Fortress. Richard tells Lobby that he's the one to help him against the enemies, and Annie also speaks up as she introduces herself to Lobby too. Lobby becomes surprised to see Annie, so he immediately orders his men to open the door and let her inside. Lobby apologizes to Annie for making her wait, and asks her to enter the castle along with her followers. Richard minds Lobby calling him a follower of Annie, and starts thinking of him as a stupid person. Lobby tells Annie that he and his men survived due to the blessings of the blacksmith god, and Richard becomes frustrated as he thinks that the dwarves should be thanking him instead. Lobby leads Annie and Richard into a room, and says that he never expected her to come at such a time. Annie tells him that she came with Richard to his help as soon as she came to know about the attack of the Bearman on his tribe. Lobby says that he and his men are not able to hold against the attacks of the enemies anymore, and Richard giggles at him. Lobby becomes angered and asks Richard if he's laughing at him, and he refuses, saying that he should not mistake him. Annie immediately tries to cool down Lobby by telling him that Richard is a famous warrior of Pompel who wants to help him, and he says that Richard must be skilled in that case. Richard settles down on a seat next to him and says that he doesn't have any kind of skills. Lobby asks Richard how he became a famous warrior without any skill, and he replies that it's devoid of merit. Annie tells Richard to stop joking and asks Lobby what is he going to do next, as the danger hasn't averted yet. Lobby says that he's afraid that the enemies might attack once again. He says that he wants to take some rest and discuss it the next day, and Richard asks him where is he going to stay. Lobby tells him that there are many stone homes in the tribe that are empty, so he can use any of them as he wishes. Richard walks out of the room, and Annie tells him not to mind Lobby's words, as he's a bit straightforward. Richard tells Annie that he's not as petty as Lobby, and she says that the war has changed him a lot. Richard says that he doesn't think that Lobby is fit to be a leader, as he's shedding tears at such a moment. Annie immediately defends Lobby as she tells Richard that he's being too hard on him, and that not everyone is as fearless as him. Richard turns around and says that anyone can be afraid of war, but one can only win by making the enemy more afraid. He says that he's going to bed while the dwarves are helping their injured soldiers. One of the dwarves tells other soldiers not to make any noise so that they won't wake up the barbarians and the orcs as they are having a rest. On the other hand, Richard is lying on a bed with Hedda resting on the floor by his side. He asks her if she's still awake, and she says that she's going to sleep outside as the room is too small for her. Hera gets up and starts to walk away, when all of a sudden everything starts to shake violently, and she starts wondering if it's an earthquake. Richard immediately gets up, saying that the stone chamber won't be able to handle the violent shaking for too long. He realizes that it's not the earthquake that is making everything tremble, and starts wondering if the enemy has come back while the Bearmen and the Minotaurs have arrived outside the dwarf temple with their full force. The dwarves blow the war horn and start preparing for the battle as the Bearmen and the Minotaurs are approaching them. The dwarves quickly go outside the castle and are surprised to see Richard standing there with his army in formation even before them. Richard smiles at them, and they become frustrated to see him smile in such a troublesome situation, as they have to fight the Bearman and the Minotaurs. Richard asks Lobby how is he going to fight the Taurens, and Sendak says that they will kill them separately, by distancing them from each other. Lobby tells Richard that they can't hit the Taurens without making them bend over as they are so tall. He also advises him to keep his troops as a reserve, so that he can try to stop the enemies along with his troops. Hijir and Gunther start to joke with each other on the battlefield, while Richard starts thinking that the dwarves are quite generous for letting him keep his troops as reserve. Suddenly, the sky gets covered with dark clouds, and the rain starts to pour. Sendak hears two of his soldiers talking about the Taurens, so he orders them to stay focused and prepare the bows. Richard looks at the minotaurs charging towards them and says that he would like to catch some of them alive as they are so big and strong, and Gunther asks him if he wants to sell those minotaurs to the Colosseum to make a lot of money. Richard replies positively, saying that it would be possible if they survive, and Gunther starts to laugh to listen to his words. The dwarves become surprised to see Richard and Gunther crack jokes in the middle of the battle, while Sendak thinks of them as crazy people. Lobi asks Richard if he still has the flame spells that he used earlier, and he replies negatively, saying that he used all of them as he never expected the enemy to attack again. Lobi asks Sendak how many bows they have, and he says that there are 6 of them. Lobi says that they must keep firing the bows at the Minotaur's troops while the two forces collide on the battlefield. The Bearmen are slaying the dwarf soldiers without any mercy. Lobi tells his men to wait for the enemy to come closer, and as the enemy gets closer, he immediately orders his men to release the bows. The dwarves release a batch of arrows and manage to kill a few Minotaur's troops, while most of them get injured, so the Minotaur's troops become frustrated and start to kill the dwarves without any difficulties. Lobi becomes upset to see his soldiers die, and Gunther tells Richard that the dwarves won't be able to stop the Minotaurs. Richard agrees with her, saying that the enemies are extremely strong, and asks Gunther about Motor. Gunther tells Richard that Motor was caught by them while trying to escape, and Richard finds 2 of the barbarian troops holding Motor by her hands. Richard becomes angry and grabs Motor by her collar. He asks her how dare she tried to run away while they are trying to fight off the enemy, and she gets scared by Richard's tone. Motor tells Richard that she is afraid of the Minotaurs as the dwarves are not able to fight them, and Richard asks her why is she scared of the Minotaurs, as she can cast the Bloodlust spell just like the Minotaurs can cast the Primal Fury spell. Lei becomes happy to hear about the Bloodless, so he immediately tells Mo to use her powers. Richard tells Mo that he will always remember her cowardice, and orders her to enchant the Furious with the Bloodlust spell. Lei and Mo become surprised to hear Richard's words, and ask him if he's out of his mind. Richard tells Mo to silently obey his order, so she starts casting the spell. Motor starts to enchant the enemies with her spell, and Louis asks Richard if he doesn't think that enchanting with the Bloodless spell would upgrade them. On the other hand, the Minotaurs start to become stronger as their muscles get bigger, and Lobi starts calling Richard a crazy person for his stupid decision. Richard orders Motor to speed up the Bloodlust process, and she puts her heart into it. The Minotaurs start to upgrade into deadly giants, and the dwarves become frightened by their presence on the battlefield. A huge Minotaur troop roars at the top of its lungs, and all the dwarves start to run away while Lobi starts shaking out of fear. Sendak says that Richard is out of his mind, but Richard tells him not to panic and to keep watching for the next few seconds. Motor tries to leave but gets caught by Richard, and he tells the dwarves that the larger the creature is, the more it pressures its heart. Richard further explains that even though the Primal Fury and the Bloodlust have strengthened the Minotaurs, it will also increase the pressure on their heart. Richard says that they should wait for the burdens of the spell to go beyond the limit, and all of a sudden, one of the Minotaur troops falls on its back. Everyone is shocked to see the giants collapse one by one, while the system rewards Richard with 600 experience points and 800 coins for his unmatched intelligence. The Minotaur troops keep falling one by one, and Lobi curiously asks Richard what is happening. Richard says that everything is bound by some rules, and that the Minotaurs also have their limits, despite being good fighters. He says that the Minotaurs used Primal Fury to become strong, which affects their heart, hence the Bloodlust proved to be the straw that has broken their backs. Lobi becomes impressed and asks Richard if he means to say that the accumulation of magic broke through the limits of the Minotaurs' bodies and directly caused a heart attack. Richard replies positively, saying that the Minotaurs were defeated because of their proud bodies. Richard says that the idea of using Bloodlust had come to his mind when he saw the Minotaurs kneeling under the Primal Fury spell, and Lobi starts praising him for his intelligence. Richard laughs and says that vulnerability is an important element of strength, and Motor immediately says that she's the one who cast the spell. Richard looks at her and calls her a chicken that wants to take credit and asks her if she thinks that she's an experienced shaman. Motor becomes silent as she gets schooled by her boss, and Richard tells her that her experience is nothing if she runs away when it's time to face a strong enemy, and takes credit at the time of victory. He also tells Motor that the Gaoshan fortress will become more high-end in the future, but her experience is still stuck in the low end of the primitive tribe, and that it is useless. Motor becomes upset, so she hugs herself while Richard tells her that he would find somebody who is less experienced but more compliant than her. Later, Richard goes on to have a look at the corpses, or the Minotaurs, along with Gunther and Lobi. Lobi questions if the enemy is dead, and Richard says that their death is obvious as they have suffered internal bleeding. Richard says that it's a shame that the Minotaurs have died because he wanted to sell them to the Colosseum. He thinks that the enemy should be quiet for a little time after bearing such heavy losses, but he's afraid that there will be an even more turbulent storm if the enemy returns after some time. He thinks that the dwarf castle would be in more danger than ever, and asks Lobi if his bow and arrow are forged from the iron ore of the Bay Lake. Lobi replies positively, and Richard starts thinking that thanks to his overload system, he's fearless as long as he can buy more time before the war. He knows that the iron ore would belong to him sooner or later, but he realizes that he must help the dwarves through their hard times at all cost. Richard asks Lobi if he can make some more bows and arrows that can be put to great use afterward, but he becomes shocked and nervous to hear Richard's words. Lobi says that there is no problem in making the arrows, but the bed bows are a problem to make. He grabs his head out of tension and tells Richard that he wants to show him something. Lobby takes Richard to the Archer Tower, and he starts complaining about the height of the place. Lobby says that he never expected to have guests and takes Richard to a small room. He removes the cloth placed over a bed bow and tells Richard that this is the bow that his men have been constructing recently. As Lobby reveals the bow, Richard becomes shocked to see it and can't believe that the dwarves have made such a marvelous thing. Lobby tells Richard that he has some bronze plates that have the manufacturing process of these bows engraved on them, and says that he is constructing the bows by following that method. Richard asks him about the range of the weapon, and he replies that the bow is accurate under almost 700 to 800 feet. Richard says that they can shoot further if they use his binoculars, and says that no one can evade an attack from 3 crossfires at a distance. Lobby tells Richard that the problem is not about the range of the bow, but it's the string of the bow that is causing the problem, and Richard becomes confused to hear him. Lobby tells Richard that the tension of the bow is too much on the sheep's sinew that he uses as he was going to make the bow with Monica giant leeches, but he couldn't find them. Richard realizes that the dwarves lack the strings for their bows, which is why they never use their bows against the enemy in the attack. Lobby tells Richard that the Monica leeches are extremely pliable, sturdy, and rare, and says that they can be used as strings after being dried and dehydrated. Richard knows that it's tough to get the Monica leeches. He asks Lobby if he has some gold coins, and he asks Richard if he can get him some leeches with that. Richard refuses, and Lobby becomes frustrated and asks him why was he asking about the gold coins in the first place. Lobby Richard opens his system window and says that the bows used by the Centaurus have strings made of Komodo dragon tendons, which can be used as a temporary replacement if they are twisted together. Richard tells Lobby that he can help him as he doesn't have enough money, but Lobby becomes impressed by his clever idea of using the Komodo dragon tendons and says that money is not a problem for him, as he has sold a lot of turf and iron. Or recently, Richard becomes shocked to hear about the dwarf's treasure and immediately asks Lobby to give him all of it so that he can find a way to make the bows functional. Later, Sendok is carrying a wooden chest full of gold with another fellow. The other dwarf asks Sendok why they need all of this gold, and Sendok tells him that Lord Richard needs all of the gold to buy some bows. The dwarf says that Richard must have some motive for helping them, and another one says that it's fine until he doesn't attack them. Sendok tells the soldiers that they wouldn't have been able to defeat the Terrans without Richard's help, and says that Richard might be the reason that would help them win the war, as he thinks that he's the strongest among them. Later, the dwarf soldiers are using the strings from the Centaurus bows to make the dwarf bow functional, but Lobby doesn't think that the strings would be able to hold on for long if the enemy strikes again. Richard asks Lobby if he's afraid, and he becomes upset. He says that the war has been going on for a long time, and that he can afford to lose more soldiers as he has already faced a lot of casualties. Richard tells Lobby that he has a smart way of winning the battle. Lobby asks him what is it, and Richard reminds him that the war is being fought just for the iron, or which is why he thinks that they can temporarily evacuate the place, and take it back once the other tribes are vulnerable. Lobby panics and says that they can't leave the Bay Lake at any cost. Richard asks him why is he saying so, and he tells him that it's not just the iron or that they are protecting. Richard becomes curious and asks Lobby what other secrets is he hiding under the lake that he is not ready to leave the lake at any cost. Somewhere inside the castle, Sendak and Lobby are having a meeting along with other dwarves. Sendak says that he doesn't want to share his kin's secret with an outsider like Richard, and says that he opposes the idea of sharing secrets, as he thinks that the secret that is important to them might not be important to others. An elder dwarf named Reno says that Richard is not an ordinary lord, and that he must be helping them for some reason. Sendak agrees with him, and says that Richard might want to acquire their iron ore, and Lobby tells them that the Minotaurs would have taken their castle by now, if it was not for Richard and his troops. Reno says that they don't have to share their secret with Richard, even if he has helped them, and says that he's not going to accept any excuse. Lobby reminds everyone that the war is far from over, and that the dwarves are not able to stand against the second wave of the enemy. He says that he's willing to put his last chips on Richard, and dismisses the meeting. Later in the afternoon, 2 trolls are training in the forest. They are roaring and throwing punches at tree trunks, when Richard joins them and says that their training seems useless to him. Annie is also there. She tells Richard that one becomes the master of his art by practicing it, and says that witchcraft is a random thing. She tells him that one day he'll get to see its benefits even though he can't witness them at the moment. And Motor reminds Richard how he thought of the stone-skinned troll to be useless. Richard gets close to Motor, taps her on her head and tells her that she must train the trolls as hard as she can so that his magic team becomes unstoppable. Suddenly, a dwarf comes to Richard and informs him that Lobby wants to meet him. Lobby then points at the crack and enters it while Richard and Sendak also follow him inside. As Richard goes into the crack, he finds a huge creature tied up in chains and is shocked to see the body of the creature, as it's a gigantic ancient titan kept under the lake. Richard gets closer to the titan and says to himself that there is a lot more to the dwarves than what his eyes have been seeing. He realizes that the dwarves have been using the iron ore as a disguise to protect the titan and its secret. Lobby gets closer to the eyes of the titan, and they start glowing red all of a sudden. Richard realizes that the titan has awakened, and starts wondering if the titan can sense their presence. After a while, all of them reach the surface of the water and get out of the lake. Richard takes off his helmet and says that he expected to see a gold mine, but a titan is something that is out of his imagination. Lobby also takes off his helmet and tells Richard that they stumbled upon the mountain's crevasse while mining under the lake, as he and his people. Lobby asks him if he saw the Titan's eyes glowing, and he replies positively, saying that they lit up for a short moment. Lobby dives into the water once again, asking Richard to follow him. He tells Richard that the eyes of the Titan have been glowing because their soul can sense the presence of a dwarf, as according to them, the Titan is in their blood and their god as well. Titans are magical creatures whose status is higher than even dragons, according to the legends, as their existence is a symbol of power during the period of chaos between heaven and earth. Titans are undoubtedly the only overlord of the land, as they possess the magic of creation. However, no creature can escape the fate of life or death. The survival of the Titans declined, and they eventually went to the vast expanse of the earth. Richard is curious. He asks Lobby why didn't he and his people left with the Titans, as breaking through a mountain is not a difficult task for his race. But Lobby says that it's not as easy as it seems. He says that the iron ore under the lake can emit a special magnetic field that restricts the power of the Titan to its eyes only. Richard asks Lobby if he's sure about it, or if he can prove what he's saying, and he replies positively, saying that he can prove it. Lobby says that the red light was much more brighter before, but ever since they started mining the iron ore, the light has become dimmed gradually, which is why he has banned his people from mining the iron ore. Richard asks Lobby if he's going to protect the Titan until he dies, and he says that they have found out that the soul power of the Titan can automatically manifest itself whenever the moon is full, without them being close to the Titan. He says that at that time, the power is stronger than ever, and Sendak says that the full moon can maximize the power of the Titan. Lobby says that according to the ancient books, they can inherit the power of the Titan, and that if it were to happen, then they wouldn't be afraid of any kind of enemy. Richard asks Lobby if he wants to inherit the soul power of the Titan, and he says that he has failed many times while trying to do so. Sindak says that according to their elder Reno, the moon of the next day's night would be the fullest moon of the century, which is why he thinks that they might be able to inherit the soul power at that time. Richard understands why the dwarves want to hold on to the lake with their lives, and asks Lobby if he's afraid of him taking interest in inheriting the soul power of the Titan, as he didn't tell him about it earlier. Lobby says that the power of the Titan is the last sign of its glory, and that he would be more afraid if no one were to inherit it, as he doesn't want the Titan to stay under the lake for the rest of its life. Sindak tells Richard that he can also try to inherit the power of the Titan if the dwarves fail to do so, and he becomes surprised to hear him. Richard says that it is ridiculous and asks him why he thinks that a human can inherit the power when even the dwarves might fail. And Sindak says that it's difficult to say anything as he's more powerful than anyone else. Richard tells Lobby that he's connected to the Titan through kinship and that it should be easier for him to inherit the power. Lobby agrees with him, and Richard says that they should leave immediately so that no one would become suspicious of them. After taking a few steps, Lobby tells Richard to keep their secret safe, and specifically asks him not to tell Annie anything about the Titan or their conversation. Richard tells him to stay assured, as their secret is safe with him, and says that he needs to return before Annie suspects anything. Later, Richard returns to his troops, and Gunther asks him where he has been, and why is he soaking wet. Richard asks her to give him a towel as he had fallen into the lake, so Gunther quickly hands him a towel. Richard asks Gunther about everyone else, and she says that Annie has gone to watch Motor train the trolls while Heder and some other troops have gone on sentry duty. Richard starts hoping for everything to stay fine until the dwarves manage to inherit the power of the Titan, and all of a sudden, he finds Heder galloping towards him. Heder tells Richard that something is wrong, and when he asks about it, she tells him that she has seen the enemies coming towards them from 70 miles away. Richard realizes that the enemies are good at picking the timing to launch an attack. He asks Heder about the quantity of the enemies, and she tells him that there are at least 4,000 or 5,000 of them. A huge army consisting of different races has gathered around 70 miles away from the dwarf castle. They are coming towards the castle to take the iron ore, while Richard says to himself, they are going to have a huge bloody battle while the moon would be at its fullest. The lightning strikes the ground while the dwarves are blowing the war horns and preparing their bows to defend against the enemy. Sendark has already stepped into the battlefield with his soldiers, as he asks the blacksmith god for his help and forms a strong defensive wall with his shield. On the other hand, the leader of the enemy is watching the dwarves preparing for the attack. He smiles arrogantly and tells his soldiers to take down the castle of the dwarves before sunset. He sits on his throne, which is being carried by some of his servants, and his soldiers launch an attack at the castle. They start charging at the dwarves to kill them all, and the battlefield gets filled with them as they are in huge numbers. Meanwhile, Lobby says to himself that the enemy should have attacked the next day, as he thinks that they wouldn't have to suffer from the war if he had inherited the soul power of the Titan. Richard is standing beside him. He tells Lobby to keep his head high, as he's the leader of the castle, but Lobby tells Richard to take the lead instead. The enemy forces collide with the defense forces of the dwarves, and close combat between them starts. The enemies are huge in number as compared to the dwarves, as their army consists of different races. On the other hand, Richard orders his troops to release the arrows immediately, and so they do. The sky gets covered with the arrows, and most of the enemy troops on the front line get killed. The battle becomes intense, and Mater also joins it, as she keeps casting spells and launching huge and explosive fireballs at the enemy. The explosion takes down several enemies while the minotaurs keep beating the dwarves to death. Richard draws his legendary sword and steps into the battle too. He cuts the arm of the bearman holding one of his troops, and the bearman becomes shocked to see him. The bearman then attacks Richard and sends him flying away. Gunther gets worried for her boss, but Richard manages to stand on his feet instantly to take down the enemy. Richard praises the enemy, as he hasn't met anyone who has managed to hurt him in a long time. The enemy becomes frustrated and tells Richard that he will kill all of them. But Richard doesn't take him seriously and slays him with just one blow with his legendary weapon. After a few moments, the sky gets covered with dark clouds, and rain starts to pour over the battlefield as the brutal bloodshed continues. The battlefield gets covered with blood and corpses of troops from both sides. Gunther tells Richard that the enemy they are facing is too strong and that they can't kill them all. Richard opens his system window and realizes that he has lost a lot of his barbarian troops in a few seconds, and becomes concerned as it's the first time that he has faced casualties despite fighting so many battles. Richard finds another huge part of the enemy's army charging at them and realizes that the enemies are ready to risk their lives just to take them down. So he turns to Gunther and tells her to inform Heder to cover up and retreat into the castle of the dwarves. It's raining cats and dogs, and the dwarves are trying to rescue their injured soldiers while Lobi is sitting in front of Sendak's dead body, as he has taken his final breath due to some severe injuries on his chest. Lobi becomes emotional and starts to shed tears, but Richard becomes frustrated to see him cry in such a situation. He scouts and asks Lobi how can he cry at such chaotic times, and grabs him by his collar. Richard tells him to quickly gather his remaining men to defend against the Crescent tribe, and he leaves to fulfill Richard's order, while Richard stands in front of Sendak's dead body to pay tribute to him for his bravery. Annie comes and asks Richard about the update on the ongoing situation, and he tells her that as an elf, she might be able to hear the sound of the killings as the Crescent tribe is attacking them. Meanwhile, the enemies have reached the door of the dwarf castle. They are trying to break in through the door by knocking it down with a huge wooden log, but the dwarves are trying their best to hold them back. The troll from Richard's army is also helping the dwarves by forming a wooden wall in front of the door, but the troops of the Crescent tribe are climbing the walls of the castle through ladders. After a few moments, the Crescent troops and the bunny men manage to enter the castle, and they start slaying every single dwarf in their sight. Motor goes and informs Richard about the whole situation, and he is surprised as he wasn't expecting the enemy to enter the castle so soon. Richard asks Motor why isn't she attacking the enemy with her fireballs, and she says that she can't use the fireball spell as it's raining heavily. Richard becomes frustrated and asks her about Gunther and Heder, but all of a sudden a cannon call strikes the door of the fort and makes way for the enemy to breach into the castle. Gunther becomes shocked to see the Minotaurs enter the castle, and Richard asks her if she's fine, so she replies positively saying that the troll with the stone skin couldn't hold back the enemies. Richard asks Lobby how many people they have, and he tells him that they have got only 100 soldiers left. Richard smiles and says that each of them has to fight 10 enemies while the enemies are running toward him. He thinks of an idea and orders everyone to attack together with full force and disrupt the formation of the enemy. Gunther jumps into the enemy's lines and starts swinging her axe to kill the enemies, while Richard also keeps slicing the invaders in half with his legendary sword. The king of the bearmen becomes frustrated and orders his soldiers to kill Richard, so his troops start running towards him. Richard enters his rage mode, so he swings his sword in the air, activates his mysterious power, and strikes the ground with his sword. An explosion occurs and kills all of the enemies approaching him, and Gunther becomes impressed to see his abilities. She starts praising Richard, and he tells her that she has only one chance to see his true powers. On the other hand, the bearmen start dominating the dwarves easily. Gunther informs Richard that the dwarves are not able to hold back the enemies any longer, and he becomes surprised, so he immediately orders Motor to use the spell of Bloodlust on him. And all of his soldiers, Motor is using her magic while Richard is telling her to speed up the process. Motor puts all her effort into casting the spell, and Richard orders all of his magic team to use all the magic. Motor casts a powerful Bloodlust spell and launches it into the air, upgrading all of Richard's troops to a higher level. One of the bunny men strikes a dwarf with a sword but gets shocked to see the sword break after striking the dwarf's armor. The dwarves become confident and launch a joint attack with Richard's troops. They start pushing back the enemies, and the enemy king orders his reserve teams to enter the battle as well. The reserve teams start to approach Richard's soldiers, so Richard orders his troll named General A to stop the advance of the enemy. The troll forms a huge wall of wood between Richard's troops and the reserve teams, and the enemy becomes shocked to see that they have been blocked from reaching the dwarf castle. The enemy king becomes angry to see the wooden wall, and Richard realizes that the king has been separated from his subordinates. So he immediately climbs the shoulders of the other troll named General Ha to go and face the leader of the enemy. The troll activates his ability of invisibility and walks through the wooden wall with ease while Richard is standing on its shoulders. Richard goes to the king of the bears and says that it's time to end his despicable life, while the king becomes shocked to see him. Richard pulls out his sword and shoots a strong laser through the belly of the enemy king, and he stops breathing. The king falls on his face, and his troops realize that their master has been killed. They become frightened to see their master lying on the ground lifeless and immediately turn back to run from the battlefield. The enemies start running for their lives while Richard watches his troops slay them one by one and says to himself that the rats are abandoning the ship. The defensive forces of the dwarf castle have managed to secure victory by successfully defending the castle against the invaders and driving them away from their land. At night after the battle, the injured troops are being taken care of as the forces of Richard and Lobi have suffered great losses. However, the battle has rewarded Richard with many things as he is sitting beside the fire looking at the window of his system. He finds out that he and his soldiers have been upgraded to the next level, and he gets joined by Lobi. He looks at Lobi, finds him wearing a weird costume, and asks him about it. Reno tells Richard that they are preparing to inherit the power of the Titan as it's a full moon night, and Richard recalls the whole situation in his mind. Lobi says that even though the war has just ended, the opportunity that they have is once in a blue moon. He says that some of the strongest warriors from his tribe have been chosen to inherit the power of the Titan, and that he hopes that their ancestor would bring them good luck and let them inherit his power while the full moon is shining bright in the sky. The full moon is shining bright in the sky while the spellcasting team has already gone under the lake to pull up the Titan to the surface of the water. Richard is also a part of the team. The team goes to the Titan and they start doing their work. The team removes the huge chains around the Titan's body and it starts to float to the surface of the lake. The Titan appears on the surface of the lake, and everyone is surprised to see the Titan. The spellcasting team also comes out of the lake, and Liobi orders the candidates to step forward as he commands them to start the succession ceremony. He picks up a piece of wood and starts swinging it in the air over his head, and Richard starts wondering what is he trying to do. Lobi continues to carry out his ritual, and Richard starts thinking of him as a meat seller who is trying not to let the beast sit on the meat he's selling. Mater tells Richard that Lobi is driving away the bad luck as a part of the ceremony, and he asks her if she thinks that they can inherit the power from the Titan. Mota says that this is the first time that she's seen such a ritual, and tells Richard that for her race, it is believed that the experience and the insight of the elder shaman can be passed on to the next generation. Richard tells Motor that her skill is not even that powerful, otherwise the mages won't be looking down on her people, and she becomes frustrated to hear his words. She says that her race can't inherit all of the power but almost half of it, and Richard tells her that now she's making sense. Richard says that it would be hard for the successor to make up to the 10% of the power if he inherits 90% of power from the elders, while the dwarves start the ceremony officially by blowing a horn and lighting a fire in a circle in front of the Titan. The dwarves gather around the circle, and the first candidate steps into the fire circle to try his luck. He kneels and tries to summon the Titan through the blood connection, and Richard asks Motor if the ceremony is even safe to perform. Motor says that she thinks it's dangerous to put the soul of the Titan into the body of a dwarf, as his body might explode if he fails to handle the power. Richard becomes glad that he's not the candidate, while the first candidate to step into the fire circle realizes that he has failed miserably as the Titan is not responding in any way. He gets disappointed and leaves the circle, and another candidate comes to take his turn. All the candidates keep failing one by one, and Lobi becomes upset to witness such a thing. He asks the Titan to answer their call, as they are his descendants, but the Titan doesn't even move an inch. The dwarves lose hope, and Lobi asks Richard if he wants to take a turn too. Richard tries to refuse, saying that he is not a dwarf, but Lobi keeps trying to insist on him. Richard finally agrees to try his luck, so he steps into the circle of the flame, kneels and says that it's so random. He asks Lobi if he's not supposed to do anything else, and all of a sudden, the flame around him becomes intense and he gets scared. He looks at the Titan and finds its eyes glowing once again, and starts wondering if he has the dwarf blood in him. The Titan starts to crack, and a bright yellow-colored light starts to come out of the cracks of its body. Its eyes start to crack too, and a black cat-like figure appears in its eyeball. Ledzuk screams and tells Richard to run away as he thinks that the Titan is going to explode, but all the dwarves become shocked to see a mysterious animal coming out of the Titan's eye and floating toward Richard while making some weird sounds. The eyes of the Titan start to shine bright, and all of a sudden the left eye shatters into pieces, and a small white-colored bunny-like creature appears. Richard looks at the mysterious creature and starts wondering why has it come out of the Titan's eye, while the dwarves are worrying that the creature might fall and hurt itself, as they think that it's the descendant of the Titan. The dwarves immediately step forward to catch the creature so that it won't get hurt, while Motor thinks that the white creature might taste good. The creature starts to hop all around the Titan's body, and the dwarves lose their minds to see it do so. Richard says that they can be sure that the creature is the descendant of the Titan, as it likes to stay at high places, and suddenly the white creature jumps and lands on the finger of a troll. The trolls also become surprised to see the creature, and they get fascinated by its cuteness. Richard grabs the creature in his hand and realizes that it can glide as it has a patagium stretching from its forearm to its abdomen. The dwarves immediately go to Richard and ask if they can also touch the creature, and suddenly the creature starts to glow in an odd manner that makes Richard very scared. Richard immediately throws the creature towards the dwarves and tells them to catch it. He steps back and a little explosion occurs that burns the heads of the dwarves while the creature keeps sitting on Reno's head. The dwarves become speechless, and Richard starts to smile. He says that the creature is the real descendant of the Titan, as it has inherited the thunder magic from the Titan. Lobi tells everyone to look at the Titan, as the Titan starts to crack while sitting in the middle of the lake, and the dwarves become emotional to see it happen. So Lobi says that the Titan has completed its mission and that it's time for it to go back to its home. Meanwhile, the white creature keeps making weird noises, and Richard tells everyone that they will call the creature by the new witch as Chekcho, as it's inspired by the weird noises that it makes. Later during the day, Richard is sitting in a cart with Annie in front of him, while his troops are carrying a lot of luggage. Annie asks Richard why is he leaving for the Goshen fortress in such a hurry, as he hasn't even made any agreements with the dwarves. Richard tells her to relax and says that he won't pay her any lesser than her share, and she becomes frustrated to hear him. Annie asks him if he has some secret deal with the dwarves that he's trying to hide from her, but he immediately denies it with weird laughter. Suddenly, Checho appears from behind Richard and Annie is shocked to see it. She gets overwhelmed by its cuteness and immediately leans in to take a closer look. Richard tells Annie that the dwarves were going to raise Checho, but it doesn't eat anything without him being around, which is why the dwarves asked him to take it and raise it by himself. Richard pulls out a baby feeder from his storage bag and starts feeding Checho with it. He also tells it not to drink a lot or else it might get itself wet. A few days later, after a long journey, Richard returns to Goshen Fortress along with Annie. After a few moments, Annie leaves with merchant soldiers promising Richard to return to him as soon as possible to establish trade connections. Richard waits for a few days, but Annie does not return, and one day, the governor of the city Soren comes to visit Richard. Richard finds Soren coming towards his fortress with a few men, so he greets him saying that they haven't met in a long time. Soren tells Richard that he has been hearing a lot about him, and says that the bards have been singing his story too. Richard shows gratitude and asks Soren if he has come all the way just to meet him, or if he just happened to pass by through his fortress. Soren tells Richard not to be formal, as he has come specifically for him, but Richard jokingly tells him that he's not interested in men. He tells Richard that he wants to talk to him while enjoying the rare food that he has brought, and Richard agrees with him. Richard takes Soren inside the fortress, and as Soren opens his luggage, Richard realizes that the rare food that he has been talking about is teppanyaki squid. Suddenly, Checho comes out of nowhere and jumps into Richard's arms. Richard holds him gently and asks him what is he trying to do, but he gives Richard a nut. Richard cracks the nut, eats it, and drops the peel on Checho. While Soren looks at Checho and says that it's cute, he says that he can sense the magic from it, and asks Richard if it's a monster. Richard tells Soren that Checho is a descendant of the Titans, and asks Checho to call a centaur cook for him. He gives Checho a nut as a reward, and he immediately eats it and leaves to call the cook, while Soren starts to laugh to see him act so cute. Richard tells Soren that Checho has inherited the power of the Titan, despite being small, and Soren tells him that he likes his joke. Richard asks Soren if he doesn't believe him and says that he's fine with it. Later, grilled squid is served to Richard and Soren, so they sit by the fire to have a meal. Richard thanks Soren for his help and says that his expansion journey wouldn't have gone so smoothly without his help. Soren asks Richard if he knows why he has been helping him, and Richard becomes frustrated because of the suspense created by him. Soren then puts some strange powder in his mouth and tells Richard that there are two major factions within Pompel. Richard becomes shocked, and Soren tells him that one faction leads toward the Church of the Holy Light and wants Pompel to be accepted into the diocese, while the other faction is more inclined to the ice goddess and doesn't want to have too much to do with the church. Soren says that the Church of the Holy Light is the dominant faction in the human world at the moment, but in Pompel, the most northern country in the human world, the ice goddess is their faith. Soren also says that Pompel often experiences disasters from snow and ice, which is more conducive to the spread of faith in the ice goddess. Richard asks Soren if he and his half-brother Winger Orland belong to the different factions, and he replies that being a mage, he doesn't believe in God anyway, so he's neutral. Richard reminds Soren that mages don't smoke too, but he tells him that he's not smoking but inhaling a giant beaver's brain marrow powder, as it helps him relieve stress caused by the migraine, because he has to use his brain a lot, as he's a mage. Richard tells Soren that he doesn't believe in the existence of God either, as there is no proof of him descending to the earth, and he says that it's hard for him to believe in something that doesn't even exist. Soren tells Richard that he has been investigating him for a long time, as infidels like him are quite rare. He tells Richard that he helped him because he thinks that the rare species are worth protecting, and Richard becomes shaken to his core to find out why Soren has been helping him out. Richard asks Soren if he wants him to be a centrist, and he says that it had been his plan. Richard becomes even more shocked and tells him to keep dreaming, and says that the centrists are the ones who are targeted by the two factions of the Empire whenever there is a dispute. Soren tells Richard that he's correct and advises him to choose the Holy Church of Light if he ever has to choose one of the two factions one day. Richard asks him the reason for such a statement, and Soren puts a gold, silver, and a copper coin in front of him. He tells him that the coins are different types of coins used in Pompel and says that the gold coin is equal to 12 silver coins, while a silver coin is equal to 24 copper coins. Soren then raises his hand and says that they have 10 fingers, and that they could have adjusted the ratio more easily, but they didn't do so. Richard asks if it's because the ice goddess has 12 feather wings, and that there are 24 gods beneath her, and Soren tells him that the ice goddess holds deep influence over the world. Richard doesn't pay attention to Soren's words, and picks up the gold coin in front of him. Soren asks him why is he going crazy over a single gold coin, as he's now a famous and strong person, and Richard says that he needs money. He tells Soren that he still owes him 1,000 gold coins, but Soren tells him that the credit has been increased to 1,001 gold coins, as he has picked up another gold coin in front of his eyes without his permission, and Richard loses his mind to hear Soren say such a clever thing. Later, Soren is getting ready to leave Goshen, so Richard asks him if he's leaving already. Soren asks Richard if he thinks that he moves without a plan, and he becomes frustrated to hear that he can come and go by his will. Richard tells Soren that he's very spontaneous, and he tells him that he put down a bunch of work to visit him, as he came to know that he was developing quite well. Richard tells Soren that he's the only one to have such a privilege, and he replies that it's nothing to be jealous of. He tells Richard that there are broader territories that are waiting to be explored by him, and he asks Soren if he regrets not doing his job in the first place. Soren refuses and mounts his horse. He says that he's slightly allergic to the beaver brain powder that he was inhaling earlier, as it makes his neck itchy, but it's important for him, as his migraine is quite serious. Soren says that he knows that he's exempt from unbearable pain, even though he complains about an itchy neck. He tells Richard that this is how he makes a choice and hits the road with his soldiers. Later, Richard is lying on the bench under the sun when all of a sudden, Motor informs him that Annie has returned, and he finds Annie waving at him from some distance. Annie takes a look at the Geihashun fortress and is shocked to see its infrastructure, as it has been developed a lot under Richard's supervision. She says that the fortress has changed a lot, and Richard asks her if she can't recognize it. Richard says that the trolls trained by Motor are making the flowers and weeds grow all around the place, using their fertilization techniques even though he doesn't like them. Annie finds some dwarves working at the fortress, so she becomes curious, and she asks Richard about them. Richard tells her that the dwarves are living with them as their army was almost wiped out of existence, and Annie becomes a bit frustrated to hear Richard's words. She tells him that she knows that he had a secret deal with the dwarves that he has been hiding from her, but Richard replies coldly and tells Annie that the deal was made after she left, but she doesn't believe him. Annie finds some bunny girls standing beside Richard and flapping banana leaves at him, while he relaxes under the open sky. She asks Richard, who are they? And after thinking for a second, he says he's a soft-hearted person, and that after the battle many tribes have been wiped out, which is why their remaining members have taken the initiative to come and settle at the Geishan fortress, so he can't turn them back. Richard blames everything on Motor and says that she's the one who told him to take the girls in and make them his maids, as they didn't have anyone to return to. Motor becomes confused and surprised to see Richard pouring all the dirt on her, but Annie tells him that she wants to show him something. Suddenly, a person wearing a cloak walks towards them, and Annie tells Richard that she wants to introduce him to a famous naturalist whose name is Buckland. The person removes the cloak from her face and greets Richard, while he is shocked to see a tigress standing in front of him. Annie tells Richard that Buckland belongs to the famous White Tiger clan, and specializes in art rather than combat. Buckland tells Richard that her nickname is Sugar, and that he can call him Sugar Tiger too. Richard tells her that he's glad to meet her and starts thinking of an artist whose name is similar to Sugar's name. Annie tells Richard that Sugar wants to do some wilderness research at the Gaoshan fortress, and asks him if he's fine with it. Richard agrees with a smile and tells Annie that he doesn't have any problem with it. Later, Gunther comes to Richard with some men and informs him that she's leaving. Richard asks her to come back soon, and tells her that he's hoping that she will bring back more barbarians with her. Gunther smiles and tells Richard that she will bring the whole tribe, and he bids her farewell as she leaves with a bunch of troops. Richard asks Annie if she can help him put an eye out in case there is any good combat book at the market, and she replies positively, but tells him not to keep his hopes high, as she thinks that good things can't be bought with money. Suddenly, a dwarf named Irony comes to Richard and he becomes worried to see him, so he immediately tells Irony to have some rest and not wear out himself. But Irony tells him that the new blast furnace has been completed and says that the blacksmiths are preparing to try it. Richard looks in the direction that Irony is pointing to and starts to smile as the dwarf tribe has bought a lot of blacksmiths and an abundance of iron ore with them. Richard is happy as the military industry of the Gaoshan fortress is finally on track after so many sacrifices and efforts. Gunther has returned to the fortress, and she is surprised to see the new war equipment that the dwarves have been building behind her back. She takes a look at a shining metal armor and starts praising it. Richard comes to her and asks her what she thinks about the new equipment, and she tells him that it's incredible but asks him how to use it. Richard tells her that the armor has been designed by Lobby, and that they can use it by pressing a red button on its back plate. He presses the button and the armor opens up, and he tells Gunther that it's a fast arming armor. Gunther becomes shocked and asks Lobby what name has he given to the armor, as she finds it wonderful. Lobby tells her that the name of the armor is the Titan armor, and she says that it's quite a cheesy name, while Richard is trying to take off the armor, but he's not able to open it up by pressing the button on his back. He gets frustrated and asks Gunther to help him take the armor off, and so she does. She jokingly asks him if the armor is not easy to take off, and Lobby says that the armor is not fast, unarming. A soldier walks into the room and tells Richard that some lizardmen want to meet him, so he becomes surprised and asks for his telescope. Richard looks at the lizardmen through his telescope and asks his soldier to reject them as he thinks that they are very small and don't seem so powerful. Richard's soldier tells him that the lizardmen want to meet him as they are passing by the fortress, and he becomes disgusted to hear such words. Gunther smiles and asks Richard if she should capture the lizardmen and interrogate them about their motive, but Heder tells her to calm down, as she thinks that there is no need to be over-impulsive. Bunkin arrives and says that the lizardmen are headed to Pompel, and Richard asks her why she thinks so. Bunken says that it's normal for the lizardmen to go to Pompel as His Majesty Sagras started to recruit powerful orcs years ago. Richard becomes confused and asks what the recruitment of the orcs has to do with the lizardmen, and Annie tells him not to underestimate the lizardmen as they are also known as the dragon tamers. Richard gets shaken to his core, but Annie tells him not to be excited, as she's talking about a dragon-like species called Scalar Stegosaurus, not some real dragons. Richard asks Annie why didn't she mention it before, and says that he thought she was smart. Annie becomes angered to hear Richard's words and dares him to repeat his words. Bonklin says that the Scalars are very skeptical and that a Stegosaurus is born with a lizard at the same time, which is why it's not accurately right to call the lizardmen the dragon tamers, because they are blood related to the Scalars. Richard asks if the main production is of the Scalars or the lizards, and Buckland tells him that the Scalars are born infertile, which is why they are called the byproduct of reproduction. Richard asks her how big is a Stegosaurus, and she tells him that it's slightly smaller than his iron armadillo, and says that a Stegosaurus has feet like horses' hooves, and is good at fighting. Richard becomes even more excited, and orders his soldiers to invite the lizards to stay overnight. Buckland asks him about his plan, and he smiles like an evil, and says that he will make the lizard men stay at Gaussian Fortress. Buckland tells him to keep dreaming, and asks him why he thinks that the lizard men would choose a lord with an uncertain future over a king. Later, the lizard men have agreed to stay at the Gaussian Fortress, and Richard asks their representative to bring the rest of their tribe, so that he can talk about other things. The representative of the lizardmen agrees with Richard and addresses him as a lord. Buckland becomes shocked to see the lizardmen do so, and asks Richard if he has managed to make them stay. Richard says that he never fails, and she asks him if he has drugged the lizardmen, as they are quite clever. Richard tells Buckland that he made an offer to the lizardmen, saying that he would give each of them a magic potion that would enhance their strength if they agreed to stay at the Gaussian Fortress Aix. They didn't even think before accepting his offer. Buckland becomes a bit confused and refuses to believe Richard, as she thinks that he's making excuses, starts to shake violently. Richard smiles, looks to his right and says that he wants a regiment of invincible Stegosaurus approaching him. Richard is standing at the entrance of the Gaussian Fortress, looking at the Stegosaurus and the lizardmen approaching them. Checho gets afraid and hides under Richard's clothes while Gunther asks Heater if she thinks that the Centaurus can beat the dragon beats. Heater says that the Stegosaurus won't be able to dodge her shooters as they are too bulky, and Richard says that the Scalars are heavy cavalry. He uses his telescope to see a huge number of lizardmen approaching him with their Stegosaurus, and says to himself that it's his Stegosaurus regiment. The Stegosaurus enters the fortress, and as they pass through, Annie looks at them and says that it's a shame that they are too small, and that it would be good if they were replaced by some powerful knights. Richard says that it's easier to get a replacement, but the trust between the lizards and the Stegosaurus can be built with blood relation only. Buckland says that nature has given the powers to the Stegosaurus, but also enslaved them as the thin babies of the Scalars are not able to survive during reproduction, which makes it difficult for their reproduction rate to grow. A lizard comes to Richard, greets him and introduces himself as Abu, the leader of Scalars. Richard smiles at him and asks him what he thinks about the fortress, so he takes a look around the place and says that it's very prosperous. Richard asks Abu to get his people, and tells him that he will give him the magic potion that he promised, and Abu starts thanking him for his humbleness. Later, Richard is sitting at a table having his meal, while Buckland and Annie are also sitting beside him. Richard is looking at his system, thinking that he never expected the system to separately identify the Stegosaurus, as they are blood relatives of the lizards. He looks at their statistics and realizes that the magic potion has worked on the Stegosaurus too. Buckland tells Richard that Annie told her that he was looking for combat books, and he asks her if she has any of them. Buckland refuses, and Richard becomes frustrated, but she suggests he learn the holy prayer. Richard says that the prayer focuses more on the cultivation of the mind, so when it's combined with the physical body, it can stimulate incredible power. He says that it was eliminated because it's outdated for some reason, so he's not interested in such old things anymore. Annie speaks up and repeats Richard's words, asking Buckland if the prayer has been outdated, and she says that the young people either blindly worship the ancients, or blindly devalue them. She asks Richard how much power he has in a punch, and he says that he's not sure about it. He pulls back his hand and throws a punch in the air with his full force and puts out a candle in front of him, by the force and pressure exerted by his punch. Richard says that he's guessing that his punch has a power of 2 tons, and Buckland asks him if he knows what will the holy prayer do for him. Richard asks her to spit out the truth, and she tells him that the holy prayer can help him boost his strength. But Richard acts arrogant, and Buckland asks him if according to his strength he wants to say that the strong get stronger while the weak get weaker. She tells him that the holy prayer would increase his magic resistance dramatically if it's cultivated to a certain level. She says that she happened to get the first stage of the holy prayer while she was traveling, and gives an old rolled paper to Richard. Richard unrolls the paper and finds Analu, a name written on it, so he starts wondering if it's the swordsman that got dual training in combat and magic. Buckland says that 3,000 years ago, in the hidden era of the times, the cultivation of chi and magic was extremely difficult, so as holy prayer didn't rely on common elements, it became mainstream. And Ailu wasn't only outstanding in holy prayer, but also cultivated magic and became a tutor. Richard tells Buckland that he believes none of her words, and she says that parchment can only be preserved for so long, and that it should be the future generation's responsibility to copy it. Richard settles down, and Buckland asks him if she can have the honor of being the interior officer of the Geishan fortress, and Richard agrees with her, saying that he has no problem with it. Richard tells Buckland that it's perfect if she wants to start an internal affairs management system for the Geishan fortress, as she's an educated person, and she becomes happy to hear his words. Buckland becomes excited and says that the Geishan fortress is a kind of place that is developing wildly with intense vitality, and says that she hasn't seen such a beautiful thing in a long time, which is why she loves this place too much. Richard is sitting in his room reading about the stages of the Holy Prayer from the paper given to him by Buckland. He comes to know that the Holy Prayer has 5 stages, and that they range from low to high, starting from sunlight, starlight, moonlight, obsidian, and apocalypse. He reads that the sunlight stage can be used for half an hour a day to increase half the strength, and after it's upgraded, the duration and effect will be doubled. Richard decides to give it a try to see if he can grasp it. He gets excited and calls himself a genius and says to himself that this is exactly what it's like for Holy Prayer entry. Richard knows that it takes at least a month for normal people to get to this stage, as he has already activated the sunlight stage. He starts thinking that he will officially enter the sunlight stage if he can channel the warm glow into power coiled in his heart. He starts wondering if he should get it done before going to bed, but after a second, he changes his mind and decides to check his overlord system and leave the rest for the next day. Richard opens the system's window and gets shaken to his core to see the system showing him that the Holy Prayer has already been updated. He realizes that he has got some points for himself, and starts wondering if he should put those points on the Holy Prayer too. Richard has been saving his points for too long, and now they are getting more difficult to attain. He says that he can't earn enough points, even though he never misses his training session, and decides to take a risk as his inner turmoil is going crazy. He gets excited and says that he's going to make the world's fastest upgrade, and puts the points on the Holy Prayer. Richard's system tells him that he has reached the maximum level of proficiency, and rewards him with an additional 30 points. He says to himself that he can feel it as his heart is surrounded by a shrinking and cohesive miniature sun, which he thinks is the light power. Richard's torso starts to glow, and some golden particles appear in front of him in the air. He starts thinking that they are the light power surge. He looks at his roof and realizes that the power has improved his eyesight, as he's able to see the details that he wasn't able to see before. He clenches his fist and says to himself that the thin air has become as sticky as glue, and he feels like he can use every part of nature. He realizes why Buckland was highly suggesting he use the Holy Prayer, and decides to put the remaining points on it too. Later, Richard is lying outside on a bench, daydreaming that everyone would be impressed by his potential, and that Buckland would be crazy to see him make such crazy progress in just one night, and would declare him her idol. Hidder, Gunther, and Lobi come and greet Richard. They tell him that he looks in quite a great mood, but he gets upset, as no one has realized how much he has progressed in the Holy Prayer in just one night. He finds Buckland at some distance reading a book, so he immediately goes to her, and as he is about to tell her about the light power, she cuts him off and tells him that the next part that he must read is about the warm flow if he is done reading about the light power. Richard becomes even more upset and sad as he realizes that he's talking to a wall because Buckland is not even listening to him carefully, and asks him what to do with the bronze weapons stacked at the warehouse. Buckland takes interest and asks Richard about the bronze weapons, and he tells her that some wild people dug up the bronze weapons and his troops have captured them. He says that he almost forgot about them, and that the weapons contain a sword to which he thinks belongs to the time of Nero's rebellion and can earn him a lot of money. Richard smiles and tells Lauby that they should be able to sell the bronze weapons for a large sum of money, as long as they have dozens of them, and Buckland asks if she can also look at the weapons that he's talking about. A few moments later, Richard goes to the warehouse and is surprised to see a mountain of bronze weapons in front of him, as he never expected them to be in such huge numbers. He says that it's too much, and thinks that heaven has rained the weapons down upon them, and that the days are also looking up for them. He says that the bronze weapons are not like wildflowers, but they are too expensive because of their scarcity, and Buckland picks up one of them to take a look. She takes a closer look at the weapon and says that it doesn't seem right to her, and she thinks that they are very well preserved. She licks the blade of the weapon, and says that the weapon might be coming from an ancient tomb or armory. She rubs it against her face and says that she always heard about such weapons, but never expected to see them in reality. Richard becomes greedy and says that he's going to become filthy rich. He asks his soldiers to call Motor, as she is well aware of the wilderness, and they leave to bring her. A few moments later, the guards drag Motor toward Richard, and she starts saying that she hasn't stolen the milk of the trolls. Richard smiles in her face and tells her to answer his questions, so she agrees with him. Richard points at the weapons behind him and asks her if she has seen those weapons before in the tribes, and she replies positively. As her eyes sparkle up, Richard becomes super excited and starts asking her so many questions about the weapons, and she says that they were exchanged from the neighbor to the east around 6 months ago. She also tells him that the weapons were brought by many tribes as they are cheaper than the iron ones, and Richard loses his mind to hear her words. He shouts and asks her why didn't she tell him such an important detail earlier, and she asks him why is he taking so much interest in a junk like that. Mortar tells Richard that their homemade weapons are much better, and says that the bronze weapons are crap in front of them. Buckland starts to smile, and Richard tells himself not to take Mortar seriously, as he thinks that she's not much educated. He taps her on her shoulder, and tells her that he's going to give her a new task. He tells her that he will assign her 10 troops, and that she will have to find out the source and origin of the bronze weapons. Motor smiles and asks Richard if she can deny the task, but he tells her not to even think about it. Later, Motor leaves with 10 troops and starts her journey to find the source of the bronze weapons. Fortunately, after a few hard fights, the Gyewanshan Fortress has established a resounding reputation as the Scarlet Devil Fortress. Motor becomes extremely popular during her journey, and countless aborigines are fawning. The bronze weapons keep circulating on the market, hence Motor finds the origin, and by the time she comes back, her search party has been increased from merely 10 troops to 100 people. Motor and her search party are standing at the gates of the Gyewanshan Fortress while Richard is watching them through his telescope as he thinks that an army is approaching to attack his fortress. Buckland tells Richard that the source of the people along with Motor is very complex, as all of them belong to different tribes, and Richard tells her to give each of them a nickel and put them to work for cutting the grass and feeding the cattle. Later, Richard puts Motor's work party on the work while she's showing him a place on the map. She says that her search party belongs to a certain place on the map, and Richard becomes shocked to see that the place is around 100 miles in size. He decides to pick up a reliable guide and dozens of people as he wants to go there by himself and see what's happening. He says that he will exchange the people with 100 tons of wheat beans and feed the Stegosaurus as their bellies never get filled. Later, Richard is getting ready to leave while he tells his soldiers to guard the fortress behind his back. After a week, Richard returns, and Annie tells everyone about it. Buckland asks him how was his trip, and he shows her a cart full of ancient weapons and armor. He says that he never fails, and Annie says that she hopes that those weapons won't collapse the price of the ancient weapons on the market. Richard gets off his horse, and Buckland asks him about the bunny men that he took with him, and he says that he has left them behind to chisel down a beautiful fresco on the wall of that place. Duncan asks him if anything would happen to the bunny men, and he tells her not to worry, as he thinks that no one would attack them. Meanwhile, the massive leakage of the bronze weapons has managed to catch the attention of another legion, as Hendra Gunawanri, commander of the Brown Bear Boar Army of the Kingdom of Stuarts, is standing at some distance from the origin of the bronze weapons that have been looted by Richard a few days ago. Hendra belongs to the Kingdom of Stuarts, which is one of the 3 major powers. He is the grandchild of the imperial marshal of a kingdom equally strong as Pompol. With a powerful family background, a noble origin, and a great future, Hendra is an aristocratic noble, not an ordinary person. Unfortunately, things are not as simple as that. After training with his brother, Hendra was sent to the border as the commander of the Brown Bear Boar Legion. The Kingdom of Stuarts has strict rules for naming the legions, as the name can tell a lot. The first-tier elite legions are named after natural disasters like Storm Fury, while the second-tier legions are named after powerful beasts like Dragonhorn or Eagle Armor. But the names of ordinary animals like bears, boar, or elephants are given to the worst tier, which is the 3rd legion that Hendra commands. Hendra is 27 years old and doesn't seem to have any kind of promotion opportunities. But he's the kind of person who would never give up. A few days ago, while fighting the bandits, he came to know that they had a lot of bronze weapons, so he immediately began to investigate it, and it didn't take him much time to find out the origin of the ancient bronze weapons. But Hendra is looking at the place that Richard looted some time ago. When his soldier comes and asks him if he wants them to capture the people inside and start interrogating them, Hendra orders his soldiers to just crush the people, as he thinks that the answer will reveal itself. So he orders his men to set up the camp, because he wants them to launch an attack after the sunset. On the other hand, the bunny men are trying their best to chisel down the fresco on the wall, but they are not able to succeed after so much effort, as the wild people that were helping them earlier are not doing anything now. One of them says that they should leave the rest of the work for the next day, as it's quite dark, and all of them agree with him to have some rest. Fitipits is a bunny man trying to chisel the fresco too. He goes to take a dump into the bushes, and behind his back, Hendra launches a surprise attack and kills almost all of his mates while he's still in the bushes hiding from the invaders. Hendra wipes off the blood of the workers from his blade and asks his soldier about the update. The soldier tells him that the ancient weapons that they are looking for were found by the people they have killed, but Hendra asks him where are the weapons. The soldier hesitantly tells Hendra that a lord from Pampel came and took all of them 3 days ago, and Hendra asks about the lord who beat them to it. The soldier tells him that the lord is from the Gyewanshan Fortress, and that the people say that he's a direct descendant of the god because he's extremely powerful. Hendra says that the people are uneducated, and that he doesn't want to pay attention to their words as he thinks that the enemy is just a lord who is trying to expand his territories. Hendra says that a war is about to start, and his soldier tells him that they would be in big trouble if the word reaches Pampel. Hendra agrees with him, but says that it would take around a month for the words to reach Pampel if the lord gets wiped out. But, in the meantime, he thinks that the griffins would ruin the corpse of the lord, and that no one would ever know about his miserable death. All of a sudden, he senses a very unpleasant smell, and Fitipits becomes scared as he thinks that he might be caught by the invaders. On the other hand, Richard is sitting at a table with Buckland and others when she says that the king of the Kingdom of Stewards is called Baroni. She says that he has a lot of eccentric ideas, and that he appointed a lot of kids as the chief of the guard legions, which is why the kids feel lucky to be in the army, so they invest in the equipment from their own pockets. Buckland asks Richard if he knows how many gold coins the Kingdom of Stuart saved by using such a simple trick, but he remains silent. She tells him that the kingdom has saved at least 100,000 gold coins, and everyone is shocked to hear her. Gunther asks what Barony did with so much money, and she says that he squandered it as he's known for lust and gluttony. Richard smiles and calls Barony a corrupted person, and all of a sudden, two soldiers enter the room with a bunny man struggling to walk. Richard becomes frightened to see them and realizes that the bunny man is Fitipits, as he raises his head and informs him that someone is going to attack the Gaoshan fortress, which makes him surprised. Richard asks if the army coming to attack them is the Bearboar Legion, and Buckland tells him not to worry, as she's aware that a legion of the Stork Kingdom has no more than 4,000 soldiers, and since the Brown Boar Legion is a garrison, it won't have more than 3,000 soldiers. Richard says that he thought that the legions were the upper rankings unit, but he's more worried about the number of wizards that might accompany the army, as he remembers that the wizards played a huge role in the battle against the Minotaurs. Annie becomes scared and says that it would be very difficult to deal with the enemy if their wizards were stronger, while he starts thinking of his wizard team as a jerk with two trolls that he thinks are no less than idiots. Vulcan tells him to calm down as the advanced wizards are too rare, despite being powerful, and Annie says that Barony is very suspicious, and she thinks that the advanced wizards will only be issued to the army at the time of war. Annie says that it's the time of peace, and Richard tells her that he didn't know that she would know so much about something else other than money. Annie teases and him asks him if he doesn't know about it. She says that there were a lot of voices from both the sides, and all the countries knew about it, and he asks her when did such a thing happen. Annie tells him that it happened exactly 20 years ago, and he says that he wasn't even born 20 years ago, and tells Annie that not everyone can live as long as her, as she's 114 years old. Buckland says that she doesn't think that they should worry about the wizards, and Richard says that the wizards of the opponent might be even worse than his wizards. He says that the enemy has 3,000 soldiers and is not accompanied by any wizard, which is why he thinks that they won't be able to return alive if they ever come to attack him. Buckland becomes shocked to hear him, and says that even if he puts all of his soldiers on the front, he won't have more than 600 soldiers, and asks him how can he be so relaxed as the enemy is at least 5 times larger than their force. Richard ignores Buckland and tells Annie that the spoils of the battle will belong to her, and she becomes extremely happy to hear it. Annie asks Richard if he's sure that they don't need reinforcements, but he arrogantly says that the great lords don't take help from anyone, and dismisses the battle meeting. Thousands of people in the Gaehashan fortress have started preparing for the war. To avoid loss or damage, Richard has decided to present the battlefield in the east, as the fortress is located on the west of the river. He has also ordered his people to build a fake Lord Hall on the east bank of the river, to confuse the enemy, while his trolls are using their fertilization skills to form a green wall at the bank of the river, using tall wild grass and weeds. 20 days later, the two sides face each other for the first time, and after a first round of cautious testing, they charge directly at each other. Even though the scouts of Henda have good riding skills, they are nothing in front of Henda and her centaur troops, which is why the battle between them ends in no time. Hida returns and tells Richard that she saw the enemy approaching them with heavy cavalry, and he says that it means that the enemy has quite valuable equipment. He looks through his telescope and says that the speed of the enemy is quite slow, as even after 20 days, only their rangers have managed to come near his fortress, which is why he thinks that it would take them a few more days to arrive at the gates of the Gaoshan fortress. Meanwhile, Hendra looks at the arrows shot by Richard's troops and realizes that they are using the Centaurus troops as rangers. He snaps the arrow and says that despite trying to delay the inevitable, his enemies will be defeated once his army arrives. 2 days later, Hendra is frustrated to see his cartwheels getting tripped continuously because of the weeds, as they are slowing down his marching speed. He can't even leave behind his soldiers, as he has a heavy cavalry of 200 soldiers that are very important for him for the battle. Later, Gunther and Richard are in a watchtower, when Gunther informs Richard that the enemy has arrived. He takes a deep breath and picks up his telescope to watch the enemy, and as he sees them, he questions himself if he has been waiting for such a shabby regiment over the past few days. He realizes that the front of the cavalry armor of the enemy is made of metal, while the back is made out of cowhide. He also looks at their horses and says that the enemy has no right to be so arrogant, as their horse armor doesn't even have any protection at the back. Richard becomes frustrated and says that he's not willing to waste time over such a child's play, while Hendra is approaching him with his soldiers having high hopes. Hendra is standing at some distance from the fortress and watching Richard's forces through a telescope. He looks at the barbarian troops standing in front of him with strong armor and realizes that he has underestimated the enemy and their force. Suddenly, Hendra's soldier points at the huge tall reeds made by the trolls and asks Hendra to take a look at them, as they have grown to a wild size. The soldier asks Hendra if he thinks that there could be an ambush in the reeds, but he refuses, saying that it's not possible to catch up speed while running through the muddy soil of the reeds. Hendra screams and orders his soldier to prepare for an attack. He commands his infantry to form the front and his cavalry to form up the flanks. Hendra's soldiers seem to have a very high morale. They quickly form their formation and launch a batch of arrows at Richard and his troops, but Richard's troops defend themselves using shields. Gunther defends herself and Richard using a shield, while Richard keeps standing unfazed, and Gunther asks him if they shall attack too. Richard stays patient and tells Gunther to practice patience too, as he wants the enemy to come a little closer. The commanders of both sides have one thing in common. That is, they are extremely confident in their forces. But Hendra fears that Richard might flee, while Richard fears that Hendra might find out about his surprise attack. Paired is only focusing on defense, fearing to discourage the opponent's offense. The enemy starts running towards Richard and his troops as it has launched an attack, and Gunther informs him about the enemy being only 20 yards away. Richard confidently orders his troops to slay all the enemies, and they enter the battlefield to defend their fortress. As Richard's troops move forward, some barbarian appears from the reeds, and also attacks the soldiers of Hendra, leaving him surprised and wondering where have they come from. Hendra is shocked to realize that his troops have been lured into the trap by Richard, and says to himself that he cannot afford to lose the battle, as the brown bear roar is his everything. Hendra immediately orders his cavalry to attack and tells them to stay calm. He says that the enemy is short in numbers while his cavalry rides down the battlefield thinking that they have an advantage over Richard's troops for being greater in number. Meanwhile, Richard's troops are fighting with great power. He tells them to hold on to the enemy's infantry as their cavalry is also approaching them, and his troops keep killing the enemies on the battlefield with ease. Hendra becomes a bit nervous. He hopes that the surprise attack by his cavalry will destroy Richard's troops, but he notices the reeds close to him shaking violently. Hendra and his reserve soldiers are shocked to see the reeds move, but all of a sudden, the Stegosaurus appears with little wooden huts on their back, while Richard says to himself that even though the speed of the Stegosaurus is very slow, their strength can't be doubted in any way, which is why he thinks that it's too late for the enemy to change its route. Hendra's cavalry unit becomes shocked to see the Stegosaurus, and they lose control of their horses. They start wondering what kind of creature are they even facing, as they haven't seen a Stegosaurus before, and Richard realizes that choosing to withdraw forces is no less them committing suicide for the enemy. Richard's Stegosaurus unit strikes Hendra's heavy cavalry and starts tossing them into the air along with their weapons as well as their horses. Richard's Stegosaurus are attacking Hendra's heavy cavalry as they have been caught by surprise while the lizard men keep shooting arrows at them from the tiny wooden huts on the back of the Stegosaurus. The Stegosaurus keeps dominating the enemy's cavalry while beating them with ease, and Moda decides to join the battle along with the trolls. She says that it's her turn, so she launches a huge fireball into the air and throws it into the enemy's lines. A huge explosion occurs due to the fireball, and the enemies start burning to death while the trolls keep shooting them with their powers too. Hendra becomes frustrated to see his troops losing the battle, so he immediately orders his griffin to kill the wizards harming his troops. The griffin immediately leaves and starts to move towards Motor while Hendra orders his elite cavalry unit to prepare for attack. The elite cavalry unit gets ready while Motor notices the griffin running towards her, so she tries to tell the trolls about it, but she gets ignored by them and she loses all of her hope. The griffin breathes fire at Motor to kill her, but she uses her staff, casts a spell and intercepts the griffin's flame in the air over the heads of the soldiers using her power. On the other hand, Richard has also stepped onto the battlefield, and he's slaying the enemies with his legendary weapon quite easily. He smiles and keeps slicing the enemies in half, and they start wondering if he's a monster. Suddenly, the enemies find their leader Hendra joining the battle as he runs towards Richard while all of his troops are in his way. Hendra comes closer to Richard and hits the ground with his sword, and an explosion occurs that puts a deep crack into the ground. Richard looks at him and wonders if he's the leader of the enemy, as he can feel his murderous aura. The enemies become happy to see their leader joining them in battle, so they start celebrating and become confident. Hendra smiles and introduces himself to Richard, and asks him who he is. Richard smiles, points his sword at him, and tells him that he doesn't deserve to know his true identity, as he's the one who attacked the Gaoshan fortress without any reason. Richard asks Hendra for his last words as he's about to kill him for invading his territory, but Hendra becomes frustrated and tells Richard that he would get his mouth sewed after killing him, and quickly steps forward to settle the dispute. Hendra gets closer to Richard and attacks him with his sword, but Richard blocks him and attacks him back. Richard keeps attacking Hendra, and he keeps blocking all of them, so he pushes him back and says that it seems like he has trained himself. Hendra says to himself that Richard is much better than he thought, but his life is going to end in a few moments. He smiles wickedly, as 3 of his elite infantrymen try to approach Richard from his back, and Hendra's troops become happy to see them. Richard tells Hendra that he thought he was an honorable person, but he's trying to sneak up on him. He smiles and says that it's quite unfortunate for him, as he has got himself a backup plan, and proceeds to activate his light power. Richard then swings his sword towards the enemies approaching him, and within a few seconds, he manages to slice down Hendra's elite infantrymen into halves, using his legendary sword. The enemies become shocked by Richard's extreme power, while Motor and the trolls are running for their lives, as the griffin is breathing fire at them. The griffin causes an explosion, and Motor falls on her face, along with the trolls. But all of a sudden, an arrow comes out of nowhere and pierces through the throat of the griffin. The griffin immediately stops advancing and starts to cough. Halfhitni orders all of the Centaurus archers to shoot the griffin, as she was the one to shoot it in its throat. The Centaurus archers launch a lot of arrows at the griffin, and its body gets covered in arrows within a second, while Hednal soldiers become surprised to see their leader's mount get taken down by their enemies. Hendra becomes extremely frustrated. He calls Richard and his troops bastard and immediately gets up to attack Richard. He tries to attack Richard with his sword, but Richard blocks his attack with his weapon and asks him why is he calling him a bastard when he's the one who started the war without any reason. Richard kicks Hendra in the belly and pushes him a few steps back. He then attacks Hendra with his sword, but Hendra remains calm as he knows that his armor will only become stronger after each of Richard's strikes as it's magical. However, Richard keeps hitting Hendra's armor and he becomes shocked to realize that his armor is not getting any stronger against Richard's attack. He screams out of frustration and starts wondering why is Richard not hurt yet. All of a sudden, Richard delivers a powerful blow at Hendra, but he tries to block it with his sword and ends up losing it as it gets broken into in half. Hendra becomes upset about losing his sword, and Richard knocks him down by kicking him in the chest. Hendra falls on his back, and Richard tells him that he doesn't deserve to be a chief if he can't even fight without his weapon. Richard tells Hendra that his magical armor is so powerful that his hands are burning, and he becomes shocked. He says that the fire counter-strike can incinerate a person, but can't believe that it has given only a few blisters to Richard on his palm. He becomes disappointed, so he kneels in front of Richard and says that he surrenders while his troops become saddened to realize that they have been defeated. Richard's troops start to celebrate as they have secured another victory in the battleground. Gunther asks Richard if they should lock all the prisoners, and he tells her to lock up Hendra first and to remove his armor before doing anything else. Richard picks up Hendra's armor and realizes that he has ruined it. He starts crying as he hugs the armor and apologizes to it, and Annie asks him if he's fine. Richard shows her the broken armor and tells her that it has broken his heart, and Annie becomes a bit frustrated as she is about to give him the last bottle of holy water from her bag. Buckland comes and takes a look at the armor and asks if there are magical crystals attached to it. She says that she has heard that the magical crystals are extremely valuable and necessary for making magical equipment. She also tells Richard that he can still use the armor if the blacksmith replaces the damaged part, as the spell cast on the armor is still intact. Richard becomes surprised, and Buckland tells him that he might not believe her, but he won't be able to wear the armor as it's bigger than his size. Richard thinks for a moment, and then throws away the armor, saying that he would leave it to Lobby as he has some other things to do. He tells Buckland that he's leaving the captives to her, as he thinks that they will be able to earn him a lot of money, and she tells him that it's an honor for her. Annie talks about the spoils of the war and says that they can make a lot of money by selling the horses of the enemies, but Richard says that he was thinking about eating them. Annie tells him that the captives can be sold to the captive merchant in Colin, as it's easier to sell them than to keep them. She says that they might be able to make around 4 or 5 gold coins per captive, and he is surprised to hear her, as he thinks that he's going to make a lot of money. Buckland and Annie leave while Richard looks at them and says to himself that they are way better than him at doing business. He says that there are many things in the world that he must learn, other than forces, and starts thinking of filling up his bank and completely erasing his poverty by selling the captives and the bronze weapons for a lot of money. Besides everything, Richard is glad that due to the battles, the lizards have also been upgraded a lot. He realizes that the Stegosaurus have also grown their muscles, and thinks that he earns more experience points while fighting in a group. Later in the evening, Richard is having dinner at the table, when Buckland tells him that she wants him to go to the city with her this time. Richard becomes surprised and confused, so Buckland tells him that he must inform the entirety of the battle between him and Hendra to the imperial family, as he's well aware of the relations between Pompel and the Kingdom of Stuarts that have been quite harsh and tense over the past few years. Richard doesn't take it seriously and asks Buckland if it's necessary to exaggerate the situation that much, as he thinks that it wasn't that much of an intrusion. Buckland says that everything depends on the reaction of the higher officials, and he asks her if she thinks that they can take action regarding such a matter. Annie wipes her face and says it's their place to intercept. She says that they can also reap some benefits if anything happens, and Richard agrees with her, saying that they will go to the city in a few days, and tells Annie to join them too. 6 days later, all of the loot has been captured, and the captives are standing in front of Richard before he leaves for Colin. Richard takes a look at the long queue of the captives in front of him and is surprised as he wasn't expecting to have so many captives. Hendra is also among the captives, and he doesn't seem too happy with Richard as he screams at him and tells him that he had used the holy prayer. Richard's guard tries to stop him, but he asks Richard if he's right, and Richard tells him that he looks quite manly with the beard as he hasn't shaven in the past 6 days. Hendra becomes even more frustrated and shouts at Richard, saying that only the holy prayer could have given him so much power without any elemental fluctuations, and Richard tells him that he's right. Richard tells Hendra that he won't get any reward for being right, and he asks him about his level, as he can't believe that he was not able to hurt him, even after using the fire counter-strike. Richard says that there is a problem, and tells him that he hasn't been able to enter the apocalypse. Hendra becomes shocked to hear Richard's words and starts wondering, how is that even possible? He says to himself that Richard has already reached the obsidian stage, and starts questioning his mental state, as he thinks that he is wrong for trying to capture Richard's territory. He asks Richard about the problem, and Richard tells him that the problem is that he hasn't even reached the starlight stage, and starts to laugh in his face while he loses his mind. Hendra is so shocked that his blood pressure shoots through the roof, and he loses consciousness and collapses on the ground after listening to Richard's words. After several days of travel, Richard arrives in Colin and starts feeling nostalgic as he once came to this city with an uncertain future. He reminds himself that it was all in the past, as now he's a lord of thousands of elite warriors and a strong fortress along with Centaurus troops, while his huge army is also following him into the city. He feels quite different to return to Colin, and he is left to wander around the streets of the city, as Annie is busy conducting business with a lot of people. Richard goes to a bar and orders an ale. He tastes it and tells the bar owner that the ale doesn't taste good without the ice, and he apologizes to him and says that the ice is too hard to get in such a season. Suddenly, 3 persons enter the bar with an arrogant attitude and order the server to bring them roasted pork, beef tongue, and buttered buns. They come to the counter and one of them gives the server 3 coins. The server says that 3 coins are not enough, but the person becomes angry and asks the server if he knows who is he even talking to. The people start making noise while Richard thinks of them to be a bunch of loud blurs. Suddenly, the person arguing with the server says that the person standing in front of him is the Lord of Goshan Fortress, and asks him if he wants them to owe him money. Richard becomes surprised to hear about the Lord of the Goshan Fortress, and spits his drink. One of them asks Richard if he's aware of his leader's reputation, and he replies positively with a smile. The server becomes scared, and asks the person in front of him if he's talking about the Scarlet Ripper, the most reverted lord of the wilderness, and he tells the server that they have just defeated an entire legion of the stewards with just 300 troops. Richard says to himself that Annie has a big mouth as she's already telling everyone about him in the city and spreading rumors about him. He asks the person pretending to be him if he's Richard, the Lord of Goshan Fortress, and he immediately replies positively. The fake Richard then pulls out a 3rd quality sword, slams it into the table, and says that it's his dragon sword, while Richard keeps watching with an expression of disgust on his face. Everyone gets shocked to see the strength of the fake Richard, while the real one stays unimpressed. He knows that the sword of the imposter is made up of lighter iron that is not even close to his weapon in terms of quality. The imposter is followed by a giant and a human. Richard asks them if they are Gunther and Heder, and they immediately reply positively with confidence. Richard decides to play along and asks the human if Heder isn't a centaur, and he becomes surprised to hear him. The human tells Richard not to believe in such things as they are lies, and that the rumors say that he's a centaur just because of his amazing horse riding and archery skills. Richard becomes a bit weird with the conversation, and says to himself that as long as anything can be exaggerated, it's mostly a lie. He thinks that everyone is going to believe the imposter is trying to be him, as they have been lying to the people with so many details. Richard says that he still thinks that Heder is a centaur, but a local step up to defend the imposters, as he tells Richard that by his logic, Richard and Gunther are also fake. He points at the fake sword of the imposter, and asks Richard if he can't see him swinging such a huge sword, and questions who he thinks is the real Richard. Richard says that it's him, but no one believes him, and the giant claiming to be Gunther pats him on his head and asks him where is he going. Richard tells him that he's going to the noble court, and asks him why is he inquiring about it, so the giant tells him that he's also headed to the noble court. He tells Richard that they will join their luxury caravan later, and says that they are headed to the noble court to deal with the bigwig. Otherwise he would be able to give her a ride. Richard becomes a bit angered as he doesn't want to ride with the imposters, and after a few moments the imposters leave the bar while Richard is waving them. Annie asks him about the people he's waving at, and he tells her that they are his acquaintances. Richard tells Annie to wait with the caravan for some time as he's going to the noble court to see Soren, and she tells him to rest assured. Richard leaves and goes to a building with a huge statue at its entrance, and a maid working there recognizes him. She asks him what is he doing at the noble court, and he asks her what she means to say. The maid tells Richard that Soren had left for the fortress to see him a few days ago, and he asks her when did Soren leave. The maid tells him that the governor left 4 days ago, and he becomes shocked to hear her, because he has missed Soren as he was already on his way to the city. Suddenly Soren arrives out of nowhere, puts his hand on Richard's shoulder, and tells him that he has been looking for him for a few days. Richard asks him what's wrong with him, and he asks him if he knows that he ran 6 warhorses to death, and even used wind magic just to get back from Goshan Fortress to see him. Richard becomes worried and asks Soren what's wrong, and why is he in such a hurry as he has taken only 4 days for a round trip, and Soren tells him that Pompel is going to wage war against the Stuarts. Richard asks Soren if Pompel is going to start a war against the Stuarts, and he tells him to follow him. Richard silently follows Soren and leads him to a separate room where he unties the curtain, takes him to a table and tells him to read the letter placed there. Richard opens the letter and tells Soren not to be so secretive, and as he reads the letter, he gets shaken to his core as the letter is from the administration of Pompel, and it announces the start of a war against the Stuarts as a Pompeian lord named Richard has faced great losses due to the attack from the other side. Richard becomes extremely surprised. He slams the letter on the table in front of him, as he can't believe that Pompel has waged a war against the Stuarts for such a small reason. Richard is flattered, as he never thought that the Goshan Fortress would be associated with such a big event one day. Richard says that His Majesty is so protective, and that he didn't suffer much despite being attacked by the enemy. Soren asks Richard if he thinks that the war against the Stuarts has been started because of him, and he asks him if he means to say that there are other reasons too. Soren tells Richard that the Stuarts declared war upon them first, and shows him another letter. Richard reads the letter, and becomes even more shocked to read it as it is from the stewards, and says that stewards are declaring a war against Pompel, as they think that a Pompeian lord has killed their soldiers without any reason while they were on a routine patrol. Richard says that it's a twisted fact. He tears the letter in half and says that the enemy sneaked up to the Goshan fortress, and that the stewards might not even know that Hendra is still alive. Soren tells Richard that no one can prove that Hendra is alive as long as the stewards don't admit it. He says that things can't be solved through negotiations, and that they can be solved with forces only. He inhales the beaver brain power, and Richard asks him what is he talking about. Soren says that the Stuarts and Pompel discovered a mine of magic crystals on the disputed border some while ago, and that it has never been identified whom the mine belongs to, even though it has a staggering reserve. Richard asks if both sides want to go to war against each other, just for the magic crystal mine, and Soren asks him if he's afraid of the storm approaching them. Richard smiles and refuses, and Soren tells him to stay at Colin for a few days, as there is someone who wants to see him. Richard asks why won't the person just see him now, as he doesn't want to wait, but Soren tells him that the person is too busy. Later, Richard asks Soren if the bigwig is the governor of the Northeast, but he tells him that it's His Majesty instead. Soren takes Richard to a place and they stand outside a room. He then knocks on the door, opens it and asks permission to enter. The person sitting inside the room is the ruler of Pompel. He asks Soren to enter the room and take a seat, and even apologizes to Richard for delaying the meeting for a few days. Richard gets embarrassed and says that he's fine, but the king asks him about his opinion about the two nations going on a war against each other, as he thinks that Richard is a nominal party. Richard becomes confused, and Soren tells him that the king means to say that Pompel needs a heroic figure to boost up the morale of the people during the war. Richard understands Soren's words and asks the king not to get him involved, as he thinks that the hero is cannon fodder. The king asks Richard if he has anyone in his mind, and he says that it could be the head of the noble court Soren. Richard tries to put all the matter on Soren's shoulders, but he tells him not to joke around. He tells Richard that he has to be the heroic figure as his name is on the official documents published by both the nations announcing the start of the war. The king tells Richard not to see it as a burden, and orders Soren to choose a 50-year-old bottle of wine from the bar, and pour a glass of it for everyone in the room. Soren gets up from his seat to obey the king's order, and the king tells Richard that he will be rewarded with the title of Knight of the Eagle by the Ministry of War. The king tells him that it's a rare title and an honor to have one, but Richard shows no interest in it. He tells the king that the Geishan fortress is so poor that even the thieves avoid it, and says that he is ready to reconsider if he's willing to share half of his supreme royal sorcerers. Soren comes back and laughs to hear Richard's words. He tells him that he has a big mouth, and the king says that it's understandable. He says that they will talk about it later, and tells Richard that he wants to talk to him about something else too. The king says that a tribe of scalers was supposed to join the army of Pompel, but they disappeared into the wilderness all of a sudden on their way. The king asks Richard if he's aware of the scalers' location as they happen to be lost somewhere near his fortress, according to his sources, and Richard's soul leaves his body out of surprise after hearing the king's words. Richard doesn't want to lose the scalers as he thinks that they are natural heavy cavalry, so he immediately gets up and tells the king that all of a sudden there is a fire of justice burning in his heart for some reason. He beats his chest out of excitement and tells the king that he is ready to become the Knight of the Eagle. Richard tells the king that he is ready to accept the title of Knight Eagle. The king asks him if he has changed his mind. Richard responds that he is simply performing his duty to serve his nation. The king then remarks that the title brings significant reputation and prestige. He also informs Richard that his army will be integrated into the Dragonclaw Legion, but will retain a great deal of autonomy. Richard recalls that the Dragonclaw Legion is deployed only in the most brutal battles, indicating that the upcoming conflict will be exceptionally challenging. The governor reassures Richard, adding that the king's son also serves in the Legion. Richard is pleased to hear this. The king confirms that his son Bedrick is with the Dragonclaw Legion, and Richard realizes that the prince's presence means the Legion will bear less responsibility in battle, but earn the most credit. The king advises Richard to rest, concluding that their discussion was productive. Richard agrees and leaves the room with the governor. As they walk, the governor questions the king's eyesight, suggesting that it might be weakening. He adds that despite this, the king possesses extraordinary combat skills that could enable him to conquer the world. Richard is impressed by the governor's praise, but finds it odd for an old man to compliment another so effusively. He asks the governor if he should visit the Dragonclaw Legion to make himself known to the people. The governor agrees, saying it is necessary. Later, the governor takes Richard to the headquarters of the Dragonclaw Legion. They meet a man who inquires how he can assist them. The governor introduces Richard, stating that he is from the Geishan fortress and has come on the king's orders. The man is shocked and asks them to follow him. Richard finds the man's behavior strange, and the governor agrees that he should not act so oddly. The man apologizes if he has offended them, and leads them to a door. He expresses doubt about Richard's identity, opening the door to reveal imposters of Richard, Gunther, and Hayter inside the room. Richard is astonished and demands to know how they dare disguise themselves as him. He threatens to kill them all while the governor stands confused. The fake Gunther asks for forgiveness, revealing his true identity as Bedrick, the prince. Both the governor and Richard are stunned. The governor immediately bows to the prince, recognizing him as the tall, dark man his father described. Richard confirms with the governor that Bedrick is indeed the prince, and receives a positive reply. The fake Hedder reveals himself as a senior swordsman at the Colin court, and the fake Richard as the royal sorcerer. Richard is surprised and reflects on how he never imagined these imposters would be from the royal court. Most kings have multiple sons, making the competition for the heir apparent easier. But the king of Pompel is unique in this respect, as Bedrick is the only prince. Richard sees this as a sign that the dynasty might be nearing its end. He asks the commander of the Dragonclaw Legion if he has ever met the prince and the other two men before. The commander replies that he has never seen the prince. Richard questions the commander why he has never met the prince, given that he serves in the Dragonclaw Legion. Bedrick admits that this is his first time actively participating. Although he has been serving nominally, he explains that young nobles nowadays have become lazy, often just putting their names in the legions without actually contributing. Richard tells Bedrick that he is also one of those lazy people and should be ashamed instead of criticizing others. Richard then asks Bedrick why he pretended to be him. Bedrick replies that it might be difficult for Richard to understand the heart of a dud. Bedrick tells Richard that it would be futile for him to understand the heart of a dud, leaving Richard confused. The governor, Soren, explains that a dud is a person without any elemental talent. He mentions that everything in this world has some elemental affinity, even the leaves and the stones. He adds that history is replete with great intellects, who despite being poorly endowed, relied on hard work, resources, and luck to turn the tables. Richard asks Bedrick if he is truly a dud, and Bedrick, with tears in his eyes, replies affirmatively. The sorcerer interjects, revealing that the prince has an exceptional elemental affinity that allows him to absorb elements on his own without meditating. However, this causes great harm to his body, as the elements build up within him, necessitating a constant effort to clear them out. He explains that elemental users are not typically repelled by their own elements, much like a wizard who would never worry about a fireball burning his hand. The sorcerer says that the prince was not like this in his infancy, but became so after falling severely ill at the age of 4. Bedrick tells Richard that it pains him to know that he can run through an army of thousands with sheer brute strength. Now understanding everything, Richard reassures the prince that he is always welcome at the Gaoshan fortress. Richard expresses his desire to meet the leader of the Dragonclaw Legion, but the commander informs him that the leader has been quite busy with the War Ministry for war meetings. Richard states that while he also enjoys meetings, he cannot wait for the leader, as he must return to Gaoshan fortress due to the impending war. As preparations for war intensify, Richard remains in frequent contact with Gaoshan fortress to stay updated. He receives a letter stating that the Light Church has sent letters to both countries, attempting to mediate and prevent the displacement of people. Annie asks Richard if the war might not happen, but he tells her that it's only a matter of time, doubting that mediation will not be able to stop such a significant conflict. Richard calls for Hendra to be brought up for interrogation. Initially, he intended to trade Hendra for ransom, but was surprised when the stewards claimed he was dead. Buckland informs Richard that both the Church of Light and the Church of the Goddess met with the king, but the Church of the Ice Goddess left the meeting in anger. Richard speculates that the Ice Goddess might not support Pompel, and wonders why the king offended such a powerful ally in times of war. Buckland suggests that Richard might not be fully informed, as some letters were withheld. Richard recalls that the Ice Goddess is so powerful she is equivalent to a whole country, and the king likely disregarded her to avoid having two powerful voices in the nation. Richard asks Annie and Buckland for their opinions on who will win the war. Annie believes that both countries have equal power, which is why there are so many problems. Buckland agrees, noting that similar sentiments were expressed 30 years ago, but she mentions that the current king has never tried to appear as if he were working very hard. She praises King Sagras for Pompel's flourishing during his reign, despite her usual reluctance to compliment anyone. Buckland describes King Baroni of the Stuarts as a jester king, who loves a luxurious lifestyle. She notes that the power gap between the two countries has changed significantly, and expresses uncertainty about Pompel's chances in the war. She warns that things could take a sinister turn if a third country joins the conflict. Richard asks if San Jose in the south wants war, and Buckland explains that the third party usually profits the most. Richard acknowledges the complexity of the situation, and notices two guards bringing Hendra in. Richard addresses Hendra, referring to him as the commander of Brown Bear Roar, and Hendra asks Richard what he wants from him, while calling himself useless. Richard asserts that it is up to him to decide Hendra's worth, and demands that Hendra say something interesting, warning that otherwise, his sword will be difficult to control. Richard breaks Hendra's chains with an axe and instructs him to read the letter he has just received before speaking further. Hendra reads the letter and is shocked to learn of the impending war and the news that his country has declared him dead. Feeling betrayed, Hendra becomes despondent. Richard, seizing the moment, tells him to reveal something of interest. He warns Hendra that his life is hanging by a thread. Hendra, realizing the gravity of his situation, mentions knowing about a talisman. Richard is skeptical. He warns him not to trick him. Hendra insists that it is an alchemical artifact from the times of the ancient Titans. Richard is taken aback as Hendra recounts traveling with his father 10 years ago to the coming-of-age party for the eldest daughter of Lord Magellan. Magellan, a renowned traveler, had amassed a vast collection of treasures. During the party, Magellan displayed a pair of ivory bracelets from his treasure chest, claiming they were merely ritual objects. However, Hendra suspected otherwise. Hendra explains that these were not bracelets, but rings used by the Titans. Richard, Annie, and Buckland are all astonished. Hendra reveals that it is the Ring of Thunder, used by the Titans. He elaborates that the Titans, who once ruled the world, crafted rings from the bones of rebels. These 4 rings, Thunder, Inferno, earth, and ocean were held by the Titans themselves. Buckland tells Richard that obtaining all 4 rings would grant him heaven's magic, a prospect that excites him. Richard asks if Hendra possesses any of the rings, but Hendra denies it, saying that Magellan is too formidable for him to confront. He adds that Magellan is unaware of the ring's true power. Richard questions if Magellan is foolish, to which Hendra responds that the Ring of Thunder is undetectable due to its subtle nature. He explains that only an orthodox Titan can wield it. Richard smiles and states to himself that he has a Titan. Out of curiosity, Richard asks why no one else has discovered the rings. Hendra claims to be a divine favorite, which puzzles Richard. Buckland explains that a divine favorite is someone favored by the gods, and blessed with special abilities. Richard inquires about Hendra's special skill, noting he didn't notice anything remarkable during their fight. Hendra reveals that he cannot see from his right eye. Richard asks if he is blind, but Hendra clarifies that his right eye can sense the glow of colors. He sensed a golden glow from the ring, which convinced him of its value. Richard becomes impressed and asks if Hendra can identify any treasures at Gaoshan Fortress. Hendra mentions that Richard's pet seems quite special. When Richard inquires further, Hendra replies that he hasn't sensed anything else, leaving Richard disappointed yet intrigued. Richard asks if Hendra has shared his talent with anyone, and Hendra says no, explaining that the divine favorite's lifespan shortens once their talent is revealed. Annie suggests that Hendra could be used for anatomical study or alchemy experiments. Richard mocks the idea, saying that monster organs are more useful and that Hendra's eye could be valuable too. He then reassures Hendra that there are no alchemists at Gaoshan Fortress. Richard tells Hendra that he cannot return to the stewards and offers him a chance to join his side. Hendra asks what would happen if he refused. Richard responds that he would lock him in the water dungeon and leave him to die. Hendra sets 2 conditions. First, that his eye not be plucked out for use, and second, that he not be treated as a slave but as a citizen. Richard agrees to both conditions, saying that he has always been kind to his people, and Hendra bows his head in front of Richard, pledging his loyalty to Richard until death. Richard, finding Hendra's gesture excessive, advises him to change his name since Hendra is officially dead to the enemy. Hendra decides to be called Dracula, severing all ties with the stewards. Richard tells Hendra that he is impressively loyal, having been recognized by the system, unlike Motor, who swore to serve Richard until the end but hasn't been recognized yet. Richard worries about her because he knows Motor won't be able to benefit from the system's upgrade options. As the season finally turns cold, Richard receives the long-awaited assistance of the army. He goes to inspect the troops and notices a wooden box. Questioning why a coffin has been brought for him, he speculates that the king must want him to fight with the will to die. The person next to him informs him that it's a teleportation device, not a coffin. Richard is shocked. The box, adorned with magical gems, produces enough magic every half a month to teleport someone to specific locations. Richard asks the purpose of teleporting a single person during the war, and the person tells him to be thankful, adding that Richard wouldn't have received the device if it weren't for the prince. He also conveys the king's order to fight the enemy and leave a mark. Richard imagines Bedrick telling the king that their lives are more important than the country, and advising Richard to value his life and flee if they cannot defeat the enemy. In November, the church's mediation fails miserably, and war breaks out. Richard's army departs for Colin to join the rest of the legion. He names his legion the Ripper, and expresses disdain for his own flag. The war intensifies as the barren land outside the city is occupied by legions. Heder jokes that the weather is better suited for a barbecue than a war, and Gunther agrees, noting she has never experienced such cold winters. Meanwhile, Richard spots a massive beast, larger than his Stegosaurus. Suddenly, Motor sports a figure and alerts Richard, but Bedrick intervenes, identifying the person as a cleric of the Ice Goddess Church. Richard is stunned to see the prince and asks if he scared him. Richard mentions the king's disregard for the goddess's church and asks why the cleric is present. Bedrick explains that each legion previously received 20 relics annually, now reduced to 10. The prince informs Richard that he will accompany him to the pre-war meeting and instructs him to bring his flag. Richard tells Heder to take the troops for lunch. Grabbing his flag, Richard endures the prince's mockery, who suggests the flag looks like it came from the garbage. Richard defends it, saying he and his troops made it. Bedrick advises Richard to change the flag, as all flags will march after the meeting for honor. Richard retorts that he should have been informed earlier. The meeting begins with the commander of the Dragon Legion joining. Bedrick introduces the commander, Suffolk, from the Western family, the Zinnias. Suffolk is regarded as intelligent, but struggles to communicate the overall situation. The prince reveals that Suffolk took the commander post after the previous supervisor stepped down due to illness. Richard asks why Suffolk is the commander this time. Suddenly, Suffolk greets Bedrick and Richard. Bedrick tells Suffolk he can address him as Rick in the barracks, but Suffolk insists he is a prince everywhere in the kingdom. Suffolk asks for opinions on the war, and everyone remains silent. He assures them they can speak freely, adding that with his 20 years of experience, he believes the Stuarts cannot fight against Pompel. Suffolk declares that the Stuarts have chosen the wrong opponent, and that Baruni will soon be known as the Mad King. Richard asks Bedrick's opinion, who says he can't comment as his father never acts without certainty. Suffolk announces they have 150,000 troops and mentions that all 4 Dragon Knights and the Ultimate troops will join them. He updates that the Dragon Claw will launch the first attack in the northwest when winter falls, aiming to make the enemies pay for their recklessness. The captains cheer each other. Richard recalls that, according to Dracula, Magellan also Winterfell, northern region. Later, Richard returns to his tent, and Gunther asks if the meeting has ended. He confirms and asks for Abu, the lizard leader. Gunther tells him Abu is outside, refusing to come in, watching the flag parade. Abudur asks what their flag looks like, and Richard admits it looks like trash. She puts on her shawl, wanting to see it, but Richard blocks her way, suggesting they wrestle if she's so free. Hedda finally declines and chose to stay inside. Suddenly, someone bursts into the tent, informing Richard that Abu is fighting with Dragonclaw soldiers, surrounded by 3 opponents. Abu declares he won't let them go. During the parade, 2 lizards praise the flag of Gaoshen Fortress, drawing laughter from the soldiers of the Dragonclaw, who mock it as looking like a chicken claw. They ridicule Richard, calling him just a kid who has earned the title of Night Eagle. Abu becomes angered by their words. He confronts the soldiers, demanding how they dare insult his lord, and strikes one in the face, causing him to collapse. The other soldiers threaten to make Abu pay, but he calls on his lizard troops to take down all the opponents. Meanwhile, Richard arrives with Gunther, demanding to know who is bullying his men. Gunther instructs Hedda to finish off the opponents, and leaps up, striking one of the soldiers in the face with her knee. The prince urges Richard to stop the fight, but is shocked to see him threatening to kill the opponents. The brawl intensifies, and the soldiers of the Dragonclaw realize they are no match for Richard's forces. One of the soldiers threatens to draw weapons against the Gaoshen troops, but Bedrick warns him not to even think about it. Richard grabs 2 soldiers by their necks, just as Suffolk arrives, ordering everyone to drop their weapons. He chastises both parties for embarrassing the kingdom with their foolishness. Surprised to see most of the knockdown troops belong to the Dragonclaw, Gunther inquiries about Abu's whereabouts, and Suffolk's assistant warns something fast is approaching. Suddenly, Abu arrives with some Stegosaurus, challenging the enemies to fight him. The sight of lizards controlling the Stegosaurus astonishes everyone. Suffolk instructs Richard to control his men, and Richard assures him, stepping in front of the Stegosaurus and ordering Abu to stop immediately. Abu complies, and Richard's eyes glow red as the soldiers praise him for his strength in stopping the Stegosaurus. Abu explains who started the fight, but Richard reprimands him for bringing the Stegosaurus into the fray. Suffolk is surprised by the number of Stegosaurus. He tells Richard and the Dragonclaw officer they will face consequences for the brawl. The officer of the Dragonclaw arrives, blaming Suffolk for failing to control his men, and attributing the soldiers' overexcitement to the upcoming war against the Stuarts. He asks Richard if he agrees, and Richard defends his army, saying it is natural for them to fight back if attacked. However, Richard admits his mistake, but the officer insists it is his own fault. The officer downplays the incident as a slight misunderstanding, and Richard agrees, stating nothing serious has happened and both parties were just cooling off. Suffolk, listening silently, finally intervenes, accusing them of escaping responsibility. He orders them to work together on the battlefield, stating he can't overlook what has happened. He announces that, according to military discipline, he decides to incorporate all of Richard's and Captain Bo's troops into the frontline vanguard of the army, leaving Richard and Bose shocked by this unexpected decision. The army assembles and marches away from the city. Boffs tells everyone not to be sad, reminding them that while they are at the front line, the enemy doesn't always attack head-on. Richard asks Bedrick why he is also punished, and Bedrick replies that he volunteered to join them. Boffs comments that since the prince was involved in the brawl, it's only natural for him to be punished as well. He looks at the ice cleric and asks if he believes the heavy snowfall is a miraculous manifestation of the ice goddess. The ice cleric dismisses this, explaining it as a natural phenomenon and should not be attributed to the goddess. Richard, observing him, realizes why the cleric is the only one sent to the front line, as he thinks that the low emotional intelligence of the cleric makes him naturally ostracized. Meanwhile, at the Pompel Expeditionary Force Command Center, a person asks their servant to pour him a drink. The servant advises against drinking too much, but the person insists, making it difficult for the servant. Suddenly, the king enters and tells Leora the person that he needs to get some sunlight. Leora argues that the sun doesn't affect his efficiency, but the king insists it's good for his body. Leora is a goblin. He doesn't want anyone to know he's leading the human expedition because he is disabled. King Sagras tells him that people won't care much about him being the leader, and takes him outside under a protective layer to keep the temperature warm for Leora. Leora thanks the king, who reminisces about their meeting on a cold, barren day. Sagras recalls rescuing Leora from being devoured by a monster during a time of food scarcity. Discovering Leora's intelligence, Sagras, upon becoming king, utilized Leora's genius for the country. Though everyone credits Sagras for the country's success, it is actually Leora's intelligence behind it all. Sagras thanks Leora for his efforts, and Leora responds that it is natural for him to help, since the king saved his life. Sagras then asks Leora about the Church of the Goddess, and Leora tells him to be patient. Leora inquires if the army has been dispatched, and the king confirms, mentioning that Richard is temporarily assigned to the vanguard. Leora approves, saying it's a good test of Richard's strength. He mentions that in analyzing Gaoshen Fortress, he found every step they took forward was as far as they could go, attributing this to Richard's exceptional abilities. On the march, Bast yawns and tells Richard he seems energetic and focused. Richard replies that he is practicing the holy prayer, which helps him stay focused. Bedrick tells Richard he has only reached the sunlight, to which Richard immediately tells him to shut up. Suddenly, a soldier informs Bars they have found a small town ahead, filled with Stuart soldiers in defensive positions. Bast speculates it might be a legion of 3,000 to 5,000 men, and wonders if the town is a military hub. Bedrick identifies the town as Kakashi, known for its pumpkin farming. Bast asks for more updates, and the soldier reports that the town's walls are less than 3 meters high, very thin, and not even guarded. Bast becomes doubtful, and Richard suggests the town might not be as simple as it seems. Both of them look at the open castle door, wondering if it is a decoy set up by the enemy to lure them in. Richard surveys the city and remarks that Kakashi is just a farming town. He notes that the guarding troops have spotted them and are mobilizing. Bowes says he just saw a red and golden griffin flag, and Bedrick adds that the stewards have 3 legions, meaning there must be more soldiers in the city. Richard mentions that he knows someone from the stewards' legion, and calls for Hendrik to take a look. Hendrik confirms it's the Griffin Ambition Legion, and assures Richard that they are stronger, as it is just an ordinary legion. Richard gives the order to prepare an attack, instructing the archers to cover the infantry, and the infantry to raise their shields. Baron, the leader of the Griffin Ambition Legion, is at the residence of Kakashi's mayor. He complains that several days have passed since the war was declared, yet higher authorities remain in complete disarray. Baron is furious because Baroni asked him to transfer his legion from the capital 15 days ago, only for the king to now demand his return. Feeling played, Baron has had to stay in Kakashi with his soldiers due to the Pompel army blocking his way. As he eats, his anger grows and he curses the king. Baroni, disinterested in politics, left decisions to the ministers, initially pleasing the people. However, his sudden political involvement has revealed his incompetence. Despite Pompel's superiority, Baroni recklessly declared war. Baroni is shocked when informed that Pompel's soldiers are advancing. Meanwhile, Richard's soldiers rain down 3 feathered arrows on Baron's troops, who lower their bodies and shields to protect themselves. One of Baron's soldiers warns that the city's wall could be taken down in one hit by Pompel's Stegosaurus. Standing on high ground, Richard declares that no one should escape, wanting to showcase the strength of Gaussian fortress's military. Bauschet advises that the enemy must defend rather than flee, as their cavalry is much larger. He suggests discussing the next attack, and Richard proposes letting the Stegosaurus crash through the city's walls. Baftet, thinking Richard inexperienced, offers to make the plan, while Bedrick wants his tiger men to join Baftet's forces due to their suitability for the conditions. Aware that Baftet wants the credit, Richard agrees with him, and Baftet orders his soldiers to attack the city. Richard instructs Motor to create an opening in the city's wall with her fireball magic. She forms a massive fireball and launches it, causing a small impact. Richard tells Motor to try again, but the ice cleric steps forward to assist. Using his powers, he launches an attack that collapses the wall in one hit. Baron's nephew, Fondon, asks what they should do, and Baron orders the infantry to take battle formation, anticipating an attack through the opening. Fondon questions the lack of defense, but Baron becomes frustrated and shouts at him for wasting time. A soldier remarks that Fondon lacks war experience, and Baron assures him he will gain it over time. When the soldier suggests going out, Baron insists it's not the right time, withholding his most mysterious weapon for now. In Stewards, there is a black crystal with incredible properties used to create magical equipment, called the Stone of Destiny. The method is simple but brutal, according to which the heart of a living person is replaced with a magic stone. Survivors can manipulate their own blood, and the strength granted by the stone is completely random. Due to black crystal scarcity, the Stewart solution is straightforward, which is that they prepare several humans for the magic stone. If an individual is too weak, they are killed, and their stone is given to someone else. Qualified recipients become the elite soldiers known as Blood Knights. There are 50 Blood Knights in Kakashi forming Baron's secret defense, which gives him confidence that he will soon wipe out the Pompel army attacking his city. Baron is confident of his imminent victory, but his hopes are shattered when a massive soldier from Pompel's side appears and begins crushing his troops effortlessly. Shocked, Baron watches as his Blood Knight identifies the giant as an orc, preparing for battle. Baron, initially believing his other soldiers can handle the orcs, orders his archers to take defensive positions. Suddenly, ice crystals rain down from nowhere, stabbing and killing his soldiers and archers. Baron becomes bewildered and realizes the ice relic is launching these deadly crystals at his troops. He then orders his Blood Knight, Cervantes, to join the fight. Cervantes reassures him, promising to make the enemy pay dearly. Meanwhile, Richard watches the orcs tossing the enemies into the air, praising their strength. Bedrick, eager to see the battle, asks for the telescope. Richard hands it over, asking if he can borrow the orc soldiers later. Bedrick is shocked by the battle's intensity. He tells Richard they are at a disadvantage. Richard, alarmed, sees a Blood Knight wielding a curved blade, slaughtering his troops. He realizes they are losing, and orders Abu to lead the army and escort his soldiers to retreat safely. After Pompel's troops retreat, Bast, frustrated by the encounter with the Blood Knights, throws his helmet away in anger. Richard offers him a drink and asks what's going on. Bast's soldiers, embarrassed, remain silent. Bost explains that the enemy has a team of powerful knights using unfamiliar magic. A tiger orc mentions the enemy's red telescopic weapon that can fly around. Richard, puzzled, says he has never heard of such a thing, but Hendra identifies them as Blood Knights. Bedrick confirms he has also heard of them, and Richard wonders how there can be more than one brigade of Blood Knights in such a small town. Richard asks Hendra about the strength of the Blood Knights, and Hendra admits they are much stronger than their forces. Bost suggests waiting for the main army, believing the enemy won't dare leave the city. Richard, however, insists there is no need. He commands his personal troops of Gaussian Fortress to prepare for battle. Bost warns Richard not to gamble against the Blood Knights, fearing their strength. Just then, 2 barbarian troops bring Richard his new armor, lighter and faster than before. Richard is confident. He tells Bost that just because he failed to defeat the enemy doesn't mean no one can pay. Bost remains skeptical, doubting Richard's cavalry of Stegosaurus. Richard dons his new armor, telling Bost to watch, thinking that Stegosaurus are not his only force. His barbarian and centaur troops are his greatest strength. Gaussian Fortress troops prepare for battle, but Richard instructs them not to raise the flag, feeling ashamed of its design. Reluctantly, Bost prepares to join Richard's attack. The ice relic, drained from the earlier attack, admits his powers have left him exhausted. Meanwhile, the orcs seek the prince's permission to rejoin the battlefield. The prince, unwilling to demoralize them, grants it. Gunther tells the newcomers to step back, claiming there is no room for them, and Hader agrees, stating they will lead the attack this time. With his army assembled, Richard orders a full-force attack. Gaussian Fortress troops march forward, determined to take down the city without failing this time. Baron sees the enemy approaching once again, and realizes that Pompel, Stegosaurus, and Centaur units have joined the battle. Fong asks for permission to join the fight, and Baron agrees, instructing him to stay with the reserve knights and be cautious. He orders his soldiers to release a volley of arrows. But Pompel's archers shoot down the soldiers standing in front of him with uncanny accuracy. Baron is astonished. He commands his troops to raise their shields and support each other. Hader informs Richard that the enemy is raising their shields, and Richard instructs the Centaur troops to continue shooting. One by one, the Centaurs eliminate Baron's soldiers. Baron wonders if Richard's cavalry is stronger than the orcs, seeing how many of his soldiers have already fallen. Richard reaches the wall with his troops, draws his sword and leaps high into the air to launch an attack. Baron is amazed by Richard's prowess, as has never seen such a strong swordsman. Cervantes asks for permission to enter the battle, and Baron tells him to ensure victory, knowing that using the Blood Knight is his last option despite the risks. As Richard slays enemies, he notices the legendary Blood Knight approaching, and activates his light power, determined not to humiliate himself. Cervantes tells Richard to die, but Richard smiles and praises him for getting straight to the point. They clash, and Cervantes wonders how Richard wields such a heavy sword with ease. Richard warns him not to get distracted on the battlefield and attacks his blind spot. Though Cervantes blocks the attack, his sword snaps in half and he starts bleeding from his mouth. Richard tells him he's tough for surviving such a strong blow and proceeds to cut him in half with his legendary weapon. Meanwhile, Gunther fights the enemies, while Han keeps an eye on 2 other Blood Knights. Noticing them watching from a distance, Han approaches and tries to attack, but they dodge and laugh. The Blood Knights then step back and launch ranged weapons at Richard, catching him off guard and causing confusion. Richard manages to dodge the Blood Knights' attack, but he sustains a facial injury, surprised by their strength. Suddenly, the Knights attempt to attack him from behind together, but Richard evades their strikes. He kicks one in the belly, sending him flying, and knocks the other away. He taunts them, questioning how they can hope to defeat him without weapons. Richard's rage is evident, fueled by the intensity of the battle. Gunther remarks on the difficulty of defeating the Blood Knights, acknowledging the effort required. Meanwhile, Bost proves himself formidable against the Knights as well, taking one down with the help of an orc. Richard observes that the Blood Knight's blood manipulation is remarkably strong, capable of forming shields and being controlled remotely. He reflects that if they weren't so powerful, he wouldn't have needed to join the battle personally. On the other side, Baron continues to fight fiercely, taking down some of the barbarian troops. Despite the enemy's strength, he remains determined to win. Surveying the battlefield, Baron discovers that Cervantes has been killed. His nephew Fan also falls quickly when surrounded by Pompel soldiers. Baron mourns the loss of both Cervantes and Fan. Richard continues to fight, taking down enemies and ordering Gunther to retreat part of their army to clear the way for the Stegosaurus unit. Baron witnesses his men fleeing in fear as the Stegosaurus approaches the walls, realizing defeat is imminent. Desperately attempting to stop them, Baron fails and the Stegosaurus breaches the city walls. The Blood Knights, shocked by the breach, blame Richard for Cervantes' death and move to confront him. Even knowing they are likely to lose, Richard faces them calmly, respecting their courage, but determined to end the battle. Using his light powers, he strikes them down with a single powerful blow, shattering their armor and weapons. Meanwhile, accepting his defeat, Baron pulls out a dagger and seeks forgiveness from his father for failing to defeat Richard, whom he describes as a monstrous swordsman. He then takes his own life, begging for forgiveness until his death. Later, Pompel soldiers celebrate their victory. Bedrick compliments Boust for his role in the battles, but Boust credits Richard for their success. Curious about Richard's decisive move, Gunther asks him about it, and Richard modestly mentions using many tactics during the battle. He humorously asks Gunther for roasted pig or ham, explaining his hunger after using his light powers extensively. Bedrick is surprised by Richard's nonchalant demeanor after such a battle. Gunther agrees they should find Heder to arrange a fulfilling meal, and Richard agrees with her, saying that he's starving because he has used the light powers during the battle. Bedrick announces that Baron has committed suicide, and Baust adds that Baron must have done so out of fear of being imprisoned for losing the battle. Meanwhile, Richard is looking through his system's window and is noticed by Bedrick, who asks Gunther if something is wrong with him since he's poking the air. Gunther replies that it's an old habit of Richard's and that they will get used to it. Richard goes through the system and finds that he has lost 26 barbarian troops and 4 centaur troops. He mutters to himself that he didn't expect the city to have so many blood knights, which caused him so many casualties. Richard wonders if he has become a little cocky. As he walks through the corpses of his fallen soldiers, he solemnly promises them that they have always been with him. Later, the final rituals for the soldiers are performed, and the ice cleric prays that the ice goddess will bless their souls. Gunther tells Richard not to blame himself for the deaths of the soldiers, as it is a part of life. Hygre also says that it's an honor for soldiers to die in battle. Richard thanks them for their kind words, and notices that he has received an update after the battle, which has upgraded his troops to Berserkers and Centaur Vanguard elite troops. He realizes that there are 4 elite Centaur troops, while only 1 Berserker troop, which makes him understand that the Highland Barbarians require more experience compared to Centaur troops. Richard reflects that the Lizards have just joined recently, which is why they have not been upgraded to the top soldiers. Suddenly, a barbarian named Rancho says she feels strange. Richard asks her to explain, and she screams that she feels like she's going to explode, with an immense surge of power running through her body. Everyone is shocked by her behavior, and Richard asks if she's alright. Rocio replies that she feels like she's not angry enough, and Richard offers to help. Ratio gets on the ground and Richard starts kicking her, asking if it's enough. After a few kicks, Ratio says it's enough, and adds that she feels like she's breaking through to a whole new realm. Richard asks how she feels, and she says she wants to hit someone because she has a fire burning in her heart. Bedrick looks at her and asks if she is a berserker, and Richard starts wondering if this is related to his system. The ice cleric asks Richard if he hasn't heard about berserkers, and Richard asks if he's talking about the ancient berserkers. The cleric confirms, explaining that there was a time when Titans ruled the world and humans were the weakest race. In those times, a race called the Vitro Berserkers emerged and gained supremacy and glory across the continent. Richard asks if Ratio is a berserker, but the cleric says that many ancient races disappeared without a trace. He adds that it's rumored barbarians inherited the blood of the berserkers, though he is not sure. The cleric tells Richard that Ratio seems to have activated her berserker blood, and she becomes happy to hear that. He also explains that the secret art of berserking has been passed down through generations, and after some improvements is now known as the Holy Prayers, which have more effects as well as side effects. Richard becomes shocked and asks Rocio to breathe to deactivate her berserk mode, and she obeys. Suddenly, Rocio falls to the ground, and Richard asks if she's alright. Rocio says she's exhausted, and the cleric tells her to rest as she's not used to the berserk mode. Richard instructs one of his soldiers to collect the loot and record the casualties, and the soldier immediately gets to work. Realizing that he is also upgraded, Richard decides to enhance his strength, agility, and the Holy Prayer. Feeling great after the upgrade in his skills, he asks Baust about the progress regarding the loot. Baust replies positively. Richard then asks for the commander-in-chief, and Baust tells him they haven't found him yet. Richard smiles and says he wants to stage a robbery, and Bon is shocked to hear his words. Bonis asks if the commander's home is inside the city, and Hendra says he can lead the way as he's familiar with the place. Richard allows him to do so. As they walk through the streets, they notice civilians staring at them, and Richard is shocked to see them. Bedrick tells him it's normal for people to stay indoors during wartime. After a few steps, Hendra tells Richard they have reached their destination. Richard asks if he's sure it's the office, and Hendra replies affirmatively. Richard enters, saying he expected to see some treasure, not a shabby place. Suddenly, he's stunned to see the room filled with gold and crockery, and many valuable items. Balst comments that the commander has a good collection of wine, likely his personal possessions. While Bedrick announces he has found some documents, Richard steps forward to take a look, and is shocked to see that the commander of the stewards is so disorganized. Brost asks what it is, and Richard informs him that the Griffin Ambition has been undergoing conflicting transfers, putting them in a terrible situation. They also discover that the routes decided by the court and the Council of Ministers for the transfer of the Griffin Ambition are completely different. Richard says they should send a letter asking if they are supposed to halt temporarily or move forward, and Bao suggests that the Mad King of the Stewards would definitely interfere with commands at will. Richard agrees and says they should celebrate by slaughtering the cows and sheep he saw on the road. At night, everyone is celebrating together, but Gunther is sitting beside the enemy's corpses with a dagger in her hand and a smile on her face. Richard approaches and asks what's wrong and what she is doing. Gunther tells him to be silent, as she is secretly plucking out the magical stones from the dead bodies of the Blood Knights. Richard asks her what makes her think she can do that, and she screams, saying she deserves a trophy, as the Gaussian fortress troops led the attack and she had given up the loot just for the magical stones. Richard shakes his head and mutters to himself that there is no way the Stuarts wouldn't have thought about such a matter, since he knows there is a small explosive unit in the body of the Blood Knights that destroys the magic stone upon their deaths. He asks Gunther her opinion about a person who doesn't eat fruit from a tree that bears a lot of fruit by the roadside. Gunther smiles and says the man must be stupid. But Richard yells at her, saying it's because the fruit could be sour or bitter. Suddenly, Hendra tells Richard about a dead body glowing, noting that the magic stone inside must not have been destroyed. Richard steps forward, takes the stone in his hand and says it's so powerful, it can help someone manipulate blood. He mentions that the magic stone is so evil, it has the potential to destroy the whole world. Hendra asks Richard if he's going to keep the stone, and Richard says he won't let go of a treasure, and orders Hendra to burn all the bodies of the enemy without leaving any trace. Hendra agrees with Richard's orders. Later, Richard is entering the city with Gunther on a cart, and Bost asks where he has been. Richard says he went to bury the bodies to prevent a plague, but Bost questions how it's possible for a plague to spread during winter. Richard shouts that there's nothing wrong with burying the bodies a bit earlier and walks away, leaving Bost wondering if Richard is even fine. A soldier remarks that Richard is so kind for not leaving the bodies in the wilderness and taking the effort to bury them. The next day, Bedrick informs Richard that they have been ordered by the Legion to stay and wait for them so they can attack Winterfell together. Richard remembers the nobleman of Winterfell possessing the Thunder Ring. Richard says it won't be as easy to attack Winterfell as it was Kakashi, but Bedrick argues that the attack on Kakashi proved the laziness of the Stuarts. Richard adds that Winterfell is one of the most important cities for the Stuarts. He believes this war is too easy, as they are conquering one town after another. Bedrick notes that only the important cities are left, where the Stuart troops are hiding. However, Richard, being a clever strategist, suspects the Stuarts must be planning something. 3 days after the successful attack on Kakashi, the main army arrives and everyone is staring at Richard. Richard is puzzled. He asks why they are looking at him. The prince explains that the newcomers are staring out of jealousy because Richard has secured the first victory, captured the Legion's flag, and held the prestigious title of Eagle Knight. Richard begins praising himself, but Bedrick warns him not to be cocky, cautioning that such behavior will lead to ostracization within the Legion. The prince adds that famous people are often hated by others, to which Richard responds that it depends on the person. Suffolk arrives, accompanied by a girl, and expresses his surprise at such a clean victory from the start. Richard greets both of them, but the girl angrily calls him a hothead, revealing her bad temper. Bedrick informs Richard that the girl he's referring to is actually a man named Egwene, who hates being identified as a man. Bedrick adds that he used to bathe with Egwene, shocking Richard to his core. Suffolk asks Richard if he knows why the beast called Titanosaurus would willingly become a Dragon Riders champion. Richard wonders why Suffolk is asking such an irrelevant question. Suffolk explains that Titanosaurs have long lifespans and intelligence comparable to humans, and they enjoy spending their lives with a partner. Bedrick adds that they can be impressed by songs or even physical appearance. Richard is utterly shocked. He asks if Egwene is a dragon knight, and Suffolk affirms this. He elaborates that one of the Titanosaurs chose to spend its life with Egwene to appreciate his beauty constantly. Suffolk remarks that humans and Titanosaurs are not so different, and mentions that after learning how Richard turned the tables on the battlefield following his partner's defeat, Egwene was so impressed that he came to meet him on foot rather than by dragon. Suddenly, a strong wind blows, and they look up to see a massive red dragon in the sky. Suffolk identifies it as Osiris, Egwene's dragon, and notes that it's the first time the dragon will fight for Pomple. He also mentions their allocation of 10 falcon riders with incredible speed. Richard, feeling envious, jokes that he would be able to take a dump on everyone's head if he could fly. Meanwhile, at Winterfell, the lord of the city asks his men for updates on the Pompel army, but receives negative replies. The lord expresses his confusion over Pompel's seemingly lazy reaction, given that they started the war. He notes that they initially received many reinforcements and logistic support, but these reinforcements have gradually left. He emphasizes that they are facing a great war for their nation's fate, and are only receiving perfunctory support. One advisor suggests strategizing to win the war with the strength of just one province, but Bernard points out that they have only 40,000 soldiers. While Pompel's army boasts around 200,000, the Lord advises Bernard to keep his anger in check, as it often leads to stupidity, and Bernard agrees. The Lord then turns and tells Bernard they should do their part, and leave the rest to the God of Holy Light. Later, the Falcon Riders fly over Winterfell City. Hedda marvels at the thickness of the city's walls. Richard, looking through a telescope, assures her that breaching the walls won't be a problem. Bedrick quotes the Book of War, stating that a city can be attacked with more than 10 times the number of the defending army. Suddenly, Richard spots a woman standing on the city's walls. He is struck by her beauty and wonders if she is a priestess while he praises her beauty. Bedrick asks what he sees, and Richard, hiding his fascination, replies that he only sees normal patrols and guards. The Falcon Riders report no abnormal movements in the city, and no signs of heavy weaponry or counterattack machinery. Bedrick instructs them to finish their patrol and return to base immediately. Heder asks Richard if they will easily defeat the enemy, but he cautions that it won't be that simple. He explains that there were never just two superpowers on the continent. Besides the Stuarts and Pompel, there is another powerful entity known as San Jose, and Richard believes that someone as powerful as San Jose will not stand by and watch as the Stuarts or Pompel are outplayed. 10 days have passed since the engineers began forging the weapons, casting a hushed spell over the city of Winterfell. Tension grips both sides as one eagerly awaits the completion of their armaments, while the other remains entrenched, desperate to avoid conflict at any cost. Finally, Pompel's engineers complete their task, shattering the tranquility with the eruption of war, commanding his soldiers to hold the line. Boast queries Gunther about the visibility of their movements to the enemy. Richard dismisses the concern, noting the impossibility of maneuvering such a vast army without drawing attention. He speculates that the enemy across the field must share their resolve to fight to the last. A soldier informs Bedrick that the stone throwers are ready for action. Bedrick counts to 3, 2, 1, now. The soldiers release the catapults, launching massive stones toward the city walls. Simultaneously, wizards from Pompel unleash fireballs at their adversaries. On the defense, Winterfell's wizards counteract, intercepting the stones and fireballs mid-air. Richard is taken aback by the wizards' formidable defense. Meanwhile, Bolst learns that their projectiles were intercepted before reaching the city walls. Unfazed, Bolst explains that the rubble from the shattered stones will rain down on the defenders. Muttering to himself, Richard reflects on the grim reality that human ingenuity is often best employed in the business of killing. Bolst rallies his soldiers to charge forward, each warrior determined to prove their mettle at the castle walls. Elsewhere, the Lord of Winterfell addresses his people, acknowledging the enemy's aerial advantage. He reveals a clever ruse, disguising heavy weapons as civilian structures to mislead enemy scouts. Bernard credits Lord Sitto's foresight in ordering military buildings covered, ensuring their true purpose remains concealed. Meanwhile, Pompel soldiers scale Winterfell's walls, shocked to find heavy weapons manned by the defenders, contradicting their intelligence from Falcon scouts, questioning the Lord's strategy. Someone challenges why he assigned weaker troops to guard the walls. The Lord defends his decision, explaining they face a nation while they are but a province, needing to outweigh the enemy's numerical superiority. As Winterfell's guards falter against Pompel's onslaught, the Lord acknowledges the need to employ the weaker troops as bait, buying crucial time to strategize. Observing his soldiers standing silent upon the wall, Faust puzzles over their hesitation to attack. Meanwhile, the Lord declares the war officially begun, signaling his generals to join the fray. He resolves that it is time for Winterfell to mount a counterattack. One of Pompel's soldiers tumbles from the castle walls. His commander rushes to his side, demanding to know what happened. Battered and breathless, the soldier reveals that the enemy wields formidable heavy weapons. The commander is stunned because the Falcon Riders assured them the enemy had no defensive equipment. Gunther exclaims they've been deceived, while Bolst commands his soldiers to fight harder, even if it means fighting to the death. The battle intensifies as soldiers from both armies clash fiercely. Bolst and the Lord of Winterfell order their wizards into the fray, sparking a magical duel between the opposing sides. Richard, observing the relentless fighting, remarks on their inability to breach the city despite their efforts. Bedrick explains that the enemy employs a device called a magic extractor, common in major cities of Stuart, which enhances wizards' abilities with transferred energy, helping them to save time while casting spells. Richard asks if they possess such a machine, but Bolst informs him it's complex, difficult to handle, and not easily transported. He likens the battle to a contest between a well-fed child and a starving one. Richard inquiries about their fire throwers, but Bedrick notes they're currently undergoing emergency recovery due to high energy consumption. Reflecting on the turn of events, Richard admires the enemy's strategy and wonders who command Winterfell's army. As he watches his soldiers fall, he contemplates the possibility of losing this crucial siege. Suddenly, a dragon's roar splits the air. Gunther informs Richard it's Pompel's dragon, sent to turn the tide by attacking from above. The dragons launch a powerful attack on the city, and their assault weakens the defenders, but the rider soon notices the enemy has anti-dragon weapons. The rider, accompanied by Egwene, orders a retreat, shocking everyone, including Egwene. Puzzled by the Dragon Knight's swift retreat, Richard knows the dragons are flying at an altitude of 3,000 yards. Bolst admits defeat for now, and orders his soldiers to evacuate to safety. Bedrick and Richard rush to the dragon riders for answers. Bedrick asks Zaid, the dragon rider, what happened. Zaid reveals he saw dragon hunting bows in the city, stunning everyone, including Egwene. Egwene explains these dragon hunters are special weapons crafted by John, the gifted alchemist of San Jose. They are enchanted and far stronger than ordinary bows, firing arrows that spin through the air and pierce armor at incredible speed. Richard suggests some of these weapons might be decoys due to their high cost, but Egwene dismisses his doubts sharply. Richard wonders if all dragon knights are as curt, while Egwene glares at him, warning against prematurely boasting about sacking the city. Richard retorts, questioning Egwene's ire, and claiming that had he been in charge, Pompel's army wouldn't have faced defeat. The next day, at Pompel's base camp, Suffolk informs Richard that his Ripper army will lead the next assault on Winterfell. Richard gets disappointed and is immediately reminded by Suffolk that as a soldier, he has no choice but to obey. Suffolk warns him of the dire consequences that they would face if they fail in the next siege. Suffolk tells Richard that they must succeed in the next attack. Richard asks for the schedule, and Suffolk assures him that he has plenty of time to prepare, as the next attack will be 4 days later. Meanwhile, Bernard goes to the Lord and informs him that they are to receive reinforcements that consist of 3 legions of 12,000 men, along with the elite soldiers known as the Thunderbolts. The Lord expresses concern, noting that Winterfell is surrounded by the enemy, and questions how the reinforcements will enter the city. Bernard confidently replies that the reinforcements plan to make their way in under the cover of night. When the Lord asks when they will arrive, Bernard estimates it will take around 3 days. 3 days later, the Lord stands at the castle gate in the middle of dark night when a figure approaches, requesting permission to enter, claiming to be a Thunderbolt soldier. The Lord mentions hearing about the 3 legions approaching, but the figure explains that the legions couldn't make their way due to the dark night. Bernard, sensing something amiss, asks if anything is wrong. The Lord observes that the man before him doesn't appear to have marched from the capital, and internally notes that in such a dark night, measures should have been taken to prevent soldiers from straying. The Lord gets terrified and asks the figure to return and not risk more casualties, as the city will soon fall to the enemy. The figure insists that they will receive help from the Dragon Knights soon. When the Lord inquires which Dragon Knight, the figure mentions Count Corleone of the Golden Dragon. The Lord is aware that Corleone was killed in a battle against the evil dragons. He realizes he's speaking to a dead man, and concludes that the approaching legions must have fallen prey to the undead. The undead man admits they attacked the legions and devoured their flesh. The Lord seeking answers suspects that the capital's previous emergency transfer owes something to these undead. The undead man laughs, draws his sword, and declares that the Lord doesn't need to know more as he will die soon. A swarm of undead men begins attacking the Lord and his men, forcing them to retreat. Unfortunately, one soldier is bitten by the undead, turning him into one of them. Amid the chaos, soldiers start shouting. Gunther notices strange noises coming from Winterfell and asks what is happening. Richard also hears the screams, commenting that someone must have fallen into the shitter. Suffolk arrives and urges Richard to be ready for the attack as dawn approaches. Realizing he can't escape his destiny, Richard commands his Goshan Fortress troops to attack on his signal and orders them to launch the assault within moments, aiming to kill all enemies. The soldiers become excited, but Bowes tells them to stay quiet, emphasizing the sneak attack. Moments later, Richard and Gunther climb the castle walls and are shocked to find no guards. Gunther questions their whereabouts, and Richard wonders what the enemy is plotting. Suddenly, Gunther spots a large number of enemy soldiers gathered in one place and immediately alerts Richard. Upon closer inspection, Richard realizes that the enemy is not running towards them to attack, but seems to be fleeing from something instead. Richard wonders if his enemies are running to save their lives or to attack him. Gunther tells him that it's a win for them, asserting that they have won the battle, even though Richards hasn't even warmed up yet. The next day, the army of Pompel enters the city, and Bowes laments that he has lost the battle and his legion, while Richards has won the same battle without even fighting. Bedrick wonders where all 300,000 civilians are. Richards suggests they must have been displaced for the attack, and the prince agrees with him. Hendra informs Richards that he can sense the presence of the ring inside the city, and Richards instructs him to search for it, knowing that the entrance ceremony will take hours. Richards then turns and runs away, saying he needs to go to the restroom, with Hendra following him. Later, Richards and Hendra find the ring, and Richards notes that it doesn't even have a magic crystal on it. Hendra reassures him, but Richards regrets not bringing Checho along to test the ring. As it gets dark, Richards decides to leave to avoid suspicion. While walking down the city streets, Hendra asks Richards if he thinks it's possible to relocate so many citizens in times of war. Richards notes that these same citizens were eager to fight them to the death. Suddenly Richards stops, and Hendra asks him what happened. Richards looks at a humble home in the distance, and remarks that he can't understand why such a shabby structure is built in a prestigious neighborhood. He proceeds to enter the house, and upon entering, realizes it belongs to a military aristocrat. Hendra sees some light coming from a particular direction, and Richards wonders what treasure could be behind the wall. He decides to knock down the wall to find the treasure, and as he breaks it, he finds humans standing behind it. Both Richards and Hendra are surprised. Hendra tells Richards they are in the private residence of General Sid Dave, a military officer who prefers living like a common man. He informs Richards that the old man they see in front of them is General Sid Dave, the Lord of Winterfell. Richards starts wondering if they are trying to say something. General Sidviv tells them to run, but suddenly an undead man appears, shocking Richards. Richard slices the man in half and commands Hendra to go back and inform everyone of the situation, as he has a bad feeling about the place. Hendra asks what Richards is going to do, and he replies that he will ask Sidviv and his companions about the situation. Hendra leaves, telling Richards to be careful. Richards asks Sidviv about his identity, but Sidviv tells him it doesn't matter because the undead are coming. Sidviv emerges with his companions while Richards notes that the undead haven't appeared in such large numbers for well over 500 years. Sidviv tells him that once the sun goes down, the undead become unstoppable, which is why he had to hide under the holy light shield with his companions. He explains that they have been locked in for almost 12 hours, and asks Richards to take him to his commander as soon as possible. Richards introduces himself and asks Sidfev to follow him. Outside on the streets, Richards asks Siduf where so many undead came from, and Siduf tells him that they were once the citizens of the city. Richards inquires if the undead are actually sun-fearing creatures, and asks if all 300,000 people of the city have been turned into undead. Siduf corrects him, saying that the number is not 300,000. Sidviv reveals that they were issued a total of 150,000 men for the battle. Richards is shocked to realize there are nearly 450,000 undead in the city. Sidviv asks Richards if he's afraid, but he replies negatively, saying that the undead men look very creepy. The woman behind them advises not to use any elemental powers on the enemies, except only holy light, and everyone agrees with her. As they prepare to attack, Bernard instructs Richards to aim for the heads of the undead men, since their souls reside there. Richards, not waiting for Bernard to finish, charges with his sword and slices through several enemies in an instant. Bernard is shocked and tells Richard to attack as he wishes, as he's really impressed by Richard's sword skills. Richards mentions to Sidov that it won't be difficult if each soldier takes down 3 of the undead. Sidov disagrees, explaining that all the guards have been wiped out by the zombie warriors, who are extremely strong and armored. Richards inquires about their strength, and Sidov tells him they are as formidable as blood knights, feeling no pain and adapting to any weapon. Richards asks about their numbers, and Sidov informs him there are as many as 1,000 zombie warriors in the city. Richards urges them to focus on the weaker opponents, while the woman says she can't move because she needs to cast a Holy Cross healing spell. Richards gives Sidov a strange look, then picks up the woman on his back, telling everyone to stay close. He orders them to attack the enemy, and they start taking down the undead one by one, while the woman continues casting the healing spell from his back. Richards runs towards the base camp, and Bernard is shocked to realize he's heading to the Pompel camp. Meanwhile, Motor, Hendra, and others spot Richards running towards them. Bedrick, the prince, commands his soldiers to support Richards by shooting arrows at the undead. Motor prepares to use her fireballs, but Richards throws the head of an undead man at her, telling her not to use any elemental powers. After a struggle, Richards manages to enter the base camp with the others, and the soldiers immediately shut the gates. Richards takes a sigh of relief, and Gunther asks if those undead men are the same ones Hendra the Dracula talked about. Richards confirms that all the civilians of the city have been turned into undead creatures. Hendra updates him that they are now surrounded by the undead. Richards instructs him to count the enemies and ensure no one is missed as they prepare to break out of the situation. He knows they are close to the city walls, and that it would be disastrous if the undead got out. Gunther asks about food supplies, and Richards tells her to drop anything that slows them down. He then turns to Hendra and asks about his pet, Chicho, while Gunther refuses to let go of a particular object, despite Richards' order. Bedrick shows Richards a glowing object and tells him it's a shimmering amulet that will help him see clearly at night. Richards orders everyone to pack up and leave as soon as possible, but Baust asks if he has brought the stewards with him. Richards says they will discuss that later, and warns them about the zombie warriors in armor, saying they are as strong as blood knights and have already taken down the stewards' guards. Bedrick asks what the zombie warriors wear, and Richards replies that they wear Stuart Praetorian armor. Bedrick points in a direction and tells Richards he thinks he has found one zombie warrior. Richards looks in that direction and is shaken to his core as fear strikes his heart as he sees a zombie warrior in Praetorian armor running towards them. The zombies are sprinting toward the humans, intent on attacking. Bedrick looks at them and asks if they are indeed zombies, and why they are so quick instead of slow. Richard notes that their numbers are not significant, meaning they can take them down. Suddenly, a dragon's roar pierces the air. Richard asks if it's Egwene's or Zaid's. Sidov says it sounds like a golden dragon in its prime. Bedrick points out that Egwene's dragon is a phoenix dragon, and that Zaid has returned to the country. Richard wonders if it's another dragon knight, and Sidov anxiously mentions Corleone's name, hoping it's not him. Richard recalls that Corleone was supposed to have been killed in the battle against the evil dragons. Suddenly, they find themselves facing a humongous zombie dragon. Bedrick and Richard are shaken to their cores, wondering why the dragon is targeting them instead of the entire army. Gunther asks Richard what they should do. Richard orders everyone to split up and run in different directions, hoping to confuse the dragon. Bedrick runs away with Sidov while Richard takes the others. After a short sprint, Bedrick gets tired and says they are far enough away that the undead won't be able to chase them. Sidov suggests they take a rest. They look back and see no undead chasing them, wondering what's happening. Meanwhile, Richard and Gunther are running for their lives. Richard screams out of frustration and asks why all the undead are chasing him. He draws his sword and starts cutting down the enemies to clear a path. Grabbing the axe of a zombie warrior, he hurls it at the zombie dragon. The dragon, displaying intelligence, steps aside to avoid the attack. Richard realizes the dragon is a smart creature and wonders how to fight it as he can't fly like it. Hendra informs Richard that the Thunder Ring can grant the Titan the ability to manipulate the elements of chi and lightning. Richard becomes excited, asking if this means he can fly as well. Hendra confirms, and Richard eagerly asks how to activate the ring. Just as Hendra is about to explain, an arrow pierces his heart, causing him to collapse. Richard shouts Hendra's name in grief and orders Hendra to bring the Stone of Destiny they retrieved from the enemy. Hendra tells him the stone is in the logistics which they dropped earlier to increase their speed. It was left at their previous camp. Richard is frightened, wondering how to keep his promise to protect Hendra. Suddenly, Gunther hands him a magic stone, and he is shocked to see it. Gunther explains she was hesitant to drop all their supplies as ordered, so she kept a stone with her without telling anyone. Richard gets tears in his eyes and tells Gunther he loves her. He takes the stone from her hand and places it in Hendra's chest. Hendra's eyes snap open, glowing red. Richard asks if he is all right, as he is seemingly quite hopeful. Gunther is battling the undead while Hendra gets up. Richard asks him how to activate the ring. Hendra tells him he needs a drop of Titan's blood to be activated. Richard immediately calls Checho over. Chicho comes and Richard makes him sit in his lap. He then makes a slight cut on Chicho's paw, assuring him it won't hurt, and drops a bit of blood on the ring. At first nothing happens. Richard asks Chicho if he is even a descendant of the Titan. Suddenly, thunder starts rumbling and lightning flashes. Gunther asks Richard what's happening. Richard says he thinks the ring has been activated. Suddenly, Choi-Cho is struck by lightning and starts convulsing. In front of Richard's eyes, Choi-Cho transforms into a huge dragon-like creature. But his friendly character remains unchanged as he licks Richard's face. Richard climbs onto Checho's back and orders him to ascend immediately. Checho spreads his wings and soars into the air with incredible speed. The priestess sees them and wonders if it is a Gohendra. Gets up. Bedrick tells her it's not a dragon. The woman asks who it is, and Bedrick Sidiv suggests it might be Lord Richard. Meanwhile, Richard approaches comes the zombie dragon, and Richard makes him ride his lap, asking if he supplies, makes a cut on Chum's pee. He tells for their final confrontation, drops a bit of weapon at the zombie dragon's ribs at first, nothing causing it to roar in pain. Richard asks, Chuncho realizes even the descendant of feel pain because of its sudden power, thunder rumbling and lightning flashes. He launches another actor, Richard. What's happening? But the dragon rider dodge, Richard. Richard says he thinks the ring has been activated. Another weapon hits the dragon squarely in the chest and starts convulsing. In front of Richard's eyes, Checho transforms into a huge dragon-like creature. He proceeds to throw a barrage of weapons at the dragon, but the rider asks if Richard wants to die, and commands the zombie dragon to launch a powerful attack. Richard, however, dodges, uses his wings and soars into the air with incredible speed. The priestess Bedrick tells her it's not a dragon, and lightning appears in the sky, and Bedrick says he has no idea he can shoot lightning, standing on Checho's back. Meanwhile, Richard stares directly at his enemy, ready for the next move. Richard asks Checho if he can shoot lightning, and Checho gives a positive signal as thunder crackles around them. Richard tells the zombie dragon rider that it's not over yet. Suddenly Checho shoots a powerful beam of lightning, striking the zombie dragon in the chest and face. Richard is impressed. He says that Checho hasn't let him down, as he truly is a titan. He urges Checho to keep attacking and show the enemy their true power. Checho doesn't hold back, launching another volley of lightning that severely damages the zombie dragon. Richard smiles and tells Checho to prepare for one final attack, after which they will celebrate their victory at Gaoshan Fortress. Checho takes a deep breath, ready to unleash another lightning strike. Richard tells him to shoot, but only a small spark comes out, leaving Richard surprised as Checho struggles to breathe. Suddenly, the zombie dragon launches an attack at Richard, but he manages to dodge it. Richard realizes that the zombie dragon's biggest advantage is its inability to feel pain for its acting as if nothing has happened despite its broken bones. The dragon charges at Richard with great speed, and he wonders if it wants to engage in direct combat. Richard tells Checho to run, believing the dragon won't be able to catch them due to the holes in its wings. They escape at the last second, narrowly avoiding capture. Richard knows he must find a solution quickly. Suddenly, he sees Egwene in front of him, riding his phoenix dragon, and becomes excited. He immediately asks Egwene for help, but Egwene says he can't assist because his dragon Osiris is underage and can't defeat the zombie monster. Richard becomes disappointed and calls Egwene a coward. He's quite determined as he stands up, draws his sword, and leaps onto the back of the zombie dragon to confront its rider, declaring he won't shy away from a physical fight. Gripping his sword in his right hand for stability, Richard stabs the dragon's back. The undead rider tries to attack, but Richard dodges. They lock eyes for a moment, then Richard swiftly attacks, decapitating the rider. Richard taunts the fallen rider, saying he was too slow, which is why he lost his head. However, the headless body of the undead rider leaps away, leaving Richard shocked and wondering why it isn't dead despite losing its head. Suddenly, Richard loses balance. As the dragon continues flying, he is thrown off, plummeting freely towards the ground. Richard keeps falling from the sky while those on the ground watch helplessly, unable to save him, as they are all engaged in fierce combat. Suddenly, Checho swoops in, catching Richard mid-air. Meanwhile, Egwene orders his dragon to attack the zombie dragon, and then leaps onto the zombie dragon himself to join the battle. Richard instructs Checho to ascend again, confident he now knows where to strike. After a few moments, Richard returns to the zombie dragon, landing on its back. He finds the headless body of the undead rider, and declares that to destroy the rider, he must destroy the dragons since they are one. Richard runs along the dragon's neck, aiming for its head. He leaps into the air, transforming his sword into a massive weapon, and drives it into the dragon's skull. The dragon roars in agony, turning to stone as Richard lands back on Chaicho. The zombie dragon begins to crumble, disintegrating into rubble, and Chomchis swiftly flies Richard away from the falling debris. Bedrick is exhausted. He exclaims that he can't take it anymore, with the priestess agreeing that she too is running out of power. Suddenly, Bedrick spots the fallen corpse of the zombie dragon and becomes excited, realizing that Richard must have defeated it. The soldiers, seeing the fallen dragon, rally and charge at the remaining undead, now fewer. Richard lands on the ground and Gunther starts praising him. Richard instructs her to collect treasures from the dragon's corpse immediately, before anyone else can get to them. Hatterang jokingly reminds Richard that he claimed to be too tired to even lift an axe earlier. Checking his system window, Richard is confused but pleased to discover he has been instantly upgraded to level 80. He wonders about the combined value of the dragon he killed, and the undead crushed by the dragon's falling corpse. He declares himself lucky, and commands the system to equip a new set. Suddenly, Richard's clothes transform, and he sprouts a set of horns. Bedrick approaches, and asks if he changed clothes. Mid-air, Richard, rubbing his head, says he took the outfit of the dragon rider because it looked cool. He tells Bedrick he needs to retrieve his giant dragon slayer sword embedded in the dragon's skull, and leaves. As he walks through the ruins, he carefully examines the debris, determining which pieces belong to which parts of the dragon's body. Finally, Richard finds his massive sword lodged in the dragon's skull. He remarks that its size made it easy to locate amidst the rubble. As he draws the sword from the skull, the insides begin to glow. Out of curiosity, Richard looks closer and discovers a tiny baby dragon inside the skull, surrounded by a golden crystal. Richard looks at the little dragon and is surprised. He starts wondering if it was left by the zombie dragon as a piece of its unconsciousness, and considers asking Gunther for some holy water to purify it. Suddenly, the dragon speaks, asking Richard not to kill it. Richard is shocked to hear a dragon speak and asks for its name. The dragon tells him that its name is Thubamosa. Richard then asks why Thubamosa isn't dead, since his main body has been killed. Thubamosa explains that he is a golden dragon, and golden dragons can grow a second or even a third head over a few years. He says he was supposed to be the soul of the second head, but before he could grow out of it, his body died, leaving him to survive in the dragon crystal. Richard warns Thutmose to watch his words as he is currently trapped in a crystal held by the Lord of Goshan Fortress. Thutmose admits this, acknowledging Richard as his current captor. Richard then asks Thutmose if he can do magic. Thutmose replies that both magic and the body require a strong soul to support them. He begs Richard not to kill him, promising that he knows some of the best dragon's secrets and can be very useful. Richard, in a good mood, decides not to kill Thutmose and gives him a good disguise to prevent others from seeing him. Later, Richard walks through the camp and encounters Egwene, who salutes him with respect, calling him a hero. Richard wonders what Egwene is doing here, and tells him that he did well, acknowledging that he would have been dead if not for Egwene. Egwene humbly replies that he is a man who can never be a knight, as he ran away from the battle. He then informs Richard that General Pinto has summoned him, and is waiting at the temporary headquarters. Gewin shows Richard the camp, and Richard enters to find Sidifov sitting with an old fat man named Pinto. Richard glances around and sees bottles of wine, wondering if the general is here to fight or have fun. Pinto greets Richard, calling him the Dragon Slayer, and remarks on the cooperation between the officers of Pompel and Stuarts against a common enemy. He compliments Richard on his feat and his mount. Richard modestly attributes his success to pure luck, but Pinto inquires about the piece of golden dragon crystal. Richard realizes that Pinto wants the treasure without putting in any effort. He lies, saying he searched for the dragon crystal but couldn't find it. Pinto becomes angered and accuses Richard of lying, and insists there are no zombie dragons without the dragon crystal. He suggests distributing the spoils of war equally among everyone. Richard stays silent for a moment, then tells Pinto he crushed the dragon crystal out of inexperience. Pinto is enraged. He calls Richard a liar and a thief, but Richard laughs and exits the camp without further comment. Outside, Sidviv joins Richard and asks if he's not afraid of Pinto. Richard replies that he fears no one and is confident the king will punish Pinto for his greed. Sidiv agrees, and as they walk together, they find Egwene sitting on a rock. Sidiv remarks that Egwene must be troubled, and Richard asks what kind of trouble. Sidiv explains that Egwene comes from a poor background, despite being a knight's youngest son. Richard is surprised, asking if people raise their background to avoid embarrassment, especially dragon knights. Sidhiv confirms, explaining that Egwene's family was once prey for the ogre horde but were saved by a dragon. Richard is disappointed, commenting on how people now fake their backgrounds. Sidhiv agrees, noting that people will call Richard an unpopular youngest son of a noble family rather than a bastard. Richard is shocked and asks if Sidov knows that much about him. Sidov admits he researched Richard and Hendra because the war started because of them. Now that both countries are at peace, Sidov asks about Richard's plans. Richard says he wants to return to Gaoshan Fortress and invites Sidov to join him. Sidiv, however, says he is currently trapped and can't leave. Richard understands, and Sidiv suggests he get Vera and Bona to accompany him. Later, as Richard steps out of his carriage, he notices everything covered in snow and wonders why it is so cold in November. Peter, trembling with cold, tells Richard they have reached Gaoshan Fortress. Richard, looking at his fortress, is utterly shocked and wonders if he is actually standing in front of the Goshan Fortress he owns. Richard returns to his house in Goshen Fortress and fails to recognize it at first, finding a well-built dining hall in front of him. He can't believe it's the same place he left some time ago, and wonders what he has been doing all this time. Annie arrives with Buckland and explains that they renovated the house behind him because they had plenty of time on their hands. She invites him to sit down and have a meal while they talk. Richard is still in disbelief. He mentions that he left only a couple of months ago. Everyone settles down to the meal, eagerly listening as Richard shares his experiences in exaggerated and florid language. He tells them about tales of the siege of Winterfell, encounters with undead men, battles against dragons, and more. They listen with bated breath and talk all night. During the conversation, Richard reveals he has brought something special, placing a dragon crystal on the table. To everyone's astonishment, a baby dragon emerges and greets them. Auntie is shocked to see the dragon can talk, while Buckland is overjoyed, remarking that the dragon's nature seems closer to the undead than a soul. Richard explains that he obtained the dragon from the corpse of an undead dragon. Annie inquires if the dragon can control its former body, but Richard reveals he also brought back the dragon's skeleton. The small dragon admits its soul is too weak to support such a huge body. Richard gets slightly frustrated and asks the dragon if it realizes the effort it took to retrieve the corpse. The dragon gets frightened and suggests it can animate a smaller body. Demonstrating its power, the dragon assembles the bones of a chicken on the table into a complete skeleton within seconds. Annie is shaken by this display and asks Richard if this isn't a good thing. Richard recommends they could use the animated chicken as scouts in battle, and the chicken itself agrees with the idea. However, Richard instructs the chicken's soul to return to the dragon crystal, stating they will discuss the idea later. Richard then mentions there is one more thing he wants to address, and calls someone into the room. Hendra enters, causing Annie to gasp, wondering if it's Dracula's sister. While Buckland jokes that it must be Dracula's female version, Richard clarifies that it is Dracula himself, who has been behaving in a very feminine manner ever since his heart was replaced with the Destiny Stone. Dracula explains that he can't endure sunlight as it burns his skin and causes a dull pain, so he only ventures out at night. He notes that his strength and reflexes have improved, though his appetite has diminished, and he now fears holy water and sleeps all day. Buckland observes that these are characteristics of the undead, but Dracula insists he is very much alive, though his heart beats at an abnormally low rate. Richard remarks that anything related to the undead is stranger than normal things, and Buckland suggests they ask the mini-dragon about Dracula's condition, since it is undead itself. Richard agrees, noting that the Mosa, being the soul of the dragon's second head, should have an innate soul bond and insight-sharing ability with the main soul. They all gather closer to the dragon crystal, and Richard asks the dragon why it or the people of Winterfell became undead. He also inquires why the undead never show enough strength to overcome the defenders. Ultimately, the dragon responds that all three questions have a single answer, that is the Book of the Undead. A knight asks what the Book of the Undead is, and Richard explains that it is a grimoire containing 109 necromantic spells. Annie, recognizing the grimoire's evil nature, wonders why the Empire didn't try to stop its development. Richard speculates that they must have tried and failed, likely due to their limited magical capabilities. He adds that the Empire couldn't time travel to sanction the Titans. Annie gets shocked and asks if Richard is implying that the grimoire was created by the Titans. Annie asks Richard if he's certain that the Titans used necromancy. He notices her shock and asks if she's surprised, and Annie explains that the Titans have been a part of her thoughts despite disappearing thousands of years ago, and she finds it challenging to believe they would use such dark magic. Buckland interjects, suggesting that the nature of magic depends on the user's intentions and is not inherently good or evil. Annie agrees, but Richard remains skeptical. Richard argues that necromancy manipulates the human spirit and plants pure evil within it, which is why banning it was one of humanity's best decisions. He points out that the Book of the Undead, made from the skins of baby titans skinned alive, is evidence of its malevolent origins. He believes that the powerful resentment from the titans' tragic deaths gives the book a significant edge. Hender then asks about the connection between the undead men they faced and the Book of the Undead. The baby dragon explains that while it usually takes hundreds of years to turn dragon remains into undead, it only took one night for him, recommending the Book of the Undead's involvement. Buckland disagrees, saying she has seen many dragon bones, but the dragon clarifies that only zombie dragons, ghost dragons, and demon dragons are truly undead. He adds that transforming an entire city into undead creatures is beyond human capability and requires the powerful spells found in the Book of the Undead. Buckland mentions that the Book of the Undead was supposedly destroyed long ago by the Church of Holy Light. Richard counters that the Church has often boasted about such feats, suggesting they may not have been successful. Buckland insists that there's no need to worry excessively, but Richard warns that the reappearance of the undead is a serious matter. He informs them that next month, envoys from 3 countries will convene in the holy city of Ventus to formulate countermeasures. Hendra asks Richard if he will be Pomple's envoy, surprising Buckland. Richard reveals that King Sagras told him that since the war began with him, it should end with him, making him the best candidate for the job. Buckland finds it suspicious that an empire like Pomple, which supports the ice goddess, would send an envoy to the Holy Church of Light. Richard then shares another plan. He wants to expand his army further. Richard's Goshen fortress boasts an elite army, thanks to his system, which initially helped a few dozen barbarians, but has now been updated to support a few hundred. He knows that the best way to enhance his system's capabilities is to build a strong reputation. After slaying the dragon, his system's capacity increased rapidly, and he now envisions Geishain Fortress becoming Geishain Nation. Buckland asks how much he wants to expand, and Richard responds that he aims for an army of 3,000. Buckland points out that raising such an army requires a population of at least 10,000, and questions how he plans to support so many people. Richard suggests buying food, but Buckland reminds him that food is most expensive in spring. Richard proposes clearing more land and grazing more livestock, but Buckland notes that it will take at least 2 years to start. Richard asks about making money from the arms trade, but Buckland explains that Geishain Fortress has now become the arbiter of order and has less frequent conflicts. Richard wonders if their strength is a problem, and Buckland advises him to do as much as he can with what he has and not to overextend himself. Heater arrives, informing Richard that she has brought a wagon full of loot and valuable materials from the siege, estimated to be worth 200,000 gold coins. Richard is ecstatic and asks how it's possible. Hendra explains that he received his first share of 50,000 coins for slaying the dragon. Richard inquires about the remaining 150,000, and the baby dragon explains that the rest comes from his hoard, as nothing was left behind by Lord Richard. Annie then tells Richard that her mother's tribe of prairie elves, numbering 400 strong, wishes to join Geishain Fortress, not for money but for safety. Richard gets excited. He shakes Annie's shoulders and urges her to call the tribe immediately, knowing elves are excellent archers and guerrilla swordsmen. Annie is slightly overwhelmed. She informs Richard that the tribe is stationed 10 miles away from the fortress. Richard decides to personally welcome them, as they are already in his neighborhood. Meanwhile, at the elf tribe's base camp, an elderly female elf sits by the fire with some servants, wondering if the Lord of Geishain Fortress, whom Annie mentioned, will accept them. Annie introduces her grandmother Melissa, the matriarch of the elf tribe. Melissa greets Richard warmly, saying she has heard much about him. Richard becomes curious and asks her what has Annie told her about him. Melissa, with a mischievous smile, says Annie describes him as arrogant, overreacting, and a bit too interested in women. Annie gets mortified. She cuts her off, embarrassed by her grandmother's bluntness, and asks why she is saying such things. Richard laughs heartily, then notices a collection of wooden boxes nearby. He asks Melissa if they contain treasures. Melissa, with a twinkle in her eye, tells him that the contents of these boxes are treasures for the elves, and asks him to take a closer look. Richard peers inside a box and is shocked to see a nest of hornets. Melissa explains that they are ordinary bees, cherished by the elves for their honey. Annie adds that these are Pagani bees, which do not attack elves but help defend against their enemies. Richard is intrigued. He suggests breeding thousands of them to monopolize the honey business in Pompel. Annie explains that the ancient elves practiced such tactics in their empire, but modern elves lack the skills. She reveals that the queen bee is very picky, consuming nectar from narcissus pollen only, a magical plant with tough growing conditions. As fallen descendants, the elves have lost the ability to cultivate it on a large scale. Richard asks if they have any advanced breeding techniques. Annie shares that the ancient elven priests plan to build a moonwell, which would help grow the narcissus pollen, but the moonwell has been lost. Meanwhile, Gunther walks through the elf camp with Buckland and Gunther. Gunther comments on the elves' enthusiasm. Buckland responds that the elves cannot afford to be condescending and doubts their archery skills. Gunther asks why, and Buckland explains that strength is essential for archery, as it allows arrows to pierce armor, whereas high accuracy won't help to do so. She observes that the elves are few in number and quite skinny. Gunther asks what they should do, and Buckland advises doing nothing for now. Richard takes Melissa to Geishain Fortress, telling her that the elves are welcome if the young males serve as archers. Melissa insists that the elves seek peace and are not inclined toward war. Richard counters that it would be unrealistic to absolve them of obligations while granting equal rights. In Richard's residence, Melissa explains that the elves are too weak to provide military service, lacking the strength and endurance to meet societal norms. Richard recalls seeing strong guards in Annie's caravan, and hearing about elves breaking human cavalry charges. He asks Melissa how the elves regain their reputation as excellent archers. Melissa reveals it's a private matter and requests to speak with Richard alone. Richard agrees with her and asks her to follow him. In a private conversation, Melissa reveals that the nectar problem affects not just the queen bee, but also the worker bees. If the worker bees consume the nectar, they produce Moria poison, a secret to the elves' strength. She explains that Moria tattoos drawn with this poison enhance the wearer's abilities. Richard asks about those who dislike tattoos, and Melissa clarifies that the tattoos appear only when activated. She explains that the elves once mastered 9 magical tattoos, but now only 3 remain due to the narcissus shortage. Richard asks how many in her tribe use this technique. Melissa replies that 3 have successfully drawn tattoos, and a young elf shows great promise but lacks practical experience. Richard asks if more Moria tattoos could be created if he mass breeds narcissus. Melissa admits it's an idealistic hope, and Richard chuckles, acknowledging the challenge. Later, Buckland informs Richard that a team is ready to process the dragon skeleton, making dozens of dragon armors. She laments that many bones were broken, limiting the armors they can create. Suddenly, Annie bursts in, questioning why the elves are practicing tattooing on the cows, noting that almost all the cows in Geishan Fortress are now covered with strange patterns. Richard is amused. He asks if the cows are complaining. Annie becomes extremely frustrated as she towers over Richard, shouting that the main problem for the elves is the shortage of Moria, not their skills. Richard asks if growing more Narcissus wouldn't solve the problem, but Annie explains that Narcissus emits toxic elements as it grows. Without a moonwell, it's impossible to cultivate on a large scale. Richard is determined. He tells Annie he will show her something instead of giving an explanation and leads her to a cold, dark path. Despite the freezing weather, he assures her they are almost there. Finally, they reach a camp. Richard removes a curtain, revealing hundreds of pots with Narcissus growing inside. Annie becomes astonished as she gazes at the thriving plants, realizing that Richard may have found the solution to their problem. A rabbit and a sheep walk together over a frozen lake. The rabbit, shivering, says he wants to return to the fortress and sleep by the fire. But the sheep reminds him they have to divert water for the next spring. The rabbit sighs, acknowledging it's only his wishful thinking. Suddenly, the rabbit notices bubble under the ice and asks the sheep if he thinks it's a fish. The sheep dismisses the idea, saying no fish could survive in the frozen salty lake. But the rabbit insists he sees something moving, which frightens the sheep. Suddenly, the rabbit screams and tells the sheep to run, just as the ice breaks with a blast. Meanwhile, Annie is astonished by the sight of the abundant Narcissus plants, and asks Richard how he managed to plant so many. Richard explains that trolls in his fortress use fertilization spells. Annie is skeptical. She questions how it's possible with a magical plant. Richard elaborates those different plants have different soil requirements, and gives some examples. Buckland interjects, saying she already knows this. Richard adds that the spells work by evolving the soil rather than merely making it fertile, making it suitable for all plant types. Annie excitedly asks Richard how he discovered this, and he explains that he observed the growth of both bitterroot, which needs saline soil, and reeds, which prefer low salt content around the fortress. Buckland asks if the fertilization spells are truly that effective. Richard says they simulate the vital life force called holy light fertilization. Annie asks if she can inform her grandmother, and Richard agrees, saying that Geishan Fortress will soon have some of the best archers. Later, Bernard stands outside the gates of Geishan Fortress with the priestess and some other men. He remarks on how impressive the fortress is. Richard greets them, yawning, and complains about their early arrival. They inform him it's actually afternoon. Richard explains he spent the night tossing some of the elves, shocking Bernard and the priestess. Richard quickly clarifies he was talking about the tattoos he got using hardened steel needles. He boasts about his defense, comparing it to leather armor, and invites them inside, offering grilled chicken. Suddenly, Heder arrives, showing Richard a severed hand found near a gigantic hole in the ice. Richard examines the cuts, noting they were made with high-quality knives, indicating the assailants are not wilderness aborigines. He orders Heder to wake Thutmose and have him scout the area for any suspicious activity, furious that someone dared challenge Geishan Fortress. Richard then takes everyone to the hole in the frozen lake, inspecting it closely. He remarks that it seems connected to the Titan ruins. Thutmose arrives, reporting that he has seen numerous snakemen attacking from the north, describing them as strange, running seahorses. Richard, observing the horde of enemies, agrees with Heder that they resemble the undead. Richard gets frustrated and orders his archers to prepare, but declines Bernard's offer of help, as he's confident that he can defeat the enemy with a single blow. Drawing his sword, Richard charges and decimates the enemy with one powerful strike. Gunther examines the corpses, remarking on their ugliness and stickiness. She removes the bandage from the face of one of the undead, and Hedda is shocked by what she sees. Bro Ansar calls Richard over, pointing out the facial features of the undead man, and revealing that he is an elf. The discovery leaves them all shocked and confused. Richard examines the corpse of the undead, and remarks that it would have been a handsome elf if he were alive. Bernard agrees. Heder notes that the dead figure is a combination of an elf and a snake man, prompting Richard to ask if she's ever heard of a creature that is half orc and half elf. Heder shakes her head, saying she's never heard Annie mention such a thing. Richard inspects the undead man further, and comments that he seems unusually well preserved, almost like he's been filled with spices, making him question if he's a real undead. Richard becomes frustrated and wonders aloud why he keeps encountering the undead, and if there's something wrong with him. Suddenly, Thutmose recalls that there was indeed half-orc, half-elf creatures in ancient times. He explains that to counter the effects of tidal decline, elven mages took drastic measures. Richard interrupts, asking if they developed the Moria tattoos. Thutmose, surprised, inquires how Richard knows about it, and Richard reveals he has one on his back. Thutmose continues, saying that the elves also tried to alter their bloodline to create a stronger race known as orc elves. Richard asks if he's sure such creatures existed, and Thutmose confirms, recounting tales from his ancestors about a tiger elf ranger wielding a warhammer and a mace. Bernard comments that a creature with the strength of an orc and the magic of an elf must have been incredibly powerful. Richard wonders aloud where these beings were when the Night Elven Empire fell. Thutmose explains that noble elves refused to accept the orc elves as true elves due to their mixed blood, leading to their rejection. He adds that, although creating orc elves was a successful experiment, it was halted. By the time the need for them became urgent, it was too late. as hybrids require stabilization through multiple generations of internal reproduction. Richard asks Thutmose how he knows so much despite not having a scholarly background. Thutmose explains that dragons once tried to mate with elves to create dragon elves, but the experiment failed as the offspring inherited negative traits from both sides. The priestess finds this weird, and Bernard questions the wisdom of defying nature's laws. Richard asks Thutmose how he thinks the orc elves became mummies again, but Thutmose has no answer. Richard picks up an enemy weapon and notes that it appears new, indicating they weren't buried for thousands of years. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Richard decides to dig beneath the lake to locate the source of the undead. He orders Heder to have Lobby start digging immediately, and to bring Chencha, who might have a connection to something important. Luby and his team dig tirelessly for days, fending off numerous undead snake elves with Gunther's help. After 3 days of hard work, Luby finally breaks through the ground beneath the lake and discovers something unexpected. Luby reports back to Richard, who asks to be taken down to see for himself. Luby is baffled by what he saw. He urges Richard to check it out. Armed with a torch, Richard ventures through the tunnel, wondering what mysterious thing could be hidden there. Suddenly, he reaches a dead end and finds a massive portal-like structure in front of him. Richard and his companions are stunned to see a space rift, and Bernard speculates about where it might lead. The priestess, knowing Richard's nature, warns that he might just jump into the rift without thinking. Richard dismisses this, stating he would never risk his or his men's lives recklessly. He turns to his men, ordering them to fetch some ropes. Checho, sitting on Richard's shoulder, eyes the rift with intense curiosity. Suddenly Checho leaps into the space rift, shocking everyone. Richard, losing his composure, watches in disbelief as Checho disappears into the rift. Everyone is shocked to see Checho go inside the rift. Heder asks Richard what they are supposed to do, and he tells them to wait so he can go in and find Checho. Bernard warns him of the dangers, but Richard insists he will be back in 15 minutes. He enters the rift and crosses into a new world, a verdant forest with towering trees. Unbeknownst to him, Gunther and Heder have also followed. Gunther comments that the trees must be older than her grandmother, and Richard is shocked to see them. He demands to know why they entered, and Gunther explains that they were not comfortable letting him venture into an unknown place alone. Richard sarcastically asks if he should shed tears, to which Heder replies affirmatively. Richard finds Checho and sternly tells him not to do anything so reckless again. Heder suggests they explore the place since it doesn't seem dangerous. Richard, however, is wary, remarking that a place spawning the undead shouldn't look so beautiful. He decides they should leave, but as he tries to walk back into the rift, he collides with its surface and hurts his head. Heder is shocked and Richard realizes he can't pass through, wondering if they are trapped. 15 minutes later, Bernard enters the rift with the priestess to assist Richard. After 30 minutes, Libby also enters, declaring he's there as backup. An hour later, Abu arrives with his Stegosaurus, announcing he's there to save Richard. Richard is exasperated to see almost everyone has entered the new world through the rift. Abu tells Bernard he was right, while Bernard says he thought Richard was in trouble. Abu replies he came prepared to die, finding the atmosphere oppressive. The priestess states they might be unable to return, and Moda loses her temper, claiming she warned everyone of the dangers but was threatened into helping Richard, and declares that they are going to die because of Richard now. Annie tries to reassure them, saying her grandmother and Buckland are watching over the Gaoshan fortress. Richard retorts that he doesn't know if they can even return. The priestess comments on the higher elemental density, noting that even simple holy light spells are significantly enhanced. Motor shouts at her, demanding who she is to instruct anyone, but Richard agrees with the priestess, acknowledging he can also feel the higher elemental tides. Suddenly, an arrow is shot at Richard, but he catches and snaps it in half. Hedda is alarmed, but Richard tells her not to worry, as the arrow posed no threat. A figure emerges from the bushes, complimenting Richard's quick reflexes. Richard confronts him, asking why he is sneaking up on them. The stranger Senadin retorts that it's Richard who has intruded into his land and remarks on his politeness. They introduce themselves, and Senadin asks if all the people with Richard are his. He looks at Heder and calls her a horse girl, prompting her to assert that she is a centaur, not a horse girl. Senadin is confused, stating there are only 3 types of orcs: saber-toothed tiger men, mammoth men, and rhino men. He asks what kind Heder is, while Richard notes that Senadin's equipment and perceptions are ancient. He wonders if Senadin's world still has species that have become extinct in their own. Richard inquires about Senadin's type, and he reveals he is a tiger man from the Tiger Clan, with a wild spirit. Richard says that he's unfamiliar with the term, and frustrates Senadin, who exclaims that his race should be well known. Bernard, standing next to Richard, admits he has never heard of the wild spirit either. Senadin observes that Richard and his army's weapons and armor are made of steel, and Richard tells him they have far more intriguing things to show. When Senaitan asks where they came from, Richard points to the space rift, explaining they arrived through it but cannot return. Senaitan is astonished, saying that the passage was abandoned long ago. Richard replies that he is also trying to figure it out, and Senaitan decides to take them to his clan, believing the wise elders might help. Richard and his people start walking with Senaitan, who complains about the difficulty of the path. Senaitan explains that they use jumping methods, as it is much faster. Richard asks him about the distance to his tribe. Sanadin tells him it is around 1,000 cubits, and Richard realizes that according to the Titan standard, the distance is approximately 5 kilometers. Richard inquires about the wild spirit, as he still knows little about it. Sanadin explains that a wild spirit is the essence and soul of a beast, the wildest living spirit in heaven and earth. He mentions that the tiger spirit is the wildest, and Richard asks if there are more wild spirits. Sanadin confirms, listing 12 of them, and mentions that one spirit, the cat, was replaced by the rat race, though this is not widely believed. Richard asks where they are, and Sanadin says they are in the late forest, which is 20,000 cubits in circumference, and inhabited by over 30,000 tiger spirit giants. Annie is shocked and asks if giants also exist in this realm. Sanadin replies that it depends on how one defines existence. After a while, they reach Sanadin's tribe, and Richard is surprised to see many tree houses. Sanadin says he will take them to the elder, who lives in the largest tree. The priestess wonders if it is safe to enter someone's home so casually. Bernard notes that the tribe's residents are still stuck in ancient ways of living and are much weaker than Richard and his men in terms of strength. Richard and Annie approach the elder, and Richard mentions he has many questions that need answers. The elder says they are as curious as Richard. Richard explains that they live on the other side of the tunnel, and despite wanting to return, they cannot. He asks how they can return home, and the elder replies that they cannot help him because the entrance has been sealed. Annie is shocked, pointing out the numerous undead soldiers emerging from the same entrance, and asks how it can be sealed. The elder explains that a time tunnel usually connects two distant places, but under specific serendipitous conditions, the warping of space can connect multiple places within the same tunnel simultaneously. Richard is stunned and asks how he ended up in such a situation. The elder asks if the undead he mentioned are Janus snake with pointed ears. The elder says those undead went through the Chowhu passage, which is a couple of 100,000 cubits away. Annie and Richard are astonished by the distance and immediately ask for directions. The elder notes Richard's determination and says it's challenging to leave one's hometown. The elder warns that the passage is difficult to reach and asks Richard about his thoughts on the late forest. Richard describes it as a beautiful place with mountains and more, but the elder says it is just an illusion. He warns Richard that stepping out will lead to attacks by ferocious beasts, but Richard insists he just wants to know the way back. The elder says there is a way, but it needs divine approval and a pull from the other side. Annie asks what this means, but the elder admits he is unsure, as the meaning of ancient legends is beyond current understanding. Later, Annie asks Richard if he has any clues about these things, and he says he might have a clue about the pull from the other side. He speculates that the pull might be a connection, as long as someone on the other end reaches out or touches them to pull them back into the portal. Annie tells Richard he is smarter than she thought, but he admits he has no idea about divine approval. Richard expresses doubt about the existence of gods in this world, but Annie suggests that gods might have visited this realm, unlike theirs. Thumosa approaches and tells Richard that the tiger spirit is the orc elf they were discussing. Richard claims he suspected this. He asks Thumosa for details, and Thumosa explains that after the collapse of the Elven Empire, the orc elves and pureblood elves spread out through the time tunnel to flourish together. He adds that the god mentioned by the orc elves is likely the last member of the royal elven family. Richard, however, doubts this, questioning how they could venerate someone with the same ears as elves if they consider them gods. He points out that cutting the ear would cause infections among the tribe. Richard proposes that the orc elves likely broke away from the pureblood elves and created a new identity as spirit beasts. Suddenly, a horn blows and Annie wonders what is happening. Sanadin rushes to Richard, informing him that demonic monsters have appeared, and they must go to the edge of the forest for defense. Richard recalls the elder saying the monsters only attacked outside the forest and asks why they are now attacking the forest. Sanadin explains that this is rare but happens during the full moon, when the moon's full phase galvanizes the monster's ferocity to its peak. Annie expresses disbelief, but Richard reassures Sanadin not to panic, as they are ready to provide backup and are much stronger than he thinks. Sanadin thanks him, but warns that the nature of the magical creatures might be different from those Richard has encountered in his own world. Meanwhile, monstrous insects appear and start moving closer to the forest. Walking across the late forest, Richard asks if the attack can be stopped by a few people, given its vast borders. Sanadin explains that there is a stone wall at the outskirts of the forest, to which they are headed. This wall will aid in their defense. He adds that the wall has 6 openings, and they are going to one of them. That's Richard, questions why the openings are not closed or sealed. Sanadin explains that there were originally 40 or 50 openings, but only 6 remain unsealed intentionally. The monsters cannot climb the walls, and the openings are left for the monsters to enter otherwise. They would attempt to climb, which would be more problematic. Richard realizes the tiger spirit race is quite intelligent. Sanadin informs him that it's a long journey to the opening called the Goliath. After 3 to 6 hours, they pass through the woods of the forest, and after 9 hours, they reach the forest's edge. Richard is stunned by the sight of the stone wall before him. Sanadin shows him the opening of the Goliath, and Richard inspects the stone, noting it doesn't seem normal. He asks if the late forest is on a giant crater. Sanadin confirms it's an extinct volcano, otherwise there wouldn't be such a wall for protection. Bernard remarks it better be extinct, or they are walking on the crust. Gunther inquires about the monsters and the undead. Senadin tells him they are expected to arrive soon, as it's the night of the full moon. He explains the horn they heard signaled an attack at some distance, and he is sure the monsters won't reach the stone wall before them. Richard questions why the giants living in the forest don't engage in the defense. Senadin says the forest's resources are limited, so the giants must conserve their energy so they don't disturb them in their sleeps unless the danger is significant. Richard asks if he's referring to titans, but Senadin clarifies that titans don't live in his world, and that he's talking about iron giants, descendants of the titans. Richard asks who wants to check out the outside of the Goliath, and Gunther immediately agrees. Senadin says he also needs to see what the monsters are up to. After a few moments, Bernard reaches the edge and reports that it's all desert beyond the Goliath. Richard is thinking about the monsters on the other side, and he becomes skeptical. The priestess asks why he is skeptical, and he explains that the desert has no resources. Since the monsters need food and water to survive, he can't fathom how they manage. Abu brings him a skull and urges him to examine it. Richard asks what's important about it, and Abu directs him to look inside. Richard finds a small, disgusting creature inside the skull. Senadin identifies it as a low-level creepy monster. Richard asks if his ancestors wanted the desert sands. Senadin reveals that his ancestors tamed a venomous dragon to traverse the desert but couldn't reach its end. Richard is surprised that even a venomous dragon couldn't reach the desert's end. Suddenly, something strange appears on the desert sand. Senadin immediately identifies it as the monsters approaching. Within seconds, hundreds of monsters emerge. Senadin says the monsters will wander for a while and attack at night. Richard is taken aback by the size of the monsters, wondering what they feed on. Suddenly, one of the monsters leaps to attack. Senadin is shocked, realizing the monsters are already prepared to attack this time. However, Richard swiftly draws his sword and slices the monster into pieces. Senadin praises his strength. Richard inquires about the type of monster, and suggests they investigate what's special about these bug-like creatures. Richard looks at the ugly creatures and remarks that while they might look hideous, their legs resemble those of a crab. Gunther asks if they can eat them, and Senadin tells her that they are indeed very delicious, offering her a taste. The priestess immediately refuses, chastising Senadin for his willingness to eat anything. Senadin notes that the sandworms either don't come at all or come in vast numbers, and this time they've arrived in a huge swarm. He suggests calling for help, but Richard points out that the journey takes half a day, making it too late for reinforcements to arrive in time. Senadin agrees and hopes his people manage to hold their openings against the monsters. As night falls, Richard shares bread with the others and notices movement in the desert. He surmises that thousands of monsters are approaching. Motor is frightened. She asks if they should run, but Richard tells her there's nowhere to run and they must live or die with the forest. Suddenly, thousands of monsters start crawling towards them. Richard instructs Heder to prioritize sweeping attacks to the far end of the desert. Heder agrees, and Richard says they will focus on the battle outside the walls. If there are any breaches, Senadrin will join the fray and handle the final defense. Richard orders his troops to release a volley of arrows, which inflict critical damage on the front line of monsters, but the rest keep advancing. Richard commands his troops to attack and begins slaying monsters with his sword. Gunther joins in, taking down the giant bugs, while Albie uses his Stegosaurus to beat the monsters, and the priestess casts healing spells for the troops. Gunther is exhausted, says she is running out of power. Richard becomes frustrated, calls the monsters disgusting, and realizes they can't kill them all due to their sheer numbers. He laments not having a mage for long-range attacks. Richard is determined. He moves forward, using his special abilities to kill several monsters in a single blow with his legendary sword. As monster limbs fly through the air, Senadin asks Richard about the situation. Richard, giving a negative response, notes that more monsters keep coming. He worries they can't fight much longer, and the priestess admits she doesn't have the stamina to continue helping. Checho makes some sounds, and Richard suddenly becomes excited, wondering why he hadn't thought of Checho before. He realizes Checho might be the mage they've been needing. Richard orders Checho to enlarge his body. Checho obeys and ascends into the air, and Bernard notes that the monsters have stopped moving. The priestess suggests it might be because they've never seen something as big as Checho. As the monsters gather to attack Checho, he flies above them and summons lightning from the sky. Richard, confident in Checho's abilities, tells him it's time to show everyone the tricks they've been practicing. He looks at the bugs and declares that it's now over for all of the monsters. Richard declares to the monsters that their time is over, and Checho unleashes a massive thunder attack. Meanwhile, Richard activates his sword's abilities with magic and stabs it into the ground. Checho's lightning and Richard's fire attack combine, causing immense damage to the monsters. Senadin is impressed. He asks Gunther if this is the full extent of Richard's power, but she admits she didn't expect him to be this strong either. However, Richard notices that the monsters aren't even flinching after such a powerful hit. He wonders if they have any connection to the Titans, and decides to find out. He stabs his sword into the ground again, launching another powerful attack at the monsters. Suddenly, a humongous snake appears, and Senadin warns Richard that it's the Spartan serpent. Richard anticipated a big boss monster earlier, but is alarmed to see the serpent moving towards Checho with its mouth open. Realizing the threat to Checho, Richard rushes at the serpent, aiming to end the battle quickly. He leaps into the air to attack the massive creature, but is shocked when his sword breaks against the serpent's tough skin. Hector is also stunned to see Richard lose his weapon. Cenedin explains that the serpent is the leader of the monsters, making it more powerful than all the others. Cheddle, sensing the danger, creates some distance and tries to attack the serpent with lightning. Surprisingly, the serpent opens its mouth and absorbs the lightning attack. It then releases an even more powerful lightning strike at Cheddle, causing him to revert to his real form and fall to the ground. Richard becomes worried about Checho and rushes to catch him midair. The situation becomes dire as the serpent moves closer and attempts to swallow Richard and Checho. Gunther screams in shock, and Hector commands the troops to advance and rescue them. However, the monsters regain their senses, and Richard's troops realize they can't approach the serpent. Bernard warns that the serpent will disappear underground, making it impossible to save Richard. Suddenly, one of the troops is bitten by a monster, and Bernard exclaims that they are playing with fire this time. Bernard says they're playing with fire now, and the priestess starts crying like a baby in his arms. Suddenly, the serpent begins to growl in a strange manner, confusing everyone. The serpent's abdomen starts glowing aggressively, and Gunther wonders if Richard is doing something to get out. All of a sudden, the serpent roars at the top of its lungs and a huge power beam shoots out of its abdomen, tearing its skin and flesh. Richard steps out of the serpent's abdomen, holding Checho in his arms. Gunther is thrilled to see him, while Bernard remarks that Richard knows how to surprise them. Richard tells the serpent he was intimidated at first, but says it's the serpent's fault for swallowing food instead of chewing it. He forms a small fireball in his fingers and shoots it at the serpent, causing a huge explosion that takes down the serpent along with many nearby monsters. Richard asks his people if they would rather not earn any experience by killing the monsters, as they have lost their will to fight. Cenedin runs at the monsters, agreeing with Richard that they won't run now. The priestess tells everyone she'll preserve their strength from the rear, and all of them, including Bernard and Gunther, jump at the monsters together. Richard keeps attacking the huge monsters with his newly found abilities, while the Stegosaurus stomps the monsters with its feet. Later, the battle ends, and everyone sits on the ground, breathing heavily. Richard says they would have been exhausted even if the monsters didn't fight back, while Bernard and Gunther say they can't feel their bodies. Richard opens his system window and mutters to himself that he must have gained a lot of points, and should have a great advancement. He checks out the soldier message and discovers that the Stegosaurus has been upgraded to the top level. Call Tyrannosaurus Rex. Abu tells him that the Stegosaurus is evolving, and Richard wonders how it could evolve so quickly. He asks Abu what the Tyrannosaurus Rex does, and the Rex proceeds to shoot flames from its mouth, turning Richard and Abu into burnt coals, leaving them completely shocked. Bernard is astonished to see the Tyrannosaurus spitting fire, and asks if it's magic. But the priestess says that the Tyrannosaurus is spitting fire without using elemental magic. Abu explains that the Stegosaurus has several stomachs, one of which connects directly to their mouth, but he's not sure why they're spitting fire. The priestess suggests asking the elders, as it's impossible to store fire in one's stomach. Richard speculates that the stomach produces hydrogen that burns when food gets digested. He adds that the Stegosaurus just concentrates the hydrogen in the stomach, and then contracts it forcefully to eject a sharp stream of hydrogen. Bernard and the priestess find Richard's theory odd, and Gunther jokes that Richard is trying to explain that human farts can also burn. Abu asks if that means the Stegosaurus just farted in their faces, embarrassing Richard. The priestess asks how one ignites hydrogen after spraying it, and Richard explains that the Stegosaurus has the habit of taking small gravel to aid in digestion. He adds that sparks are produced when the upper and lower teeth of the Stegosaurus collide. The priestess is skeptical but admits that the Stegosaurus might be better than monsters based on their physical structure alone. However, Richard gets fed up with the lecture and tells everyone he's had enough of the lectures, and says they should head back now. Richard starts to walk away while everyone follows him. He thinks to himself that he must figure out the secrets of the Titans, as the monsters of this strange world seem to be interested in Shei-Cho. So that's it for now. Until then, watch those exciting manhwas. I assure you, you will be going to love those stories, and your like, comment needed to continue this journey, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel.